v. Looking backward. How the planters, having lost the war for slavery, sought to begin again where they left off in I 860, merely substituting for the individual ownership of slaves, a new state serfdom of black folk. The young Southern fanatic who murdered Abraham Lincoln said, according to the New York Times, April 21, 1865, "This country was formed for the white, not the black man." And looking upon African slavery from the same standpoint held by the noble framers of our Constitution, I, for one, have ever considered it of the greatest blessings, both for themselves and us, that God ever bestowed upon a favored nation. Witness heretofore our wealth and power. Witness their elevation and enlightenment above their race elsewhere. I have lived among it most of my life and have seen less harsh treatment from master to man than I have beheld in the North from father to son. Yet heaven knows, no one would be willing to do more for the Negro race than I, could I but see a way to still better their condition. But Lincoln's policy is only preparing the way for their total annihilation. The South had risked war to protect this system of labor and to expand it into a triumphant empire. And even if all of the Southerners did not agree with this broader program, even these had risked war in order to ward off the disaster of a free labor class, either white or black. Yet, they had failed, after a whirlwind of battles in which the South had put energy, courage and skill, and most of their money, in the face of inner bickerings and divided councils, jealousy of leaders, indifference of poor whites and the general strike of black labor, they had failed in their supreme effort, and now found themselves with much of their wealth gone, their land widely devastated, and some of it confiscated, their slaves declared free, and their country occupied by a hostile army. The South faced all sorts of difficulties. The hostilities, military and naval, had practically destroyed the whole commercial system of the South, and reduced the people to a pitiable primitive, almost barbaric level. It has been said that the ruining of the planting class in the South through war was more complete than the destruction of the nobility 128 and clergy in the French Revolution. The very foundations of the system were shattered. There was at the end of the war no civil authority with power in North and South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi and Texas, and in the other states, authority was only functioning in part under Congress or the President. The Northern soldiers were transported home with provisions for their comfort, and often with royal welcomes, while the Southern soldiers walked home in poverty and disillusioned. Lands had deteriorated because of the failure to use fertilizers. The marketing of the crops was difficult and the titles to land and crops disputed. Government officials seized much of the produce and the cotton tax of 3 cents a pound bore hard upon the planters. The mortality of the whites was so great in the decade following 1865, as to be a matter of common remark. 2. When a right and just cause loses, men suffer. But men also suffer when a wrong cause loses. Suffering thus in itself does not prove the justice or injustice of a cause. It always, however, points a grave moral. Certainly after the war, no one could restrain his sorrow at the destruction and havoc brought upon the whites. Least of all were the Negroes unsympathetic. Perhaps never in the history of the world have victims given so much of help and sympathy to their former oppressors. Yet the most pitiable victims of the war were not the rich planters, but the poor workers, not the white race, but the black. Naturally, the mass of the planters were bitterly opposed to the abolition of slavery. First, they based their opposition upon a lifelong conviction that free Negro labor could not be made profitable. The New Orleans Picayune said, July 8, 1862. In sober earnest, we say, and we believe all who know anything from observation or experience will corroborate our assertion, that this is an absolute impossibility. There could be no full crop produced under that system. The earlier processes might be performed in a manner and to some extent, but the later and more arduous, those upon the prompt performance of which depends the production of any crop at all, would be slighted, if not indeed entirely lost. The thriftless, thoughtless Negro would jingle his last month's wages in the planter's face and tell him to do the rest of the work himself. Look at Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and the other British West Indies where this experiment is having a most suggestive trial. Tian would be glad to witness a return to a system attended with more philanthropy and happiness to the black race than the one they seem determined to establish, for they will find that compulsory labor affords larger crops and a richer market for Yankee manufacturers. The masters were advised, therefore, not to turn their slaves loose to become demoralized, but to maintain a kind and protecting care over them. In addition to this, it was said that even if free Negro labor miraculously proved profitable, Negroes themselves were impossible as freemen, neighbors and citizens. They could not be educated and really civilized. And beyond that, if a free, educated black citizen and voter could be brought upon the stage, this would in itself be the worst conceivable thing on earth. Worse than shiftless, unprofitable labor. Worse than ignorance, worse than crime. It would lead inevitably to a mulatto South and the eventual ruin of all civilization. This was a natural reaction for a country educated as the South had been, and that the mass of the planters passionately believed it is beyond question, despite difficulties of internal logic. Even the fact that some thought free Negro labor practicable, and many knew perfectly well that at least some Negroes were capable of education and even of culture. These stood like a rock wall against anything further. Against Negro citizens, against Negro voters, against any social recognition in politics, religion or culture. The poor whites, on the other hand, were absolutely at sea. The Negro was to become apparently their fellow laborer. But were the whites to be bound to the black laborer by economic condition and destiny, or rather to the white planter by community of blood? Almost unanimously, following the reaction of such leaders as Andrew Johnson and Hinton Helper, the poor white clung frantically to the planter and his ideals, and although ignorant and impoverished, maimed and discouraged, victims of a war fought largely by the poor white for the benefit of the rich planter, they sought redress by demanding unity of white against black, and not unity of poor against rich, or of worker against exploiter. This brought singular schism in the South. The white planter endeavored to keep the Negro at work for his own profit on terms that amounted to slavery and which were hardly distinguishable from it. This was the plain voice of the slave codes. On the other hand, the only conceivable ambition of a poor white was to become a planter. Meantime, the poor white did not want the Negro put to profitable work. He wanted the Negro beneath the feet of the white worker. Right here had lain the seed of the trouble before the war. All the regular and profitable jobs went to Negroes, and the poor whites were excluded. It seemed after the war immaterial to the poor white that profit from the exploitation of black labor continued to go to the planter. He regarded the process as the exploitation of black folk by white, not of labor by capital. When, then, he faced the possibility of being himself compelled to compete with a Negro wage worker, while both were the hirelings of a white planter, his whole soul revolted. He turned, therefore, from war service to guerrilla warfare, particularly against Negroes. He joined eagerly secret organizations, like the Ku Klux Klan, which fed his vanity by making him co-worker with the white planter, and gave him a chance to maintain his race superiority by killing and intimidating niggers. And even in secret forays of his own, he could drive away the planter's black help, leaving the land open to white labor. Or he could murder two successful freedmen. It was only when they saw the Negro with a vote in his hand, backed by the power and money of the nation, that the poor whites who followed some of the planters into the ranks of the scalawags began to conceive of an economic solidarity between white and black workers. In this interval they received at the hands of the black voter and his allies a more general right to vote, to hold office and to receive education, privileges which the planter had always denied them. But before all this was so established as to be intelligently recognized, armed revolt in the South became organized by the planters with the cooperation of the mass of poor whites. Taking advantage of an industrial crisis which throttled both democracy and industry in the North, this combination drove the Negro back toward slavery. Finally the poor whites joined the sons of the planters and disfranchised the black laborer, thus nullifying the labor movement in the South for a half-century and more. As the Civil War staggered toward its end, the country began to realize that it was not only at the end of an era, but it was facing the beginning of a vaster and more important cycle. The emancipation of 4 million slaves might end slavery, but would it not also be the end of its 4 million victims? To be sure, there were many prophets, South and North, who foretold this fate of Negro extinction, but they were wrong. It was the beginning of Negro development, and what was this development going to be? Back of all the enthusiasm and fervor of victory in the North came a wave of reflection that represented the sober afterthought of the nation. It harked back to a time when not one person in 10 believed in Negroes, or in emancipation, or in any attempt to conquer the South. This feeling began to arise before the war closed, and after it ended it rose higher and higher into something like dismay. From before the time of Washington and Jefferson down to the Civil War, the nation had asked if it were possible for free Negroes to become American citizens in the full sense of the word. The answers to this problem, historically, had taken these forms. 1. Negroes, after conversion to Christianity, were in the same position as other colonial subjects of the British king. This attitude disappeared early in colonial history. 2. When the slave trade was stopped, Negroes would die out. Therefore, the attack upon slavery must begin with the abolition of the slave trade, and after that the race problem would settle itself. This attitude was back of the slave trade laws, 1808-20. 3. If Negroes did not die out, and if gradually by emancipation and the economic failure of slavery they became free, they must be systematically deported out of the country, back to Africa or elsewhere, where they would develop into an independent people or die from laziness or disease. This represented the attitude of liberal America from the end of the War of 1812 down to the beginning of the Cotton Kingdom. 4. Negroes were destined to be perpetual slaves in a new economy which recognized a caste of slave workers, and this caste system might eventually displace the white worker. At any rate, it was destined to wider expansion toward the tropics. This was the attitude of the Confederacy. It is clear that from the time of Washington and Jefferson down to the Civil War, when the nation was asked if it was possible for free Negroes to become American citizens in the full sense of the word, it answered by a stern and determined, no. The persons who conceived of the Negroes as free and remaining in the United States were a small minority before 1861, and confined to educated free Negroes and some of the abolitionists. This basic thought of the American nation now began gradually to be changed. It bore the face of fear. It showed a certain dismay at the thought of what the nation was facing after the war and under hypnotism of a philanthropic idea. The very joy in the shout of emancipated Negroes was a threat. Who were these people? Were we not loosing a sort of guerrilla into American freedom? Negroes were lazy, poor and ignorant. Moreover, their ignorance was more than the ignorance of whites. It was a biological, fundamental and ineradicable ignorance based on pronounced and eternal racial differences. The democracy and freedom open and possible to white men of English stock, and even to continental Europeans, were unthinkable in the case of Africans. We were moving slowly in an absolutely impossible direction. Meantime, there was anarchy in the South and the triumph of brute physical force over large areas. The classic report on conditions in the South directly after the war is that of Carl Schurz. Carl Schurz was of the finest type of immigrant Americans. A German of education and training, he had fought for liberal thought and government in his country, and when driven out by the failure of the Revolution of 1848, had come to the United States, where he fought for freedom. No man was better prepared dispassionately to judge conditions in the South than Schurz. He was to be sure an idealist and doctrinaire, but surely the hard-headed and the practical had made mess enough with America. This was a time for thought and plan. Schurz's reports on his journey remain today with every internal evidence of truth and reliability. His mission came about in this way. He had written Johnson on his North Carolina effort at Reconstruction, and Johnson invited him to call. President Johnson received me with the assurance that he had read my letters with great interest and appreciation, and that he was earnestly considering the views I had presented in them. But in one respect, he said, I had entirely mistaken his intentions. His North Carolina proclamation was not to be understood as laying down a general rule for the reconstruction of all the states lately in rebellion. It was to be regarded as merely experimental, and he thought that the condition of things in North Carolina was especially favorable for the making of such an experiment. As to the Gulf states, he was very doubtful and even anxious. He wished to see those states restored to their constitutional relations with the general government as quickly as possible, but he did not know whether it could be done with safety to the Union men and to the emancipated slaves. He therefore requested me to visit those states for the purpose of reporting to him whatever information I could gather as to the existing condition of things, and of suggesting to him such measures as my observations might lead me to believe advisable. 3. In his report, Schurz differentiated 4 classes in the South. 1. Those who, although having yielded submission to the national government only when obliged to do so, have a clear perception of the irreversible changes produced by the war, and honestly endeavor to accommodate themselves to the new order of things. 2. Those whose principal object is to have the states without delay restored to their position and influence in the Union, and the people of the states to the absolute control of their home concerns. They are ready in order to attain that object to make any ostensible concession. That will not prevent them from arranging things to suit their taste as soon as that object is attained. 3. The incorrigibles, who still indulge in the swagger which was so customary before and during the war, and still hope for a time when the Southern Confederacy will achieve its independence. 4. The multitude of people who have no definite ideas about the circumstances under which they live and about the course they have to follow, whose intellects are weak, but whose prejudices and impulses are strong, and who are apt to be carried along by those who know how to appeal to the latter. 4. He thus describes the movements immediately following the war. When the war came to a close, the labor system of the South was already much disturbed. During the progress of military operations, large numbers of slaves had left their masters and followed the columns of our armies. Others had taken refuge in our camps. Many thousands had enlisted in the service of the national government. Extensive settlements of Negroes had been formed along the seaboard and the banks of the Mississippi, under the supervision of army officers and treasury agents, and the government was feeding the colored refugees who could not be advantageously employed in the so-called contraband camps. Many slaves had also been removed by their masters, as our armies penetrated the country, either to Texas or to the interior of Georgia and Alabama. Thus a considerable portion of the laboring force had been withdrawn from its former employments. But a majority of the slaves remained on the plantations to which they belonged, especially in those parts of the country which were not touched by the war, and where, consequently, the Emancipation Proclamation was not enforced by the military power. Although not ignorant of the stake they had in the result of the contest, the patient bondmen waited quietly for the development of things. But as soon as the struggle was finally decided, and our forces were scattered about in detachments to occupy the country, the so far unmoved masses began to stir. The report went among them that their liberation was no longer a mere contingency, but a fixed fact. Large numbers of colored people left the plantations. Many flocked to our military posts and camps to obtain the certainty of their freedom, and others walked away merely for the purpose of leaving the places on which they had been held in slavery, and because they could now go with impunity. Still others, and their number was by no means inconsiderable, remained with their former masters and continued their work on the field, but under new and as yet unsettled conditions, and under the agitating influence of a feeling of restlessness. In some localities, however, where our troops had not yet penetrated and where no military post was within reach, planters endeavored and partially succeeded in maintaining between themselves and the Negroes the relation of master and slave, partly by concealing from them the great changes that had taken place, and partly by terrorizing them into submission to their behests. But aside from these exceptions, the country found itself thrown into that confusion which is naturally inseparable from a change so great and so sudden. The white people were afraid of the Negroes, and the Negroes did not trust the white people. The military power of the national government stood there, and was looked up to, as the protector of both. Some of the planters with whom I had occasion to converse expressed their determination to adopt the course which best accords with the spirit of free labor, to make the Negro work by offering him fair inducements, to stimulate his ambition, and to extend to him those means of intellectual and moral improvement which are best calculated to make him an intelligent, reliable and efficient free laborer and a good and useful citizen. I regret to say that views and intentions so reasonable I found confined to a small minority. Aside from the assumption that the Negro will not work without physical compulsion, there appears to be another popular notion prevalent in the South which stands as no less serious an obstacle in the way of a successful solution of the problem. It is that the Negro exists for the special object of raising cotton, rice and sugar for the whites, and that it is illegitimate for him to indulge, like other people, in the pursuit of his own happiness in his own way. I made it a special point in most of the conversations I had with Southern men to inquire into their views with regard to this subject. I found, indeed, some gentlemen of thought and liberal ideas who readily acknowledged the necessity of providing for the education of the colored people, and who declared themselves willing to cooperate to that end to the extent of their influence. Some planters thought of establishing schools on their estates, and others would have been glad to see measures taken to that effect by the people of the neighborhoods in which they lived. But whenever I asked the question whether it might be hoped that the legislatures of their states or their county authorities would make provisions for Negro education, I never received an affirmative, and only in 2 or 3 instances feebly encouraging answers. At last I was forced to the conclusion that, aside from a small number of honorable exceptions, the popular prejudice is almost as bitterly set against the Negroes having the advantage of education as it was when the Negro was a slave. There may be an improvement in that respect, but it would prove only how universal the prejudice was in former days. Hundreds of times I heard the old assertion repeated, that learning will spoil the nigger for work, and that Negro education will be the ruin of the South. Another most singular notion still holds a potent sway over the minds of the masses. It is, that the elevation of the blacks will be the degradation of the whites. The emancipation of the slaves is submitted to only in so far as chattel slavery in the old form could not be kept up. But although the freedman is no longer considered the property of the individual master, he is considered the slave of society, and all independent state legislation will share the tendency to make him such. The ordinances abolishing slavery passed by the conventions under the pressure of circumstances will not be looked upon as barring the establishment of a new form of servitude. Carl Schurz summed the matter up. Wherever I go, the street, the shop, the house, the hotel, or the steamboat, I hear the people talk in such a way as to indicate that they are yet unable to conceive of the Negro as possessing any rights at all. Men who are honorable in their dealings with their white neighbors will cheat a Negro without feeling a single twinge of their honor. To kill a Negro, they do not deem murder. To debauch a Negro woman, they do not think fornication. To take the property away from a Negro, they do not consider robbery. The people boast that when they get freedmen's affairs in their own hands, to use their own expression, the niggers will catch hell. The reason of all this is simple and manifest. The whites esteem the blacks their property by natural right, and however much they admit that the individual relations of masters and slaves have been destroyed by the war and by the President's Emancipation Proclamation, they still have an ingrained feeling that the blacks at large belong to the whites at large. Corroboration of the main points in the thesis of Schurz came from many sources. Point 5 from Virginia. Before the abolition of slavery, and before the war, it was the policy of slaveholders to make a free Negro as despicable a creature and as uncomfortable as possible. They did not want a free Negro about it all. They considered it an injury to the slave, as it undoubtedly was, creating discontent among the slaves. The consequences were that there was always an intense prejudice against the free Negro. Now, very suddenly, all have become free Negroes, and that was not calculated to allay that prejudice. A colored man testified. There was a distinct tendency toward compulsion, toward re-established slavery under another name. Negroes coming into Yorktown from regions of Virginia and thereabout said that they had worked all year and received no pay and were driven off the 1st of January. The owners sold their crops and told them they had no further use for them and that they might go to the Yankees, or the slaveholders offered to take them back but refused to pay any wages. A few offered $1 a month and clothing and food. They were not willing to pay anything for work. The courts aided the subjection of Negroes. George S. Smith of Virginia, resident since 1848, said that he had been in the Provost Marshal's department and have had great opportunities of seeing the cases that are brought before him. Although I am prejudiced against the Negro myself, still I must tell the truth, and must acknowledge that he has rights. In more than 9 cases out of 10 that have come up in General Patrick's office, the Negro has been right and the white man has been wrong, and I think that that will be found to be the case if you examine the different provost marshals. It was common for Virginians in 1865 and 1866 to advocate wholesale expulsion of the Negroes. This attitude arose from the slave trade. The slave system in Virginia has been such as to exhaust very largely the able-bodied laborers. I have been informed that 20,000 of that class were annually sold from Virginia. Consequently, a very large portion of the colored population there is composed of the aged, infirm, women and children, and the being freed from the necessity of supporting them is really a great relief in the present poverty of the people, a relief to their former owners. Of course, those who wanted Negro labor immediately and were pushed on by the current high prices for products, were willing to compromise in some respects. The more intelligent people there, those who have landed estates, need their labor. Being dependent upon them for labor, they see the necessity of employing them, and are disposed to get along with them. All of the people, however, are extremely reluctant to grant the Negro his civil rights, those privileges that pertain to freedom, the protection of life, liberty and property before the laws, the right to testify in the courts, etc. They are all very reluctant to concede that. And if it is ever done, it will be because they are forced to do it. They are reluctant even to consider and treat the Negro as a free man. Lieutenant Sanderson, who was in North Carolina for 3 years, said that as soon as the Southerners came in full control, they intended to put in force laws, not allowing a contraband to stay in any section over such a length of time without work, if he does, to seize him and sell him. In fact, that is done now in the county of Gates, North Carolina. The county police, organized under orders from headquarters, did enforce that. Mr. Parker told me that he had hired his people for the season. That directly after the surrender of General Lee, he called them up and told them they were free, that he was better used to them than to others, and would prefer hiring them, that he would give them board and 2 suits of clothing to stay with him till the East Day of January, 1866, and 1 Sunday suit at the end of that time. That they consented willingly, in fact, preferred to remain with him, etc. But from his people I learned that though he did call them up, as stated, yet when one of them demurred at the offer, his son James flew at him and cuffed and kicked him. That after that they were all perfectly willing to stay, they were watched night and day, that Bob, one of the men, had been kept chained nights, that they were actually afraid to try to get away. Sometimes the resentment at the new state of affairs was funny. A county judge near Goldsboro, who had never been addressed by a Negro unbidden, came to the quarters of Lieutenant Sanderson. "Lieutenant, what am I to stand from these freed people? I suppose you call them free. What insults am I obliged to suffer? I am in a perfect fever." I told him I saw he was, and asked him what he complained of. If there was anything wrong I would write it. "Well," said he, "one of these infernal niggers came along as I sat on my piazza this morning and bowed to me, and said 'Good morning,' one of your soldiers. From Alabama it was reported. The planters hate the Negro, and the latter class distrust the former, and while this state of things continues, there cannot be harmonious action in developing the resources of the country. Besides, a good many men are unwilling yet to believe that the peculiar institution of the South has been actually abolished, and still have the lingering hope that slavery, though not in name, will yet in some form practically exist. And hence the great anxiety to get back into the Union, which being accomplished, they will then, as I have heard it expressed, fix the Negro. It is the simple fact, capable of indefinite proof, that the black man does not receive the faintest shadow of justice. I aver that in 9 cases out of 10 within my own observation, where a white man has provoked an affray with a black and savagely misused him, the black man has been fined for insolent language because he did not receive the chastisement in submissive silence, while the white man has gone free. 6. The New York Herald says of Georgia, "Springing naturally out of this disordered state of affairs is an organization of regulators, so-called. Their numbers include many ex-Confederate cavaliers of the country, and their mission is to visit summary justice upon any offenders against the public peace. It is needless to say that their attention is largely directed to maintaining quiet and submission among the blacks. The shooting or stringing up of some obstreperous nigger by the regulators is so common an occurrence as to excite little remor, nor is the war of proscription confined to the freedmen only. The regulators go to the bottom of the matter, and strive to make it uncomfortably warm for any new settler with demoralizing innovations of wages for niggers." 7. A committee of the Florida legislature reported in 1865 that it was true that one of the results of the war was the abolition of African slavery. But it will hardly be seriously argued that the simple act of emancipation of itself worked any change in the social, legal or political status of such of the African race as were already free. Nor will it be insisted, we presume, that the emancipated slave technically denominated a freedman occupied any higher position in the scale of rights and privileges than did the free Negro. If these inferences be correct, then it results as a logical conclusion that all the arguments going to sustain the authority of the General Assembly to discriminate in the case of free Negroes equally apply to that of freedmen or emancipated slaves. But it is insisted by a certain class of radical theorists that the act of emancipation did not stop in its effect in merely severing the relation of master and slave, but that it extended further, and so operated as to exalt the entire race and place them upon terms of perfect equality with the white man. These fanatics may be very sincere and honest in their convictions, but the result of the recent elections in Connecticut and Wisconsin shows very conclusively that such is not the sentiment of the majority of the so-called free states. Some Southerners saw in emancipation nothing but extermination for the Negro race. The provisional governor of Florida became almost tearful over the impending fate of the Negroes and the guilt of the North. This unfortunate class of our population, but recently constituting the happiest and best provided for laboring population in the world, by no act of theirs or voluntary concurrence of ours, with no prior training to prepare them for their new responsibilities, have been suddenly deprived of the fostering care and protection of their old masters and are now to become, like so many children, gambling upon the brink of the yawning precipice, careless of the future and intent only on reveling in the present unrestrained enjoyment of the newly found bauble of freedom. 8. Judge Humphrey of Alabama said, "I believe in case of a return to the Union, we would receive political cooperation so as to secure the management of that labor by those who were slaves. There is really no difference, in my opinion, whether we hold them as absolute slaves or obtain their labor by some other method. Of course, we prefer the old method. But that question is not now before us." A 12-year resident of Alabama said, "There is a kind of innate feeling, a lingering hope among many in the South that slavery will be regalvanized in some shape or other. They tried by their laws to make a worse slavery than there was before, for the freedman has not now the protection which the master from interest gave him before." 9. Every day, the press of the South testifies to the outrages that are being perpetrated upon unoffending colored people by the state militia. These outrages are particularly flagrant in the states of Alabama and Mississippi, and are of such character as to demand most imperatively the interposition of the national executive. These men are rapidly inaugurating a condition of things, a feeling, among the freedmen that will, if not checked, ultimate in insurrection. The freedmen are peaceable and inoffensive. Yet if the whites continue to make it all their lives are worth to go through the country, as free people have a right to do, they will goad them to that point at which submission and patience cease to be a virtue. I call your attention to this matter after reading and hearing from the most authentic sources, officers and others, for weeks, of the continuance of the militia robbing the colored people of their property, arms, shooting them in the public highways if they refuse to halt when so commanded, and lodging them in jail if found from home without passes, and ask, as a matter of simple justice to an unoffending and downtrodden people, that you use your influence to induce the President to issue an order or proclamation forbidding the organization of state militia. 10. In Mississippi, in respectful earnestness I must say that if at the end of all the blood that has been shed and the treasure expended, the unfortunate Negro is to be left in the hands of his infuriated and disappointed former owners to legislate and fix his status, God help him, for his cup of bitterness will overflow indeed. Was ever such a policy conceived in the brain of men before? Sumner quotes an authority of peculiar value, a gentleman writing from Mississippi. "I regret to state that under the civil power deemed by all the inhabitants of Mississippi to be paramount, the condition of the freedmen in many portions of the country has become deplorable and painful in the extreme. Must give it as my deliberate opinion that the freedmen are today, in the vicinity where I am now writing, worse off in most respects than when they were held slaves. If matters are permitted to continue on as they now seem likely to be, it needs no prophet to predict a rising on the part of the colored population, and a terrible scene of bloodshed and desolation. Nor can anyone blame the Negroes if this proves to be the result. Have heard since my arrival here, of numberless atrocities that have been perpetrated upon the freedmen. It is sufficient to state that the old overseers are in power again. The object of the Southerners appears to be to make good their often repeated assertions, to the effect that the Negroes would die if they were freed. To make it so, they seem determined to goad them to desperation, in order to have an excuse to turn upon and annihilate them. General Fisk early in 1866 said, I have today received the statement of two very respectable colored men who went into northern Mississippi from Nashville and rented plantations. Both of them were men of means, and one a reputed son of Isham G. Harris, a former governor of Tennessee. Both were very intelligent colored men. They have been driven out and warned not to put their feet within the state again. Their written statements and affidavits I have, and will cheerfully place them in the hands of the committee if they desire it. They are reliable men. I know them both. A former Mississippi slaveholder wrote, as a man who has been deprived of a large number of persons he once claimed as slaves, I protest against such a course. If it is intended to follow up the abolition of slavery by a liberal and enlightened policy, by which I mean bestowing upon them the full rights of other citizens, then I can give this movement my heart and hand. But if the Negro is to be left in a helpless condition, far more miserable than that of slavery, I would ask what was the object of taking him from those who claimed his services. General Chetland tells us that while he was in command, for 2 months, of the Jackson district, containing 9 counties, there was an average of 1 black man killed every day, and that in moving out 40 miles on an expedition he found 7 Negroes wantonly butchered. Colonel Thomas, Assistant Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau for this state, tells us that there is now a daily average of 2 or 3 black men killed in Mississippi. The sable patriots in blue as they return are the objects of a special spite. Governor Sharkey of Mississippi said, "My expectation concerning them is that they are destined to extinction, beyond all doubt. We must judge of the future by the past. I could tell you a great many circumstances to that effect. I am sorry. I did not come prepared with means to state the percentage of deaths among them. It is alarming, appalling. I think they will gradually die out." General Fisk received a letter from a rich planter living in DeSoto County, Mississippi. He had on his plantation a little girl, and wrote me a long letter in relation to it, which closed up by saying, "As to recognizing the rights of freedmen to their children, I will say there is not one man or woman in all the South who believes they are free, but we consider them as stolen property, stolen by the bayonets of the damnable United States government. Yours truly, T. Yancey." There is one thing that must be taken into account, and that is there will exist a very strong disposition among the masters to control these people and keep them as a subordinate and subjected class. Undoubtedly they intend to do that. I think the tendency to establish a system of serfdom is the great danger to be guarded against. I talked with a planter in the Lafourche district, near Tebeduville. He said he was not in favor of secession. He avowed his hope and expectation that slavery would be restored there in some form. I said, "If we went away and left these people now, do you suppose you could reduce them to slavery?" He laughed to scorn the idea that they could not. "What," said I, "these men who have had arms in their hands?" "Yes," he said. "We should take the arms away from them, of course." There was no inconsiderable number of Southerners who stoutly maintained that Negroes were not free. The Planters Party of Louisiana in 1864 proposed to revive the Constitution of 1852 with all its slavery features. They believed that Lincoln had emancipated the slaves in the rebellious parts of the country as a war measure. Slavery remained intact within the federal lines except as to the return of fugitives, and might be reinstated everywhere at the close of hostilities. Or, in any case, compensation might be obtained by loyal citizens through the decision of the Supreme Court. The situation in Texas was peculiar. During the war, Texan produce had been sent to Europe by the way of Mexico, and a steady stream of cash came in which made slavery all the more valuable. At the end of the war slavery was essentially unimpaired. When the federal soldiers approached, some of the planters set their Negroes free and some Tyons to await federal action, and there was widespread belief that slavery was an institution and would continue in some form. The Houston, Texas, Telegraph was of the opinion that emancipation was certain to take place but that compulsory labor would replace slavery. Since the Negro was to be freed by the federal government solely with a view to the safety of the Union, his condition would be modified only so far as to ensure this, but not so far as materially to weaken the agricultural resources of the country. Therefore, the Negroes would be compelled to work under police regulations of a stringent character. Mr. Sumner reported in 1866 a special slave trade from the South to the West Indies and South America. Another big trade is going on, that of running Negroes to Cuba and Brazil. They are running through the country dressed in Yankee clothes, hiring men, giving them any price they ask, to make turpentine on the bay, sometimes on the rivers, sometimes to make sugar. They get them on the cars. Of course the Negro don't know where he is going. They get him to the bay and tell him to go on the steamer to go around the coast, and away goes poor Cuffy to slavery again. They are just cleaning out this section of the country of the likeliest men and women in it. Federal officers are mixed up in it, too. So much for the attitude of the owning class, the former slave owners. But the great mass of the Southerners were not slaveholders. They were white peasant farmers, artisans, with a few merchants and professional men. Large numbers of these were fed by the federal government and formed a considerable proportion of the fugitives after the war. General Hatch reported in 1866, "The poorer classes of the white people have an intense dislike toward Negroes in Mississippi. 5/6 of the soldiers in the Confederate Army were not slave owners, and had fought against the competition of Negroes, and for their continued slavery." The most discouraging feature was the utter helplessness of the white community in the face of the terrible problem. Almost any thoughtful traveler could see that the majority of the whites were parasites, idlers and semi-vagabonds. According to Sidney Andrews, the Negro, as bad as his condition is, said he, seems to me, on the whole, to accommodate himself more easily than the whites to the changed situation. I should say that the question at issue in the South is not, what shall be done with the Negro, but what shall be done with the whites? The blacks manage to live comfortably for the most part and help each other. But the whites, accustomed to having all their affairs managed by an aristocracy which was then ruined, seemed powerless. They chose committees and reported cases of suffering, but any organized action on a large scale could not be expected. It was hoped that aid for the whites would come from the North, for fearful distress from hunger was inevitable. General Turner said of the conditions in Virginia, "Among the lower classes of the whites there is a spirit of aggression against the Negro. And a great many of the Negroes are inclined to take the thing in their own hands. They are not disposed to be imposed upon by those people, if they can have half a show to defend themselves. With the lower classes, I speak now more particularly of the city of Richmond. Probably the feeling does not exist to such an extent in the rural districts. There is an impulsive feeling of aggression, a desire to get the Negro out of the way. They do not think of his rights. They do not appear to know what it means. Only they feel that the Negro has something. General Fisk spoke of Tennessee. It is a melancholy fact that among the bitterest opponents of the Negro in Tennessee are the intensely radical loyalists of the Mountain District, the men who have been in our armies. The poorer classes of the white people have an intense dislike toward them, said General Hatch. He especially emphasized the situation in Tennessee and spoke of the aid that was being given the white fugitives. He said that the Negro knew that without legal rights he was not safe from the poor whites, and that they had not issued to the Negroes 1/10 of the rations that they had given the poor whites. The hatred toward the Negro as a freeman is intense among the low and brutal, who are the vast majority. Murders, shootings, whippings, robbing and brutal treatment of every kind are daily inflicted upon them, and I am sorry to say in most cases they can get no redress. They don't know where to complain or how to seek justice after they have been abused and cheated. The habitual deference toward the white man makes them fearful of his anger and revenge. The Union members of the Tennessee legislature said that long before the war common laborers had learned to curse the Yankees and abolitionists and to talk about Negro equality and his rights in the territories. With all this went a great degree of personal violence. Leaving out for the moment the group violence, the organized fight against the Negro which was continuous, the personal physical opposition was continually in existence. A candidate for Congress in Virginia in 1865 said, "Redemption of this national debt, either directly or indirectly, and will vote to repeal all laws that have heretofore been passed for that purpose, and, in doing so, I do not consider that I violate any obligations to which the South was a party. We have never plighted our faith for the redemption of the war debt. The people will be borne down with taxes for years to come. Even if the war debt is repudiated, it will be the duty of the government to support the maimed and disabled soldiers, and this will be a great expense, and if the United States government requires the South to be taxed for the support of Union soldiers, we should insist that all disabled soldiers should be maintained by the United States government without regard to the side they had in the war. The national debt doubtless seems to you beyond the reach of any hand. Yet I regard it as very probable that one or two or all of three things will be attempted within 3 years after the Southern members of Congress are admitted to seats: the repudiation of the national debt, the assumption of the Confederate debt, or the payment of several $100 million to the South for property destroyed and slaves emancipated." A leader from South Carolina, James H. Campbell, said, "I believe that when our votes are admitted into that Congress, if we are tolerably wise, governed by a moderate share of common sense, we will have our own way. I am speaking now not to be reported. We will have our own way yet, if we are true to ourselves. We know the past, we know not what is to be our future. Are we not in a condition to accept what we cannot help? Are we not in a condition where it is the part of wisdom to wait and give what we cannot avoid giving? I believe as surely as we are a people, so surely, if we are guided by wisdom, we will by the beginning of the next presidential election, which is all that is known of the Constitution, for when you talk of the Constitution of the United States it means the presidential election and the share of the spoils. I believe then we may hold the balance of power." Thus gradually, the South conceived a picture. It deliberately looked backward toward slavery in a day when 2 Southern poor whites were presidents of the United States. Although he was the emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, too, in many respects, was looking backward toward the past. Lincoln's solution for the Negro problem was colonization. In this respect he went back to the early 19th century when the American colonization society was formed, with what proved to be 2 antagonistic objects. The first was the philanthropic object of removing the Negro to Africa and starting him on the road to an independent culture in his own fatherland. The second and more influential object was to get rid of the free Negro in the United States so as to make color caste the permanent foundation of American Negro slavery. The contradiction of these 2 objects was the real cause of the failure of colonization, since it early incurred the bitter opposition of both abolitionists and Negro leaders. The result of the movement was the establishment of Liberia in an inhospitable land and without adequate capital and leadership. The survival of that little country to our day is one of the miracles of Negro effort, despite all of the propaganda of criticism that has been leveled against that country. When the Negro question became prominent before the war, the project of colonization was revived, and Abraham Lincoln believed in it as one means of solving the great race problem involved in the existence of slavery in the United States. Without being an enthusiast, Lincoln was a firm believer in colonization. 1x. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln said at Peoria, Illinois, "If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that, whatever of high hope, as I think there is, there may be in this, in the long run its sudden execution is impossible. If they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days, and there are not surplus shipping and surplus money enough in the world to carry them there in many times 10 days. What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings. Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? I think that I would not hold one in slavery at any rate, yet the point is not clear enough for me to denounce people upon. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of whites will not. 12. Later, speaking at Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln declared that the separation of races is the only perfect preventive of amalgamation. Several prominent Republicans espoused deportation in 1859. F.B. Blair of Missouri wrote to Senator Doolittle of Minnesota, "I am delighted that you are pressing the colonization scheme in your campaign speeches. I touched upon it 3 or 4 times in my addresses in Minnesota, and if I am any judge of effect, it is the finest theme with which to get at the hearts of the people, and it can be defended with success at all points. I made it the culminating point and inevitable result of Republican doctrine." 13. When the general strike of slaves began during the war, and the black fugitives began to pour into the federal lines, Lincoln again brought forward his proposal of colonization, not simply for the freedmen, but for such free Negroes as should wish to emigrate. He suggested an appropriation for acquiring suitable territory and for other expenses. By an act of April 16, 1862, which abolished slavery in the District of Columbia, Congress made an appropriation of $100,000 for voluntary Negro emigrants at an expense of $100 each, and later, July 16, an additional appropriation of $500,000 was made at Lincoln's request. The President was authorized to make provision for transportation, colonization, and settlement in some tropical country beyond the limits of the United States, of such persons of the African race, made free by the provisions of this act, as may be willing to emigrate, having first obtained the consent of the government of said country to their protection and settlement within the same, with all the rights and privileges of freemen. 14. By an act of July 17, 1862, the President was authorized to colonize Negroes made free by the Confiscation Acts. Proceeds from confiscated property were to replace monies appropriated for colonization. Charles Sumner vigorously attacked these plans. He said colonization was unwise, because, besides its intrinsic and fatal injustice, you will deprive the country of what it most needs, which is labor. Those freedmen on the spot are better than mineral wealth. Each is a mine, out of which riches can be drawn, provided you let him share the product, and through him the general industry will be established, which is better than anything but virtue, and is, indeed, a form of virtue. 15. In several cases, President Lincoln interviewed delegations on the subject. He believed that a good colonization scheme would greatly encourage voluntary emancipation in the border states. He spoke to the border state representatives and said that room in South America for Negro colonization could be obtained cheaply. He received in August 1862 a committee of colored men, headed by E.M. Thomas, and urged colonization on account of the difference of race. Should the people of your race be colonized, and where? Why should they leave this country? You and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any other 2 races. Whether it is right or wrong I need not discuss, but this physical difference is a great disadvantage to us both, as I think. Your race suffers very greatly, many of them, by living among us, while ours suffers from your presence. In a word, we suffer on each side. If this is admitted, it affords a reason why we should be separated. If we deal with those who are not free at the beginning and whose intellects are clouded by slavery, we have very poor material to start with. If intelligent colored men, such as are before me, would move in this matter, much might be accomplished. 16. A bill was introduced into the House in 1862 appropriating $200 million to $20 million to colonize and the rest to purchase 600,000 slaves of Unionist owners in border states. The bill was not passed, but the committee made an elaborate report on colonization July 16, 1862, declaring, "The most formidable difficulty which lies in the way of emancipation in most, if not in all, the slave states is the belief which obtains especially among those who own no slaves that if the Negroes shall become free they must still continue in our midst, and in some measure be made equal to the Anglo-Saxon race. The belief in the inferiority of the Negro race is indelibly fixed upon the public mind. The differences of the races separate them as with a wall of fire. There is no instance in history where liberated slaves have lived in harmony with their former masters when denied equal rights. But the Anglo-Saxon will never give his consent to Negro equality, and the recollections of the former relation of master and slave will be perpetuated by the changeless color of the Ethiop's skin. Emancipation, therefore, without colonization could offer little to the Negro race. A revolution of the blacks might result, but only to their undoing. To appreciate and understand this difficulty, it is only necessary for one to observe that in proportion as the legal barriers established by slavery have been removed by emancipation, the prejudice of caste becomes stronger and public opinion more intolerant to the Negro race. 1t. In his second annual message, December 1, 1862, the President referred to communications from colored men who favored emigration, and to protests from several South American countries against receiving Negroes. He requested further appropriations for colonizing free Negroes with their own consent, but showed a deviation from his former philosophy. I cannot make it better known than it already is, that I strongly favor colonization, and yet I wish to say there is an objection urged against free-colored persons remaining in the country, which is largely imaginary, if not sometimes malicious. It is insisted that their presence would injure and displace white labor more by being free than by remaining slaves. If they stay in their old places, they jostle no white laborers. If they leave their old places, they leave them open to white laborers. Logically, then, there is neither more nor less of it. Emancipation, even without deportation, would probably enhance the wages of white labor and very surely would not reduce them. Reduce the supply of black labor by colonizing the black laborer out of the country. And by precisely so much you increase the demand for and wages of white labor. Several negotiations were begun with foreign countries that owned colonies in the West Indies, and with South American countries. The cabinet discussed the matter. Bates wanted compulsory deportation, but the president objected to this. Finally, he settled on two projects. One, in Panama, and the other in the West Indies, where an island was ceded by Haiti. An adventurer, named Koch, undertook to carry 5,000 colored immigrants to the island, but the result was a fiasco and a large number of the 400 actually sent died of disease and neglect, and were finally brought back to the United States on a war vessel. As late as April, 1865, President Lincoln said to General Butler, "But what shall we do with the Negroes after they are free?" inquired Lincoln. "I can hardly believe that the South and North can live in peace unless we get rid of the Negroes. Certainly they cannot, if we don't get rid of the Negroes whom we have armed and disciplined and who have fought with us, to the amount, I believe, of some 150,000 men. I believe that it would be better to export them all to some fertile country with a good climate, which they could have to themselves. You have been a staunch friend of the race from the time you first advised me to enlist them at New Orleans. You have had a great deal of experience in moving bodies of men by water. Your movement up the James was a magnificent one. Now we shall have no use for our very large navy. What then are our difficulties in sending the blacks away? I wish you would examine the question and give me your views upon it and go into the figures as you did before in some degree so as to show whether the Negroes can be exported." Butler replied, "I will go over this matter with all diligence and tell you my conclusions as soon as I can." The second day after that Butler called early in the morning and said, "Mr. President, I have gone very carefully over my calculations as to the power of the country to export the Negroes of the South, and I assure you that, using all your naval vessels and all the merchant marine fit to cross the seas with safety, it will be impossible for you to transport to the nearest place that can be found fit for them, and that is the island of San Domingo, half as fast as Negro children will be born here." 18. The Secretary of the Interior in December, 1863, reported that the Negroes were no longer willing to leave the United States and that they were needed in the army. For these reasons, he thought that they should not be forcibly deported. On July 2, 1864, all laws relating to Negro colonization were repealed. Lincoln was impressed by the loss of capital invested in slaves, but curiously never seemed seriously to consider the correlative loss of wage and opportunity of slave workers, the tangible results of whose exploitation had gone into the planters' pockets for 2 centuries. A.K. McClure says, "Sometime in August, 1864, I spent an hour or more with him alone at the White House, and I, then, for the first time spoke with frankness on the subject of restoring the insurgent states. He startled me by his proposition that he had carefully written out in his own hand on a sheet of notepaper, proposing to pay the South $400 million for the loss of their slaves. He was then a candidate for re-election, and grave doubts were entertained until after Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's victories in the Valley, as to the result of the contest between Lincoln and McClellan. And he well knew that if public announcement had been made of his willingness to pay the South $400 million for emancipation, it would have defeated him overwhelmingly." 19. This project of compensation for lost capital invested in slaves was permanently dropped, and Lincoln had to turn to the question of the relation of the seceded states to the Union once the war was ended. The situation was absolutely unique. It was impossible to appeal to constitutional precedents, for the Constitution never contemplated anything like the things that had happened between 1861 and 1865. The grave question of the future relation of the seceded states to the Union could not be settled by Lincoln's pragmatic procedure. It must be visioned as a whole and put into law and logic. Toward this, Lincoln was moving slowly and tentatively, seeking a formula that would work and yet be just to all men of all colors, and consistent with the legal fabric of the nation. Charles Sumner first laid down a comprehensive formula February 11, 1862. 1. Resolved, that any vote of secession, or other act, by a state hostile to the supremacy of the Constitution within its territory, is inoperative and void against the Constitution, and, when sustained by force, becomes a practical abdication by the state of all rights under the Constitution, while the treason it involves works instant forfeiture of all functions and powers essential to the continued existence of the state as a body politic, so that from such time forward the territory falls under the exclusive jurisdiction of Congress, as other territory, and the state becomes, according to the language of the law, fellow de se, tilde degree. This plan was too radical for Lincoln, but that spring he proceeded to appoint military governors in Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas and Louisiana, where the Union Army held parts of the states. During the summer, he corresponded with Southern friends in Louisiana and in December, clued to his pressure, 2 members of Congress were elected in Louisiana from New Orleans and its suburbs, which was the only part under the control of the Union Army. The Confederate legislature, which was meeting simultaneously at Shreveport, declared, 1. Every citizen, Negroes were not citizens, should vote who had not forfeited his citizenship by electing to adhere to the government of the United States. 2. $500,000 were voted to pay for slaves lost by death or otherwise while impressed on the public works. 3. Any slave bearing arms against the inhabitants of the state or the Confederate States, or who should engage in any revolt or rebellion or insurrection should suffer death. 21. The 2 Louisiana congressmen were admitted to Congress with some hesitation, and Lincoln was encouraged to make further experiment along this line. In his message of December 8, 1863, therefore, he outlined a general plan of Reconstruction. He regarded the states as still existing, even during the war, and that the rebellion was a combination of disloyal persons in the states. Reconstruction was an executive problem which consisted in creating a loyal class in the states and supporting that class by military power until it organized and operated the state government. The loyal class was to swear allegiance to the United States and to the acts of Congress unless they were held void or changed, and all persons could take this oath unless they were civil officials of the Confederate government, or military officers above the rank of colonel or lieutenant in the Navy, or unless they had resigned from Congress or the United States courts, or from Army and Navy, in order to aid the rebellion, or unless they had not treated colored soldiers or the leaders of colored soldiers as prisoners of war. Such a loyal class he was prepared to recognize in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina and North Carolina, when they formed not less than 1/10 of the votes cast in their state at the presidential election of I-860. Lincoln was careful to say that whether members who went to Congress from any of these states should be admitted or not rested exclusively with the houses of Congress and not with the president. Virginia was not included because Lincoln had already recognized the government at Alexandria as the true government of Virginia during the war, and, therefore, assumed that Virginia needed no reconstruction, but was to be treated like Kentucky and Missouri. Of course, the support of a government consisting of only 1/10 of its voters had to come from the outside, that is, from the Federal Army. In his accompanying proclamation of the same date, the President also engaged by this proclamation not to object to any provision which might be adopted by such state governments in relation to the freed people of the states which should recognize and declare their permanent freedom and provide for present condition, as a laboring, landless, and homeless class. Here emerged a clear feature of the Lincoln Plan which has not been emphasized. On this matter of the freedom of the Negroes, and a real, not a nominal freedom, Abraham Lincoln was adamant. In December 1863, his message contained an unusually forcible and luminous expression of the principles embraced in the proclamation. The President referred to the dark and doubtful days which followed the announcement of the policy of emancipation and of the employment of black soldiers. The gradual justification of those acts by the successes which the national arms had since achieved, of the change of the public spirit of the border states in favor of emancipation, the enlistment of black soldiers, and their efficient and creditable behavior in arms, the absence of any tendency to servile insurrection or to violence and cruelty among the Negroes, the sensible improvement in the public opinion of Europe and of America. In justification of his requiring, in the oath of amnesty, a submission to and support of the anti-slavery laws and proclamations, he said, "Those laws and proclamations were enacted and put forth for the purpose of aiding in the suppression of the rebellion. To give them their fullest effect, there had to be a pledge for their maintenance. In my judgment they have aided and will further aid the cause for which they were intended. To now abandon them would be not only to relinquish a lever of power, but would also be a cruel and an astounding breach of faith." The reception of Lincoln's message to Congress in December 1863 was enthusiastic. Men acted as though the millennium had come. Chandler was delighted, Sumner was joyous, apparently forgetting for the moment his doctrine of state suicide, while at the other political pole, Dixon and Reverdy Johnson said the message was highly satisfactory. Henry Wilson said to the President's secretary, "He has struck another great blow. Tell him for me, God bless him." The effect was similar in the House of Representatives. George S. Boutwell, who represented the extreme anti-slavery element of New England, said, "It is a very able and shrewd paper. It has great points of popularity, and it is right." Owen Gone went shouting about the lobby, "The President is the only man. There is none like him in the world. He sees more widely and more clearly than any of us." Henry T. Blow, the radical member from St. Louis, who was 6 months later denouncing Mr. Lincoln as a traitor to freedom, said, "God bless old Abe. I am one of the radicals who have always believed in him." Horace Greeley, who was on the floor of the House, went so far as to say the message was devilish good. The causes of this jubilation were, however, dangerously diverse. The abolitionists saw mainly the determination of Lincoln utterly to abolish slavery. This had not been clear before. Lincoln had never been an abolitionist, he had never believed in full Negro citizenship. He had tried desperately to win the war without Negro soldiers, and he had emancipated the slaves only on account of military necessity. On the other hand, Lincoln learned, he stood now for abolishing slavery forever, he gave full credit and praise to Negro soldiers, and he was soon to face the problem of Negro citizenship. Northern capital and Southern sympathizers in the North hailed the message because it carried no note of revenge or punishment, and contemplated speedy restoration of political independence in the South and normal industry. Now came the very pertinent question as to just how this freedom of Negroes was to be enforced and maintained. Lincoln, working at this problem in Louisiana, in his correspondence with Banks, who was now in command, and Shepley, military governor, encouraged PREPA, rations for a reconstructed state government. Banks arranged to elect state officials and accepted as the basis of voting the provisions of the Louisiana Constitution of 1852 which, of course, allowed no Negroes to vote. V. Accordingly, he declared the electors to be every free white male, 21 years of age, who had been resident in the state 12 months, and in the parish 6 months, who shall be a citizen of the United States and shall have taken the oath prescribed by the President in December, 1863. The total vote on February 22, 1864, was 11,355, degree F which Hahn received 6,171, Fellows, 2,959, and Flanders, 2,225, GLVMG a majority to Hahn for governor. 23. Ish field hands to the ballot box in the South, but that was not the problem which faced General Banks and Abraham Lincoln in 1864. In Louisiana, where the question of Negro suffrage first arose as a problem, there existed a group of free Negroes. Their fathers had been free when Louisiana was annexed to the United States. Their numbers had increased from 7,585 in 1810 to 25,505 in 1840, and then declined to 18,647 years I 860, by emigration and by passing over into the white race on the part of their octoroon and lighter members. Negroes in Louisiana in I 860 owned $15 million worth of property. The Rico family alone in 1859 owned 4,000 acres of land and 350 slaves, at a total value of $250,000. The development of this mulatto group was extraordinary. Beginning under the French and Spanish, they played a remarkable part in the history of the state. The Spanish government while in possession of Louisiana had raised among them 2 companies of militia, composed of all the mechanics which the city possessed. This group of Negroes took part in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and was extravagantly praised by Andrew Jackson. They were the cause of an extraordinary blossoming of artistic life, which made New Orleans in the early part of the 19th century the most picturesque city of America. Negro musicians and artists arose. Eugene Warburg, a colored man, went from New Orleans to become a sculptor in France. Dubuclet became a musician in France, and the 7 Lamberts taught and composed in North and South America and Europe. Sidney was decorated for his work by the King of Portugal, and Edmond Didi became a director of a leading orchestra in France. Alexander Pickhill was a painter, who died between 1840 and 1850. Joseph Abbard was an architect and planned many New Orleans buildings before the war. Norbert Rillieux invented the vacuum pan used in producing sugar. As an engineer and contractor, Rillieux had no rivals in Louisiana. The general periodicals in New Orleans praised him but seldom alluded to his Negro descent. In 1843–1845, New Orleans Colored Folk issued a magazine and 17 of the young mulatto poets collected an anthology called Les Senelles, which they published as a small volume. They were all men educated either in France or in private schools in Louisiana, and were in contact with some of the best writers and literature of the day. It is doubtful if anywhere else in the United States a literary group of equal culture could have been found at the time. In 1850, 4/5 of the free Negroes living in New Orleans could read and write, and they had over 1,000 children in school. Among them were carpenters, tailors, shoemakers and printers, besides teachers, planters and professional men. James Durham, a colored man in New Orleans in 1800, had a medical practice of $3,000 a year. He was especially commended by Dr. Benjamin Rush. Below the professional level were numbers of Negroes of ability. There was the celebrated sorceress, Marie Laveau, who, about 1835, exercised an extraordinary influence throughout the city. In 1850, Louisiana had a colored architect, 6 physicians, 4 engineers, and over 20 teachers in schools and in music. As early as 1803, free colored men were admitted to the police force to patrol outside the city limits, to catch runaway slaves and stop looting and crime. There was systematic common law marriage between whites and mulattoes. The connections formed with the quadroons and octoroons were often permanent enough for the rearing of large families, some of whom obtained their freedom through the affection of their fathermaster, and received the education he would have bestowed upon legitimate offspring. When Butler came to New Orleans, it was one of these colored Creoles who entertained him at a banquet of 7 courses served on silver. The secret, darling desire of this class is to rank as human beings in their native city, or, as the giver of the grand banquet expressed it, no matter where I fight. I only wish to spend what I have, and fight as long as I can, if only my boy may stand in the street equal to a white boy when the war is over. 24. The best blood of the South flowed in their veins, and a great deal of it, for the darkest of them, said General Butler, were about of the complexion of the late Mr. Webster. 25. This was the history of the free Negroes of New Orleans, and to this must be added their labor, cooperation and enlistment as soldiers. Could the government of the United States allow Confederate soldiers to vote simply because they were white, and exclude Union soldiers simply because they were yellow or black? Even if the Negroes had been quiescent and willing to be ignored at this critical time, their rights were indisputable, but they were not quiet. The Negroes themselves made strong statements. In November, 1863, the free men of color held a meeting in New Orleans and drew up an appeal to Governor Shepley, asking to be allowed to register and vote. They reviewed their services under Jackson, who called them my fellow citizens, just after the Battle of New Orleans, and they declared their present loyalty to the Union. For 49 years, the petition ran, they have never ceased to be peaceable citizens, paying their taxes on assessments of more than $9 million. But, however strongly this petition appealed to Shepley, it was manifestly impossible to grant it at this time. The decisive reason was that if Negroes had been allowed to vote in this election, they would have formed the majority of the voting population of Union Louisiana. So far as is known, Shepley returned no answer to the appeal, for in the following January, the Colored Union Radical Association sent a committee to call on Shepley requesting him to recognize the rights of the free colored population to the franchise. Shepley, unwilling and unable to assume such responsibility, referred the committee to General Banks, but the latter gave them no definite reply. He explained later, I thought it unwise to give them the suffrage, as it would have created a Negro constituency. The whites might give suffrage to the Negroes, but if the Negroes gave suffrage to the whites, it would result in the Negro losing it. My idea was to get a decision from Judge Durrell declaring a man with a major part of white blood should possess all the rights of a white man. But I had a great deal to do, and a few men who wanted to break the bundle of sticks without loosening the band defeated it. 26. Accordingly, the Colored Committee sent P.M. Tournay to Washington to advocate their claims before the President. The President sent a man named McKee to New Orleans to study conditions among the colored people. Lincoln was impressed but characteristically reticent and slow in action. General Banks next issued a call for a constitutional convention to be held March 28, 1864, to amend the Constitution of 1852. Contrary to this constitution, he based representation in the new government on the white population alone, so as to reduce the power of the great landholders. And Negroes were not allowed to vote. The total vote for this convention was only 6,400. When asked to direct the Louisiana Constitutional Convention of 1864, Lincoln refused and wrote, While I very well know what I would be glad for Louisiana to do, it is quite a difficult thing for me to assume direction in the matter. I would be glad for her to make a new constitution recognizing the Emancipation Proclamation, and adopting emancipation in those parts of the state to which the proclamation does not apply. And while she is at it, I think it would not be objectionable for her to adopt some practical system by which the two races could gradually lift themselves out of their old relation to each other, and both come out better prepared for the new. Education for young blacks should be included in the plan. After all, the power or element of contract may be sufficient for this probationary period, and by its simplicity and flexibility be better. As an anti-slavery man, I have a motive to desire emancipation. Reasons to thus place themselves again under the shield of the Union, and to thus perpetually hedge against the recurrence of the scenes through which we are now passing. For my own part, I think I shall not, in any event, retract the Emancipation Proclamation, nor, as executive, ever return to slavery any person who is free by the terms of that proclamation, or by any of the acts of Congress. If Louisiana shall send members to Congress, their admission will depend, as you know, upon the respective houses and not upon the President. 2t. Here again was the same insistence that Negro freedom must be real and guaranteed, and again the puzzling question, how could this be accomplished? Abraham Lincoln took a forward step, and by his letter of March 13 to the newly elected Governor Hahn, he made the first tentative suggestion for a Negro suffrage in the South. Evidently, the persistent agitation of colored New Orleans inspired this. Executive Mansion, TT, Washington, March 13, 1864. Hahn. Michael Hahn. 6 feet. T. My dear sir, in congratulating you on having fixed your name in history as the first free state governor of Louisiana, now you are about to have a convention, which, among other things, will probably define the elective franchise. I barely suggest, for your private consideration, whether some of the colored people may not be let in, as, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. They would probably help in some trying time in the future to keep the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom. But this is only suggestion, not to the public, but to you alone. Truly yours, A. Lincoln, 28. This was a characteristic Lincoln gesture. He did not demand or order, he suggested, and incidentally adduced logical arguments of tremendous strength. This letter of Lincoln's, says Blaine, was of deep and almost prophetic significance. It was perhaps the earliest proposition from any authentic source to endow the Negro with the right of suffrage. 29. Tion, therefore, quietly and secretly, and he knew that he had a slowly growing public opinion in the North behind him. To keep the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom was a splendid and pregnant phrase, and it had back of it unassailable facts. The delegates met April 6, 1864, and sat for 78 days. The convention was divided on the question of compensation for loyal slaveholders, the education of the freedmen at the expense of the state, and Negro suffrage. Slavery was abolished by a vote of 72 to 13. An appeal was made to Congress for compensation for slaves, and on May 10, the convention adopted a resolution declaring that the legislature should never pass any act authorizing free Negroes to vote. Banks and Hahn, however, brought pressure to bear, and some 40 votes were changed, so that June 23, Gorlinsky moved that the legislature shall have power to pass laws extending the right of suffrage to such persons, citizens of the United States, as by military service, by taxation to support the government, or by intellectual fitness, may be deemed entitled thereto. Many members did not understand this, but Sullivan of New Orleans denounced it as a nigger resolution, and moved to lay it on the table. Without discussion, it was adopted 48 to 32. Before the assembling of the convention, Banks on his own responsibility had appointed a board of education, of 3 members, for the freedmen's schools and given it power to establish schools in every school district, and to levy a tax to support the system. This order was discussed in the convention, and finally approved by a vote of 72 to 9. Also, by a vote of 53 to 27, general taxation for the support of free public schools for all was approved. The convention discussed a proposition of recognizing all persons as white who had less than 1/4 of Negro blood. But this involved 2 intricate inquiries into ancestry, a matter which often in Louisiana led to duels and murder. It was, therefore, voted down. The expense of this white convention amounted to more than $1,000 a day and included liquor, cigars, carriage hire, stationery and furniture. It illustrated the extravagant habits of the time, and was quite as bad as any similar waste in South Carolina when Negroes were part of the legislature. The New Orleans Times described some of the proceedings of the convention as sickening and disgusting, and said that the president was drunk and a damned fool, and that pandemonium had reigned. 30. The Constitution was finally adopted, 67 to 16, and the convention adjourned in August with a provision that it could be reconvoked by the president for further amending the Constitution. The Constitution was adopted by a vote of 6,836 to 1,566. On September 5, 1864, a legislature was elected according to the new Constitution. There were 9,838 votes cast, and it was alleged that many colored persons were allowed to register and vote. The new legislature met October 3, 1864. This legislature is said by some authorities to have refused by a large majority to grant the suffrage to the Negro. Ficklin, on the other hand, says that no final vote was actually taken. Certainly the legislature was against Negro suffrage. And when a petition was introduced from 5,000 Negroes, many if not the majority, of whom had been in the Federal Army, asking for the suffrage, no action was taken. One member, apparently expressing the general sentiment, said, "It will be time enough to grant this petition when all the other free states grant it and set us the example. When this state grants it, I shall go to China." 31. Governor Hahn made no suggestion, and when he resigned from office, said that universal suffrage would be granted, whenever it is deemed wise and timely. Louisiana has already done more than 3/4 of the northern states. The legislature refused to permit marriages between blacks and whites, and there was one attempt to refer the question of Negro suffrage to the people. The 13th Amendment was adopted in. United States senators were elected, including Governor Hahn for the term beginning in 1865. Meantime, the whole problem of Reconstruction in Louisiana came up in Congress and met the opposition represented by the Wade-Davis bill. In Arkansas, in a similar way, by white suffrage and anti-slavery. Constitution was adopted and senators and representatives elected in the spring of 1864. Yet, after all, this was general and preliminary, and certain details must be settled before representatives and senators from these states could be received in Congress. Especially the question loomed as to how far Reconstruction was going to be an automatic executive function and how far a matter of congressional supervision. Congress, thereupon, decided to lay down a fundamental plan. The part of the president's message on Reconstruction was referred in the House to a select committee, of which Henry Winder Davis was chairman. The result was a congressional scheme of Reconstruction. The Wade-Davis bill, passed July 4, 1864, provided that the 11 states which had seceded were to be treated as rebellious communities, over each of which the president would appoint a provisional Governor. This governor should exercise all powers of government until the state was recognized by Congress as restored. Whenever the governor regarded the rebellion in his state as suppressed, he was to direct the United States Marshal to enroll all resident white male citizens and give them an opportunity to swear allegiance to the United States. When a majority of these citizens had taken the oath, they could elect delegates to a convention and the convention would establish a state government. Persons who had held any office under the Confederate government could not vote for delegates, or be elected as delegates to the convention. The convention was to adopt a state constitution which must abolish slavery, repudiate Confederate and state debts incurred by the Confederates, and disqualify Confederate officials from voting, or being elected governor or a member of the legislature. When this constitution was ratified by a majority of the voters, the president, with the consent of Congress, would proclaim the state government as established. After that, representatives, senators, and presidential electors could be chosen. The bill also abolished slavery in the rebellious states during the process of Reconstruction. Thus Congress followed Charles Sumner's state suicide theory and formulated Reconstruction measures which regarded the seceding states as territories and administered them as such by civil government until they were readmitted. This bill did not differ radically from the president's plan. It was quite as liberal to the Confederates and wiser in requiring a majority of voters, instead of only 1/10, for Reconstruction. It was more methodical and complete because Lincoln had been leaving the matter vague until he could sense more clearly the possibilities. Both the Wade-Davis plan and the Lincoln plan excluded the Negro from the right of suffrage. In the House there was a motion to strike out the word white, but this was cut off by the previous question. Boutwell regretted, May 4, that this limitation of the right to vote seemed required by the present judgment of the House and of the country. When the bill came to the Senate July 1, Wade, as chairman, reported it to the committee with an amendment striking out the word white. This amendment received only 5 votes, including that of Charles Sumner. Sumner, however, finally voted for the bill because of its provisions against slavery he had already introduced. May 27, 1864, another resolution anticipating the Committee of 15 in the 39th Congress, and declaring that no representatives from Confederate states should be admitted without a vote of both houses. Lincoln, however, became more and more obdurate. He wrote, "Some single mind must be master," and he wished strongly to carry through Reconstruction without too much interference. When the Wade-Davis bill came to the President July 4, 1864, he laid it aside and refused to sign it, explaining his position. July 8, 1864, in a proclamation, "While I am, as I was in December, prepared by formal approval of this bill to be inflexibly committed to any single plan of restoration, and while I am also unprepared to declare that the free state constitutions and governments, already adopted and installed in Arkansas and Louisiana, shall be set aside and held for naught, thereby repealing and discouraging the loyal citizens who have set up the same as to further effort, or to declare a constitutional competency in Congress to abolish slavery in states. But am at the same time sincerely hoping and expecting that a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery throughout the nation may be adopted. Nevertheless, I am fully satisfied with the system for restoration contained in the bill as one very proper plan for the loyal people of any state choosing to adopt it, and I am, and at all times shall be, prepared to give the executive aid and assistance to any such people, so soon as military resistance to the United States shall have been suppressed in any such state, and the people thereof shall have sufficiently returned to their obedience to the Constitution and the laws of the United States, in which cases military governors will be appointed, with directions to proceed according to the bill." Senator Wade and Representative Davis took their contentions to the country in the summer of 1864. We have read without surprise, but not without indignation, the proclamation of the President of the 8th of July, 1864. The supporters of the administration are responsible to the country for its conduct, and it is their right and duty to check the encroachments of the executive on the authority of Congress, and to require it to confine itself to its proper sphere. They denounced Lincoln's Reconstruction plan and emphasized the distinction between executive and legislative power in Reconstruction. Despite the manifesto and opposition on other grounds, Lincoln was re-elected. The issue remained to be fought out between Congress and Johnson. Again in his message of December, 1864, Lincoln returned even more emphatically to the matter of the freedom of the slaves. One cannot be in much doubt as to what Abraham Lincoln's reaction would have been to the black codes of South Carolina and Mississippi. Certainly no state with such laws concerning the black laborer would have been admitted to the Union with Abraham Lincoln's consent. While I remain in my present position, I shall not attempt to retract or modify the Emancipation Proclamation, nor shall I return to slavery any person who is free by the terms of that proclamation, or by any of the acts of Congress. The people should, by whatever mode or means, it an executive duty to re-enslave such persons, another, and not I, must be their instrument to perform it. 32. The Trumbull Resolution of February 18, 1865, recognizing the restored Louisiana government, revealed a disposition in the Senate to yield to Lincoln. But the rising abolition democracy protested. Wendell Phillips spoke in Faneuil Hall. "Gentlemen, You know very well that this nation called 4 million of Negroes into citizenship to save itself. Applause. It never called them for their own sakes. It called them to save itself. Cries of, "Here! Here!" And today this resolution offered in Faneuil Hall would take from the president of such a nation the power to protect the millions you have just lifted into danger. Cries of, "Played out, sit down," etc. You won't let him protect them. Cries of, "No, what more contemptible object than a nation which for its own selfish purpose summons 4 millions of Negroes to such a position of peril, and then leaves them defenseless." In the Senate, Sumner was adamant in his demand that all men, irrespective of color, should be equal as citizens in the reconstructed states. He believed that a first false step in this matter would be fatal. The debate began February 23, 1865, and Sumner fought every step. He moved a substitute which received only 8 votes. He tried to displace the resolution, and filibustered. When asked to give up, he replied, "That is not my habit." Sumner sent in a second substitute declaring that the cause of human rights and of the Union needed the ballots as well as the muskets of colored men. He offered another amendment imposing equal suffrage as the fundamental condition for the admission of the seceded states. A night session was called which lasted until nearly Sunday morning. Sumner was rebuked for his arrogance and assumed superiority, and the Senate finally adjourned, half an hour before midnight. Only 5 days of the session remained. Wade now entered the debate and denounced the Louisiana government as a mockery and compared it to the Lecompton Constitution of Kansas. Sumner again bitterly arraigned the proposed Louisiana state government as a mere 7 months abortion, begotten by the bayonet, in criminal conjunction with the spirit of caste, and born before its time, rickety, unformed, unfinished, whose continued existence will be a burden, a reproach, and a wrong. 3-3. The bill finally failed. It was Sumner's greatest parliamentary contest, and with his triumph, the cause of Negro suffrage was won. Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, Parker Pillsbury and others wrote to congratulate Sumner. Douglass said, "The friends of freedom all over the country have looked to you. All this terrible war. They will look to you all the more now that peace dawns, and the final settlement of our national troubles is at hand. God grant you strength equal to your day and your duties, is my prayer and that of millions." Ashley's Reconstruction Bill came before the House of Representatives January 16, February 21, and February 22, 1865. Each draft confined suffrage to white male citizens, except one, in which colored soldiers were admitted to the suffrage. Ashley opposed this discrimination, but his committee overruled him. In his last public speech, April 11, 1865, Lincoln returned to the subject of Reconstruction. The new Constitution of Louisiana, declaring emancipation for the whole state, practically applies the proclamation to the part previously accepted. It does not adopt apprenticeship for freed people, and it is silent, as it could not well be otherwise, about the admission of members to Congress. So that, as it applies to Louisiana, every member of the cabinet fully approved the plan. The message went to Congress, and I received many commendations of the plan, written and verbal, and not a single objection to it from any professed emancipationist came to my knowledge until after the news reached Washington that the people of Louisiana had begun to move in accordance with it. From about July, 1862, I had corresponded with different persons supposed to be interested in seeking a reconstruction of a state government for Louisiana. When the message of 1863, with the plan before mentioned, reached New Orleans, General Banks wrote me that he was confident that the people, with his military cooperation, would reconstruct substantially on that plan. I wrote to him and some of them to try it. They tried it, and the result is known. Such only has been my agency in setting up the Louisiana government. We all agree that the seceded states, so-called, are out of their proper practical relation with the Union, and that the sole object of the government, civil and military, in regard to those states, is to again get them into that proper practical relation. I believe that it is not only possible, but in fact easier, to do this without deciding or even considering whether these states have ever been out of the Union, than with it. Finding themselves safely at home, it would be utterly immaterial whether they had ever been abroad. Let us all join in doing the acts necessary to restoring the proper practical relations between these states and the Union, and each forever after innocently indulge his own opinion whether in doing the acts he brought the states from without into the Union, or only gave them proper assistance, they never having been out of it. The amount of constituency, so to speak, on which the new Louisiana government rests, would be more satisfactory to all if it contained 50,000, or 30,000, or even 20,000, instead of only about 12,000, as it does. It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent, and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. Still, the question is not whether the Louisiana government, as it stands, is quite all that is desirable. The question is, will it be wiser to take it as it is and help to improve it, or to reject and disperse it? Can Louisiana be brought into proper practical relation with the Union sooner by sustaining or by discarding her new state government? Some 12,000 voters in the heretofore slave state of Louisiana have sworn allegiance to the Union, assumed the rightful political power of the state, held elections, organized a state government, adopted a free state constitution, giving the benefit of public schools equally to black and white, and empowered the legislature to confer the elective franchise upon the colored man. Their legislature has already voted to ratify the constitutional amendment, recently passed by Congress, abolishing slavery throughout the nation. These 12,000 persons are thus fully committed to the Union and to perpetual freedom in the state, committed to the very things, and nearly all the things, the nation wants, and they ask the nation's recognition and its assistance to make good their committal. Now, if we reject and spurn them, we do our utmost to disorganize and disperse them. We, in effect, say to the white man, you are worthless or worse. We will neither help you, nor be helped by you. To the blacks we say, this cup of liberty which these, your old masters, hold to your lips, we will dash from you, and leave you to the chances of gathering the spilled and scattered contents in some vague and undefined when, where, and how. If this course, discouraging and paralyzing both white and black, has any tendency to bring Louisiana into proper practical relations with the Union, I have so far been unable to perceive it. If, on the contrary, we recognize and sustain the new government of Louisiana, the converse of all this is made true. We encourage the hearts and nerve the arms of the 12,000 to adhere to their work, and argue for it, and proselyte for it, and fight for it, and feed it, and grow it, and ripen it to a complete success. The colored man, too, in seeing all united for him, is inspired with vigilance and energy and daring to the same end. Grant that he desires the elective franchise, will he not attain it sooner by saving the already advanced steps towards it than by running backward over them? Concede that the new government of Louisiana is only to what it should be as the egg is to the fowl. We shall sooner have the fowl by hatching the egg than by smashing it. 34. The tragic death of Lincoln has given currency to the theory that the Lincoln policy of Reconstruction would have been far better and more successful than the policy afterward pursued. If it is meant by this that Lincoln would have more carefully followed public opinion and worked to adjust differences, this is true. But Abraham Lincoln himself could not have settled the question of emancipation, Negro citizenship and the vote, without tremendous difficulty. First of all, he was bitterly hated by the overwhelming mass of Southerners. Mark Pomeroy, a Northern Copperhead, voiced the extreme Southern opinion when he wrote, "It is you Republicans who set up at the head of the nation a hideous clown, who became a shameless tyrant, a tyrant justly felled by an avenging hand, and who now rots in his tomb while his poisonous soul is consumed by the eternal flames of hell." 3-0. Even conservative Southern papers continually referred to Lincoln as a gorilla, or a clown. And when we consider the fact that Lincoln was determined upon real freedom for the Negro, upon his education, and at least a restricted right to vote, it is difficult to see how the South could have been brought to agreement with him. In the South there was absence of any leadership corresponding in breadth and courage to that of Abraham Lincoln. Here comes the penalty which a land pays when it stifles free speech and free discussion and turns itself over entirely to propaganda. It does not make any difference if at the time the things advocated are absolutely right, the nation, nevertheless, becomes morally emasculated and mentally hogtied, and cannot evolve that healthy difference of opinion which leads to the discovery of truth under changing conditions. Suppose, for instance, there had been in the South in 1863 a small but determined and clear-thinking group of men who said, the Negro is free, and to make his freedom real, he must have land and education. He must be guided in his work and development, but guided toward freedom and the right to vote. Such complete freedom and the bestowal of suffrage must be a matter of some years, but at present we do not propose to take advantage of this and retain political power based on the non-voting parts of our population. We, therefore, accept the constitutional amendment against slavery. We accept any other amendment which will base representation on voting, or other proposals which will equalize the voting power of North and South. We admit the right of the government to exercise a judicious guardianship over the slaves so long as we have reasonable voice in this guardianship, and that the interests of the employer as well as the employee shall be kept in mind. And in anticipation of this development, we propose to pass a reasonable code of laws recognizing the new status of the Negro. If there had been in the white South at this time far-seeing leadership or even some common sense, the subsequent history of Reconstruction and of the Negro in the United States would have been profoundly changed. Suppose a single state like Louisiana had allowed the Negro to vote, with a high property qualification, or the ability to read and write, or service in the army, or all these. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens would not have been wholly satisfied, but certainly their demands would have been greatly modified. Both of them were perfectly willing to wait for Negro suffrage until the Negro had education and had begun his economic advance, but they did insist that he must have the chance to advance. There cannot be the slightest doubt that such a program would have gathered enough support in the North to have made the history of Reconstruction not easy and without difficulty, but far less difficult than it proved to be. There were in the South in 1865 men who saw this truth plainly and said so, but true effective leadership was denied them. Just as before the war public opinion in the South was hammered into idolatrous worship of slavery, so after the war, even more bitterly and cruelly, public opinion demanded a new unyielding conformity. Here was a land of poignant beauty, streaked with hate and blood and shame, where God was worshipped wildly, where human beings were bought and sold, and where even in the 20th century men are burned alive. The situation here in 1865 was fatal, and fatal because of the attitude of men's minds rather than because of material loss and disorganization. The human mind, its will and emotions, congealed to one set pattern, until here were people who knew they knew one thing above all others, just as certainly as they knew that the sun rose and set. And that was, that a Negro would not work without compulsion, and that slavery was his natural condition. If by force and law the Negro was free, his only chance to remain free was transportation immediately to Africa or some outlying district of the world, where he would soon die of starvation or disease. Such colonization was impracticable, and Southern slavery, as it existed before the war, was the best possible system for the Negro. And this the vast majority of Southerners were forced to believe as firmly in 1865 as they did in I-860. The whole proof of what the South proposed to do to the emancipated Negro, unless restrained by the nation, was shown in the black codes passed after Johnson's accession, but representing the logical result of attitudes of mind existing when Lincoln still lived. Some of these were passed and enforced. Some were passed and afterward repealed or modified when the reaction of the North was realized. In other cases, as for instance, in Louisiana, it is not clear just which laws were retained and which were repealed. In Alabama, the governor induced the legislature not to enact some parts of the proposed code which they overwhelmingly favored. The original codes favored by the Southern legislatures were an astonishing affront to emancipation and dealt with vagrancy, apprenticeship, labor contracts, migration, civil and legal rights. In all cases, there was plain and indisputable attempt on the part of the Southern states to make Negroes slaves in everything but name. They were given certain civil rights. The right to hold property, to sue and be sued. The family relations for the first time were legally recognized. Negroes were no longer real estate. Yet, in the face of this, the black codes were deliberately designed to take advantage of every misfortune of the Negro. Negroes were liable to a slave trade under the guise of vagrancy and apprenticeship laws. To make the best labor contracts, Negroes must leave the old plantations and seek better terms. But if caught wandering in search of work, and thus unemployed and without a home, this was vagrancy, and the victim could be whipped and sold into slavery. In the turmoil of war, children were separated from parents, or parents unable to support them properly. These children could be sold into slavery, and the former owner of said minors shall have the preference. Negroes could come into court as witnesses only in cases in which Negroes were involved. And even then, they must make their appeal to a jury and judge who would believe the word of any white man in preference to that of any Negro on pain of losing office and caste. The Negro's access to the land was hindered and limited, his right to work was curtailed, his right of self-defense was taken away, when his right to bear arms was stopped, and his employment was virtually reduced to contract labor with penal servitude as a punishment for leaving his job. And in all cases, the judges of the Negro's guilt or innocence, rights and obligations were men who believed firmly, for the most part, that he had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. Making every allowance for the excitement and turmoil of war, and the mentality of a defeated people, the black codes were infamous pieces of legislation. Sequent law declared that no person of color shall migrate into and reside in this state, unless, within 20 days after his arrival within the same, he shall enter into a bond, with 2 freeholders as sureties, in a penalty of $1,000, conditioned for his good behavior, and for his support. Especially in the matter of work was the Negro narrowly restricted. In South Carolina, he must be especially licensed if he was to follow on his own account any employment, except that of farmer or servant. Those licensed must not only prove their fitness, but pay an annual tax ranging from $1 EU. Under no circumstances could they manufacture or sell liquor. Licenses for work were to be granted by a judge and were revocable on complaint. The penalty was a fine double the amount of the license, 1/2 of which went to the informer. Mississippi provided that every freedman, free Negro, and mulatto shall on the 2nd Monday of January, 1866, and annually thereafter, have a lawful home or employment, and shall have written evidence thereof, from the mayor, or from a member of the Board of Police, which licenses may be revoked for cause at any time by the authority granting the same. Detailed regulation of labor was provided for in nearly all these states. Louisiana passed an elaborate law in 1865 to regulate labor contracts for agricultural pursuits. Later, it was denied that this legislation was actually enacted, but the law was published at the time, and the Constitutional Convention of 1868 certainly regarded this statute as law, for they formally repealed it. The law required all agricultural laborers to make labor contracts for the next year within the first 10 days of January, the contracts to be in writing, to be with heads of families, to embrace the labor of all the members, and to be binding on all minors thereof. Each laborer, after choosing his employer, shall not be allowed to leave his place of employment until the fulfillment of his contract, unless by consent of his employer, or on account of harsh treatment, or breach of contract on the part of the employer. And if they do so leave, without cause or permission, they shall forfeit all wages earned to the time of abandonment. In case of sickness of the laborer, wages for the time lost shall be deducted, and where the sickness is feigned for purposes of idleness, and also should refusal to work be continued beyond 3 days, the offender shall be reported to a justice of the peace, and shall be forced to labor on roads, levees, and other public works, without pay, until the offender consents to return to his labor. When in health, the laborer shall work 10 hours during the day in summer, and 9 hours during the day in winter, unless otherwise stipulated in the labor contract. He shall obey all proper orders of his employer or his agent, take proper care of his work mules, horses, oxen, stock, also of all agricultural implements, and employers shall have the right to make a reasonable deduction from the laborer's wages for injuries done to animals or agricultural implements committed to his care, or for bad or negligent work. Bad work shall not be allowed. Failing to obey reasonable orders, neglect of duty and leaving home without permission, will be deemed disobedience. For any disobedience a fine of $1 shall be imposed on the offender. For all lost time from work hours, unless in case of sickness, the laborer shall be fined 25 cents per hour. For all absence from home without leave, the laborer will be fined at the rate of $2 per day. Laborers will not be required to labor on the Sabbath except to take the necessary care of stock and other property on plantations and do the necessary cooking and household duties, unless by special contract. For all thefts of the laborers from the employer of agricultural products, hogs, sheep, poultry or any other property of the employer, or willful destruction of property or injury, the laborer shall pay the employer double the amount of the value of the property stolen, destroyed or injured, one half to be paid to the employer, and the other half to be placed in the general fund provided for in this section. No live stock shall be allowed to laborers without the permission of the employer. Laborers shall not receive visitors during work hours. All difficulties arising between the employers and laborers, under this section, shall be settled, and all fines be imposed, by the former. If not satisfactory to the laborers, an appeal may be had to the nearest justice of the peace and 2 freeholders, citizens, one of said citizens to be selected by the employer and the other by the laborer. And all fines imposed and collected under this section shall be deducted from the wages due, and shall be placed in a common fund, to be divided among the other laborers employed on the plantation at the time when their full wages fall due, except as provided for above. Similar detailed regulations of work were in the South Carolina law. Elaborate provision was made for contracting colored servants to white masters. Their masters were given the right to whip moderately servants under 18. Others were to be whipped on authority of judicial officers. These officers were given authority to return runaway servants to their masters. The servants, on the other hand, were given certain rights. Their wages and period of service must be specified in writing, and they were protected against unreasonable tasks, Sunday and night work, unauthorized attacks on their persons, and inadequate food. Contracting Negroes were to be known as servants, and contractors as masters. Wages were to be fixed by the judge unless stipulated. Negroes of 10 years of age or more without a parent living in the district might make a valid contract for a year or less. Failure to make written contracts was a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of $5 to $50. Farm labor to be from sunrise to sunset, with intervals for meals. Servants to rise at dawn, to be careful of master's property and answerable for property lost or injured. Lost time was to be deducted from wages. Food and clothes might be deducted. Servants were to be quiet and orderly and to go to bed at reasonable hours. No night work or outdoor work in bad weather was to be asked, except in cases of necessity. Visitors not allowed without the master's consent. Servants leaving employment without good reason must forfeit wages. Masters might discharge servants for disobedience, drunkenness, disease, absence, etc. Enticing away the services of a servant was punishable by a fine of $20 to $100. A master could command a servant to aid him in defense of his own person, family or property. House servants at all hours of the day and night, and at all days of the week, must answer promptly all calls and execute all lawful orders. The right to sell farm products, without written evidence from employer, was forbidden in South Carolina and some other states. A person of color who is in the employment of a master, engaged in husbandry, shall not have the right to sell any corn, rice, peas, wheat, or other grain, any flour, cotton, fodder, hay, bacon, fresh meat of any kind, poultry of any kind, animals of any kind, or any other product of a farm, without having written evidence from such master, or some person authorized by him, or from the district judge or a magistrate, that he has the right to sell such product. There were elaborate laws covering the matter of contracts for work. A contract must be in writing and usually, as in South Carolina, white witnesses must attest it and a judge approve it. In Florida, contracts were to be in writing and failure to keep the contracts by disobedience or impudence was to be treated as vagrancy. In Kentucky, contracts were to be in writing and attested by a white person. In Mississippi, contracts were to be in writing attested by a white person, and if the laborer stopped work, his wages were to be forfeited for a year. He could be arrested, and the fee for his arrest must be paid by the employer and taken out of his wages. There were careful provisions to protect the contracting employer from losing his labor. In Alabama, when any laborer or servant, having contracted as provided in the first section of this act, shall afterward be found, before the termination of said contract, in the service or employment of another, that fact shall be prima facie evidence that such person is guilty of violation of this act, if he fail and refuse to forthwith discharge the said laborer or servant, after being notified and informed of such former contract and employment. Mississippi provided that every civil officer shall, and every person may, arrest and carry back to his or her legal employer any freedman, free negro, or mulatto who shall have quit the service of his or her employer before the expiration of his or her term of service without good cause, and said officer and person shall be entitled to receive for arresting and carrying back every deserting employee aforesaid the sum of $5.10 per mile from the place of arrest to the place of delivery, and the same shall be paid by the employer and held as a set-off for so much against the wages of said deserting employee. It was provided in some states, like South Carolina, that any white man, whether an officer or not, could arrest a Negro. Upon view of a misdemeanor committed by a person of color, any person present may arrest the offender and take him before a magistrate, to be dealt with as the case may require. In case of a misdemeanor committed by a white person toward a person of color, any person may complain to a magistrate, who shall cause the offender to be arrested, and, according to the nature of the case, to be brought before himself, or be taken for trial in the district court. On the other hand, in Mississippi, it was dangerous for a Negro to try to bring a white person to court on any charge. In every case where any white person has been arrested and brought to trial, by virtue of the provisions of the 10th section of the above recited act, in any court in this state, upon sufficient proof being made to the court or jury, upon the trial before said court, that any freedman, free Negro or mulatto has falsely and maliciously caused the arrest and trial of said white person or persons, the court shall render up a judgment against said freedman, free Negro or mulatto for all costs of the case, and impose a fine not to exceed $50, and imprisonment in the county jail not to exceed 20 days, and for a failure of said freedman, free Negro or mulatto to pay, or cause to be paid, all costs, fines and jail fees, the sheriff of the county is hereby authorized and required, after giving 10 days public notice, to proceed to hire out at public outcry, at the courthouse of the county, said freedman, free Negro or mulatto, for the shortest time to raise the amount necessary to discharge said freedman, free Negro or mulatto from all costs, fines, and jail fees aforesaid. Gage or acts, or assaults on any person, disturbance of the peace, exercising the functions of a minister of the gospel without a license from some regularly organized church, vending spirituous or intoxicating liquors, or committing any other misdemeanor, the punishment of which is not specifically provided for by law, shall, upon conviction thereof, in the county court, be fined not less than $10, and not more than $100, and may be imprisoned, at the discretion of the court, not exceeding 30 days. As to other civil rights, the marriage of Negroes was for the first time recognized in the southern states and slave marriages legalized. South Carolina said in general, that the statutes and regulations concerning slaves are now inapplicable to persons of color. And although such persons are not entitled to social or political equality with white persons, they shall have the right to acquire, own, and dispose of property, to make contracts, to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to sue and be sued, and to receive protection under the law in their persons and property. Florida forbade colored and white persons respectively from intruding upon each other's public assemblies, religious or other, or public vehicles set apart for their exclusive use, under punishment of pillory or stripes, or both. Very generally Negroes were prohibited or limited in their ownership of firearms. In Florida, for instance, it was unlawful for any Negro, mulatto, or person of color to own, use, or keep in possession or under control any Bowie knife, dirk, sword, firearms, or ammunition of any kind, unless by license of the county judge of probate, under a penalty of forfeiting them to the informer, and of standing in the pillory 1 hour, or be whipped not exceeding 39 stripes, or both, at the discretion of the jury. Alabama had a similar law making it illegal to sell, give or rent firearms or ammunition of any description, to any freedman, free Negro or mulatto. Mississippi refused arms to Negroes. No freedman, free Negro, or mulatto, not in the military service of the United States government, and not licensed to do so by the Board of Police of his or her county, shall keep or carry firearms of any kind, or any ammunition, dirk, or Bowie knife, and on conviction thereof, in the county court, shall be punished by fine, not exceeding $10, and pay the costs of such proceedings, and all such arms or ammunition shall be forfeited to the informer. Scion in writing from the district judge or magistrate, be allowed to keep a firearm, sword, or other military weapon, except that one of them, who is the owner of a farm, may keep a shotgun or rifle, such as is ordinarily used in hunting, but not a pistol, musket, or other firearm or weapon appropriate for purposes of war, and in case of conviction, shall be punished by a fine equal to twice the value of the weapon so unlawfully kept, and if that be not immediately paid, by corporal punishment. The right of buying and selling property was usually granted but sometimes limited as to land. Mississippi declared that all freedmen, free Negroes and mulattoes may sue and be sued, implead and be impleaded in all the courts of law and equity of this state, and may acquire personal property and choses in action by descent or purchase, and may dispose of the same in the same manner and to the same extent that white persons may. Provided, that the provisions of this section shall not be so construed as to allow any freedman, free negro or mulatto to rent or lease any lands or tenements, except in incorporated towns or cities, in which places the corporate authorities shall control the same. The most important and oppressive laws were those with regard to vagrancy and apprenticeship. Sometimes they especially applied to Negroes. In other cases, they were drawn in general terms but evidently designed to fit the Negro's condition and to be enforced particularly with regard to Negroes. Cidered vagrants and liable to the penalties imposed by it. Among those declared to be vagrants are all persons who, not having the wherewith to support their families, live idly and without employment, and refuse to work for the usual and common wages given to other laborers in the like work in the place where they are. In Florida, January 12, 1866, it is provided that when any person of color shall enter into a contract as aforesaid, to serve as a laborer for a year, or any other specified term, on any farm or plantation in this state, if he shall refuse or neglect to perform the stipulations of his contract by willful disobedience of orders, wanton impudence or disrespect to his employer, or his authorized agent, failure or refusal to perform the work assigned to him, idleness, or abandonment of the premises or the employment of the party with whom the contract was made, he or she shall be liable, upon the complaint of his employer or his agent, made under oath before any justice of the peace of the county, to be arrested and tried before the criminal court of the county, and upon conviction shall be subject to all the pains and penalties prescribed for the punishment of vagrancy. In Georgia, it was ruled that all persons wandering or strolling about in idleness, who are able to work, and who have no property to support them, all persons leading an idle, immoral, or profligate life, who have no property to support them and are able to work and do not work, all persons able to work having no visible and known means of a fair, honest, and respectable livelihood, all persons having a fixed abode, who have no visible property to support them, and who live by stealing or by trading in, bartering for, or buying stolen property, and all professional gamblers living in idleness, shall be deemed and considered vagrants, and shall be indicted as such, and it shall be lawful for any person to arrest said vagrants and have them bound over for trial to the next term of the county court, and upon conviction, they shall be fined and imprisoned or sentenced to work on the public works, for not longer than a year, or shall, in the discretion of the court, be bound over for trial to the next term of the county court, and upon conviction, they shall be fined and imprisoned or sentenced to work on the public works, for not longer than a year, or shall, in the discretion of the court, be bound out to some person for a time not longer than 1 year, upon such valuable consideration as the court may prescribe. Mississippi provided that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes in this state over the age of 18 years, found on the second Monday in January, 1866, or thereafter, with no lawful employment or business, or found unlawfully assembling themselves together, either in the day or night time, and all white persons so assembling with freedmen, free Negroes or mulattoes, or usually associating with freedmen, free Negroes or mulattoes on terms of equality, or living in adultery or fornication with a freedwoman, free Negro or mulatto, shall be deemed vagrants, and on conviction thereof shall be fined in the sum of not exceeding, in the case of a freedman, free Negro or mulatto, $50, and a white man $200 and imprisoned, at the discretion of the court, the free Negro not exceeding 10 days, and the white man not exceeding 6 months. Sec. 5 provides that all fines and forfeitures collected under the provisions of this act shall be paid into the county treasury for general county purposes, and in case any freedman, free Negro or mulatto, shall fail for 5 days after the imposition of any fine or forfeiture upon him or her, for violation of any of the provisions of this act to pay the same, that it shall be, and is hereby made, the duty of the sheriff of the proper county to hire out said freedman, free Negro or mulatto, to any person who will, for the shortest period of service, pay said fine or forfeiture and all costs, provided a preference shall be given to the employer, if there be one, in which case the employer shall be entitled to deduct and retain the amount so paid from the wages of such freedman, free Negro or mulatto, then due or to become due, and in case such freedman, free Negro or mulatto cannot be hired out, he or she may be dealt with as a pauper. South Carolina declared to be vagrants all persons without fixed and known places of abode and lawful employment, all prostitutes and all persons wandering from place to place and selling without a license, all gamblers, idle and disobedient persons, persons without sufficient means of support, persons giving plays or entertainments without license, fortune-tellers, beggars, drunkards and hunters. If a person of color is unable to earn his support, his near relatives must contribute. Pauper funds were composed of fines paid by Negroes and taxes on Negroes. On the other hand, former slaves who were helpless and had been on plantations 6 months previous to November 10, 1865, could not be evicted before January 1, 1867. In Alabama, the former owner was to have preference in the apprenticing of a child. This was true in Kentucky and Mississippi. Mississippi provides that it shall be the duty of all sheriffs, justices of the peace, and other civil officers of the several counties in this state to report to the probate courts of their respective counties semi-annually, at the January and July terms of said courts, all freedmen, free Negroes and mulattoes, under the age of 18, within their respective counties, beats, or districts, who are orphans, or whose parent or parents have not the means, or who refuse to provide for and support said minors, and thereupon it shall be the duty of said probate court to order the clerk of said court to apprentice said minors to some competent and suitable person, on such terms as the court may direct, having a particular care to the interest of said minors. Provided, that the former owner of said minors shall have the preference when, in the opinion of the court, he or she shall be a suitable person for that purpose. South Carolina established special courts for colored people, to be created in each district to administer the law in respect to persons of color. The petite juries of these courts were to consist of only 6 men. The local magistrate shall be specially charged with the supervision of persons of color in his neighborhood, their protection, and the prevention of their misconduct. Public order was to be secured by the organization of 45 or more militia regiments. Capital punishment was provided for colored persons guilty of willful homicide, assault upon a white woman, impersonating her husband for carnal purposes, raising an insurrection, stealing a horse, a mule, or baled cotton, and housebreaking. For crimes not demanding death, Negroes might be confined at hard labor, whipped, or transported, but punishments more degrading than imprisonment shall not be imposed upon a white person for a crime not infamous. 3t. In most states, Negroes were allowed to testify in courts, but the testimony was usually confined to cases where colored persons were involved, although in some states, by consent of the parties, they could testify in cases where only white people were involved. In Alabama, all freedmen, free Negroes and mulattoes, shall have the right to sue and be sued, plead and be impleaded in all the different and various courts of this state, to the same extent that white persons now have by law. And they shall be competent to testify only in open court, and only in cases in which freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes are parties, either plaintiff or defendant, and in civil or criminal cases, for injuries in the persons and property of freedmen, free Negroes and mulattoes, and in all cases, civil or criminal, in which a freedman, free Negro, or mulatto, is a witness against a white person, or a white person against a freedman, free Negro or mulatto, the parties shall be competent witnesses. North Carolina, March 10, 1866, gives them all the privileges of white persons before the courts in the mode of prosecuting, defending, continuing, removing, and transferring their suits at law and equity, and makes them eligible as witnesses, when not otherwise incompetent, in all controversies at law and in equity where the rights of persons or property of persons of color shall be put in issue, and would be concluded by the judgment or decree of courts, and also in pleas of the state, where the violence, fraud, or injury alleged shall be charged to have been done by or to persons of color. In all other civil and criminal cases, such evidence shall be deemed inadmissible, unless by consent of the parties of record. Mississippi simply reenacted her slave code and made it operative so far as punishments were concerned. That all the penal and criminal laws now in force in this state, defining offenses, and prescribing the mode of punishment for crimes and misdemeanors committed by slaves, free Negroes or mulattoes, be and the same are hereby reenacted, and declared to be in full force and effect, against freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes, except so far as the mode and manner of trial and punishment have been changed or altered by law. North Carolina, on the other hand, abolished her slave code, making difference of punishment only in the case of Negroes convicted of rape. Georgia placed the fines and costs of a servant upon the master. Where such cases shall go against the servant, the judgment for costs upon written notice to the master shall operate as a garnishment against him, and he shall retain a sufficient amount for the payment thereof, out of any wages due to said servant, or to become due during the period of service, and may be cited at any time by the collecting officer to make answer thereto. The celebrated Ordinance of Opelousas, Louisiana, shows the local ordinances regulating Negroes. No Negro or freedman shall be allowed to come within the limits of the town of Opelousas without special permission from his employer, specifying the object of his visit and the time necessary for the accomplishment of the same. Every Negro freedman who shall be found on the streets of Opelousas after 10 o'clock at night without a written pass or permit from his employer, shall be imprisoned and compelled to work 5 days on the public streets, or pay a fine of $5. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within the limits of the town under any circumstances, and anyone thus offending shall be ejected, and compelled to find an employer or leave the town within 24 hours. No Negro or freedman shall reside within the limits of the town of Opelousas who is not in the regular service of some white person or former owner, who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said freedman. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people without a special permission from the mayor or president of the Board of Police, under the penalty of a fine of $10 or 20 days' work on the public streets. No freedman who is not in the military service shall be allowed to carry firearms, or any kind of weapons within the limits of the town of Opelousas without the special permission of his employer, in writing, and approved by the mayor or president of the board. Any freedman not residing in Opelousas, who shall be found within its corporate limits after the hour of 3 o'clock, on Sunday, without a special permission from his employer or the mayor, shall be arrested and imprisoned and made to work 2 days on the public streets, or pay $2 in lieu of said work. 38. Of Louisiana, Thomas Conway testified February 22, 1866. Some of the leading officers of the state down there, men who do much to form and control the opinions of the masses, instead of doing as they promised, and quietly submitting to the authority of the government, engaged in issuing slave codes and in promulgating them to their subordinates, ordering them to carry them into execution, and this to the knowledge of state officials of a higher character, governor and others. And the men who issued them were not punished except as the military authorities punished them. The governor inflicted no punishment on them while I was there, and I don't know that, up to this day, he has ever punished one of them. These codes were simply the old black code of the state, with the word slave, expunge, and Negro substituted. The most odious features of slavery were preserved in them. They were issued in 3 or 4 localities in the state, not 100 miles from New Orleans, months after the surrender of the Confederate forces, and years after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. I have had delegations to frequently come and see me, delegations composed of men who, to my face, denied that the proclamation issued by President Lincoln was a valid instrument, declaring that the Supreme Court would pronounce it invalid. Consequently, they have claimed that their Negroes were slaves and would again be restored to them. In the city of New Orleans last summer, under the orders of the acting mayor of the city, Hugh Kennedy, the police of that city conducted themselves towards the freedmen, in respect to violence and ill usage, in every way equal to the old days of slavery. Arresting them on the streets as vagrants, without any form of law whatever, and simply because they did not have in their pockets certificates of employment from their former owners or other white citizens. I have gone to the jails and released large numbers of them, men who were industrious and who had regular employment. Yet because they had not the certificates of white men in their pockets, they were locked up in jail to be sent out to plantations. Locked up, too, without my knowledge, and done speedily and secretly before I had information of it. Some members of the 74th United States Colored Infantry, a regiment which was mustered out but one Clay, were arrested the next because they did not have these certificates of employment. This was done to these men after having served in the United States Army 3 years. They were arrested by the police under the order of the acting mayor, Mr. Hugh Kennedy. 39. The aim and object of these laws cannot be mistaken. In many cases the restraints imposed went to the length of a veritable, involuntary servitude. 40. Professor Burgess says, almost every act, word or gesture of the Negro, not consonant with good taste and good manners as well as good morals, was made a crime or misdemeanor, for which he could first be fined by the magistrates and then consigned to a condition of almost slavery for an indefinite time, if he could not pay the bill. 41. Dunning admits that the legislation of the reorganized governments, under cover of police regulations and vagrancy laws, had enacted severe discriminations against the freedmen in all the common civil rights. 42. A recent study says of South Carolina, the interests of both races would have been better served had there never been a black code. This would be true even if there had been no northern sentiment to take into account. Economically, the laws were impracticable, since they tried to place the Negro in a position inferior to that which competition or his labor would have given him. 43. But it is monotonous iteration to review the early legislation of the reconstructed governments established under the proclamation of the President. In most of the states the laws established a condition but little better than that of slavery, and in one important respect far worse. For in place of the property interest, which would induce the owner to preserve and care for his slave, there was substituted the guardianship of penal statutes. And the ignorant black man, innocent of any intention to commit a wrong, could be bandied about from one temporary owner to another who would have no other interest than to wring out of him, without regard to his ultimate condition, all that was possible during the limited term of his thraldom. 44. These slave laws have been defended in various ways. They were passed in the midst of bitterness and fear and with great haste. They were worded somewhat like similar vagrancy laws in northern states. They would have been modified in time. They said more than they really meant. All of this may be partly true, but it remains perfectly evident that the black codes looked backward toward slavery. This legislation profoundly stirred the North. Not the North of industry and the new manufactures, but the ordinary everyday people of the North, who, uplifted by the tremendous afflatus of war, had seen a vision of something fine and just, and who, without any personal affection for the Negro or real knowledge of him, nevertheless were convinced that Negroes were human, and that Negro slavery was wrong, and that whatever freedom might mean, it certainly did not mean reenslavement under another name. Here, then, was the dominant thought of that South with which Reconstruction must deal. Rising with aching head and palsied hands, it deliberately looked backward. There came to the presidential chair, with vast power, a man who was Southern-born. With him came inconceivable fears that the North proposed to make these Negroes really free, to give them a sufficient status even for voting, to give them the right to hold office, that there was even a possibility that these slaves might outvote their former masters, that they might accumulate wealth, achieve education, and finally, they might even aspire to marry white women and mingle their blood with the blood of their masters. It was fantastic. It called for revolt. It called an extremity for the renewal of war. The Negro must be kept in his place by hunger, whipping and murder. As W.P. Calhoun of Greenville, South Carolina, said as late as 1901. Character, wealth, learning, good behavior, and all that makes up or constitutes good citizenship in the black man is positively of no avail whatever. Merit cannot win in this case. 45. The cry of the bewildered freeman rose, but it was drowned by the rebel yell. I am a Southerner. I love the South. I dared for her to fight from Lookout to the sea, with her proud banner over me. But from my lips thanksgiving broke, as God in battle thunder spoke, and that black idol, breeding drouth, and dearth of human sympathy, throughout the sweet and sensuous South, was, with its chains and human yoke, blown hellward from the cannon's mouth, while freedom cheered behind the smoke. Maurice Thompson. 3. The Reminiscences of Carl Schurz, 3, pp. 157-158. 7. Looking forward. How two theories of the future of America clashed and blended just after the Civil War. The one was abolition democracy based on freedom, intelligence and power for all men. The other was industry for private profit directed by an autocracy determined at any price to amass wealth and power. The uncomprehending resistance of the South, and the pressure of black folk, made these two thoughts uneasy and temporary allies. A printer and a carpenter, a rail splitter and a tailor, Garrison, Christ, Lincoln and Johnson, were the tools of the greatest moral awakening America ever knew, chosen to challenge capital invested in the bodies of men and annul the private profit of slavery. This done, two quite distinct but persistently indifferentiated visions of the future dominated the triumphant North after the war. One was the prolongation of Puritan idealism, transformed by the frontier into a theory of universal democracy, and now expressed by abolitionists like Wendell Phillips, students of civilization like Charles Sumner, and leaders of the common people like Thaddeus Stevens, together with some of the leaders of the new labor movement. The other trend was entirely different and is confused with the democratic ideal because the two ideals lay confused in so many individual minds. This was the development of industry in America and of a new industrial philosophy. The new industry had a vision not of work but of wealth, not of planned accomplishment but of power. It became the most conscienceless, unmoral system of industry which the world has experienced. It went with ruthless indifference towards waste, death, ugliness and disaster, and yet reared the most stupendous machine for the efficient organization of work which the world has ever seen. Thus the end of the Civil War was the beginning of vast economic development in the industrial expansion of the East, in the agricultural growth of the Middle West, in the new cattle industry of the Plains, in the mining enterprises of the Rockies, in the development of the Pacific Coast, and in the reconstruction of the Southern market. Behind this extraordinary industrial development, as justification in the minds of men, lay what we may call the Great American Assumption, which up to the time of the Civil War, was held more or less 182 explicitly by practically all Americans. The American assumption was that wealth is mainly the result of its owner's effort and that any average worker can by thrift become a capitalist. The curious thing about this assumption was that while it was not true, it was undoubtedly more nearly true in America from 1820 to 1860 than in any other contemporary land. It was not true and not recognized as true during colonial times, but with the opening of the West and the expanding industry of the 20s, and coincident with the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, it was a fact that often a poor white man in America by thrift and saving could obtain land and capital, and by intelligence and good luck he could become a small capitalist and even a rich man. And conversely a careless spendthrift though rich might become a pauper, since hereditary safeguards for property had little legal sanction. Thus arose the philosophy of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, on which the American theory of compensated democracy was built. It asked simply, in 18th century accents, freedom from government interference with individual ventures, and a voice in the selection of government officials. The continued freedom of economic opportunity and ever possible increase of industrial income, it took for granted. This attitude was back of the adoption of universal suffrage, the disappearance of compulsory military service and imprisonment for debt, which characterized Jacksonian democracy. The American assumption was contemporary with the Cotton Kingdom, which was its most sinister contradiction. The new captains of industry in the North were largely risen from the laboring class and thus living proof of the ease of capitalistic accumulation. The validity of the American assumption ceased with the Civil War, but its tradition lasted down to the day of the Great Depression, when it died with a great wail of despair, not so much from breadlines and soup kitchens, as from poor and thrifty bank depositors and small investors. The American labor movement, founded in the spirit that regarded America as a refuge from oppression and free for individual development according to conscience and ability, grew and expanded in America, basing itself frankly upon the American assumption. Its object was rule by the people, the wide education of people so that they could rule intelligently, and economic opportunity of wealth free for thrift. It found itself hindered by slavery in the South, directly, because of the growing belief of the influential planter class in oligarchy and the degradation of labor, and indirectly by the competition of slave labor and the spread of the slave psychology. It became, Therefore, at first more and more opposed to slavery as ethically wrong, politically dangerous, and economically unprofitable. Capital, on the other hand, accepted widespread suffrage as a fact forced on the world by revolution and the growing intelligence of the working class. But since the new industry called for intelligence in its workers, capitalists not only accepted universal suffrage but early discovered that high wages in America made even higher profits possible, and that this high standard of living was itself a protection for capital in that it made the more intelligent and best paid of workers allies of capital and left its ultimate dictatorship undisturbed. Nevertheless, industry took pains to protect itself wherever possible. It excluded illiterate foreign voters from the ballot and advocated a reservoir of non-voting common labor. And it stood ready at any time by direct bribery or the use of its power to hire and discharge labor, to manipulate the labor vote. The true significance of slavery in the United States to the whole social development of America lay in the ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. What were to be the limits of democratic control in the United States? If all labor, black as well as white, became free, were given schools and the right to vote, what control could or should be set to the power and action of these laborers? Was the rule of the mass of Americans to be unlimited, and the right to rule extended to all men, regardless of race and color, or if not, what power of dictatorship would rule, and how would property and privilege be protected? This was the great and primary question which was in the minds of the men who wrote the Constitution of the United States and continued in the minds of thinkers down through the slavery controversy. It still remains with the world as the problem of democracy expands and touches all races and nations. The abolition democracy was the liberal movement among both laborers and small capitalists, who united in the American assumption, but saw the danger of slavery to both capital and labor. It began its moral fight against slavery in the 30s and 40s and, gradually transformed by economic elements, concluded it during the war. The object and only real object of the Civil War in its eyes was the abolition of slavery, and it was convinced that this could be thoroughly accomplished only if the emancipated Negroes became free citizens and voters. The abolition democracy saw clearly the difficulties of this step, due to the ignorance and poverty of the freedmen. For the first time in the classic democracy in the United States, it was made aware that the American assumption was not and could not be universally true. Some of the leaders of the labor movement even came to see that it was not true in the case of the mass of white labor, but that thought came to the abolitionists afterwards, and in the minds pound only a few clear-sighted men like Wendell Phillips. At the time of the Civil War, it was, however, perfectly clear to Sumner and Stevens that freedom in order to be free required a minimum of capital in addition to political rights, and that THL could be insured against the natural resentment of the planters only by some sort of dictatorship. Thus abolition democracy was pushed towards the conception of a dictatorship of labor, although few of its advocates wholly grasped the fact that this necessarily involved dictatorship by labor over capital and industry. On the other hand, industrialists after the war expected the South to seize upon the opportunity to make increased profit by a more intelligent exploitation of labor than was possible under the slave system. They looked upon free Negro labor as a source of profit, and considered freedom, that is, a legal doing away with individual physical control, all that the Negroes or their friends could ask. They did not want for Negro labor any special protection or political power or capital, any more than they wanted this for Irish, German or Scandinavian labor in the North. They expected some popular education and a gradual granting of the right to vote, which would be straightly curtailed in its power for mischief by the far larger power of capital. The South, however, persisted in its pre-war conception of these two tendencies in the North. It sought to re-establish slavery by force, because it had no comprehension of the means by which modern industry could secure the advantages of slave labor without its responsibilities. The South, therefore, opposed Negro education, opposed land and capital for Negroes, and violently and bitterly opposed any political power. It fought every conception inch by inch. No real emancipation, limited civil rights, no Negro schools, no votes for Negroes. In the face of such intransigence, Northern industry was, on the whole, willing to yield, since none of these concessions really obstructed the expansion of industry and capital in the nation. When, however, the South went beyond reason and truculently demanded not simply its old political power but increased political power based on disfranchised Negroes, which it openly threatened to use for the revision of the tariff, for the repudiation of the national debt, for disestablishing the national banks, and for putting the new corporate form of industry under strict state regulation and rule, Northern industry was frightened and began to move towards the stand which abolition democracy had already taken, namely, temporary dictatorship, endowed Negro education, legal civil rights, and eventually even votes for Negroes to offset the Southern threat of economic attack. The abolition democracy was not deceived. It at once feared and dared. It wanted no revenge on the South and held no hatred. It did want to train Negroes in intelligence, experience and labor, the ownership of land and capital, and the exercise of civil rights and the use of political power. In the advocacy of these things it reached the highest level of self-sacrificing statesmanship ever attained in America, and two of the greatest leaders of the ideal, Stevens and Sumner, voluntarily laid down their lives on the altar of democracy and were eventually paid, as they must have anticipated they would be paid, by the widespread contempt of America. Even to this day, the grandsons of abolitionists, ashamed of their father's faith in black men, are salving their conscience with a theory that democratic government by intelligent men of character is impossible, when, in fact, nothing else is possible, and the grandsons of the planters and of the poor whites who displaced them are excusing their apostasy to civilization by charging the Negro with all the evil caused by war, destruction and greed, and by the deeds of white men, Northern and Southern. The abolition democracy advocated federal control to guide and direct the rise of the Negro, but they desired this control to be civil rather than military, like the strict government of territories until new states should develop. They had to help them in the furtherance of this plan a degree of enthusiasm, humility and hard work on the part of the depressed Negro which is not paralleled in modern history. When now they were offered alliance with Northern industry, temporary military control instead of civil government, and then immediate citizenship and the right to vote for Negroes, instead of a period of guardianship, they accepted because they could not refuse, because they knew that this was their only chance and that nothing else would be offered. Their theory of democracy led them to risk all, even in the absence of that economic and educational minimum which they knew was next to indispensable. When Sumner saw his failure here, he went home and wept. But the belief in the self-resurrection of democracy was strong in these men and lent unconscious power to the American assumption. They expected that both Northern industry and the South, in sheer self-defense, would have to educate Negro intelligence and depend on Negro political power. The South was too astonished for belief when it saw industry and democracy in the North united for a policy of coercion. In the past, the South had always been able by mere gesture of concession to bring Northern industry to its knees begging. It did not realize how strong industry had grown and how conscious its power, and how boundless its plans. It did not realize that the basis of the South's own power had literally been swept away. Even the West, on which the South had long counted in theory, although sympathy had seldom led to effective action, while it fought industrial monopoly, the national debt and the money power, yet when it had to choose between a continuation of Southern oligarchy and a great democratic movement, swung inevitably towards democracy. Northern capital went south and vied with the planters for the direction of the Negro vote. The poor whites scurried to cover, now here, now there, and a dictatorship of labor ensued, with a new democratic constitution, new social legislation, public schools and public improvements. But of that we shall speak more in detail in later chapters. On the other hand, Northern industry seemed at last free and untrammeled. It began in 1876 an exploitation which was built on much the same sort of slavery which it helped to overthrow in 1863. It murdered democracy in the United States so completely that the world does not recognize its corpse. It established as dominant in industry a monarchical system which killed the idea of democracy. The basis of the argument for Negro suffrage has usually been interpreted as a gesture of vengeance, but it was much deeper than this. It was phrased, first by Abraham Lincoln himself, as a method of retaining the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom. This was echoed, however unwillingly, by Andrew Johnson as a sop to the radicals. But it gradually came in the thought of the nation to be an inescapable thing. Votes for Negroes were in truth a final compromise between business and abolition and were forced on abolition by business as the only method of realizing the basic principles of abolition democracy. All of the selfishness, cunning and power that were back of the new industry of the North have been looked upon as simply the other side of abolition democracy. And the reason for this was that in several cases, the two ideas were mingled in individuals' minds. One can see that in the sermons of Henry Ward Beecher, who was a great advocate of votes for Negroes, but nevertheless instinctively capitalistic. Standing on the side of the exploiter, he had scant sympathy for the exploited. There was something of this, although not nearly as much, in the case of Thaddeus Stevens, who was at heart the greatest and most uncompromising of abolitionist Democrats, but who advocated not only universal suffrage and free schools, but protection for Pennsylvania iron. Yet in that protection he had just as distinctly in mind the welfare of the laborer as the profit of the employer. Teon of the abolitionists had begun with the distinct object, even on the part of the great emancipator, to save and protect slavery, and in no way to disturb it, except to keep it out of competition with the free peasant of the West, had resulted in emancipation. Men like William Lloyd Garrison, who had no sympathy with the platform of the Republicans in I-860, became suddenly the center of the stage of the new dispensation. Thus, a legal metaphysical dispute, involving the right of slave states to expand into the territories, was rapidly changed, first to a question of freedom for slaves, and then to a struggle for inaugurating a new form of national government in the United States. When the physical war ended, then the real practical problems presented themselves. How was slavery to be effectively abolished? And what was to be the status of the Negroes? What was the condition and power of the states which had rebelled? The legal solution of these questions was easy. The states that had attempted to rebel had failed. They must now resume their relations to the government. Slavery had been abolished as a war measure. This should be confirmed and extended by a constitutional amendment. Some control of the Negro population must be devised in the place of slavery, so as to introduce the Negro into his new freedom. The power of the national government had been greatly expanded by war. This expansion must be consolidated so that in the future secession would be impossible and slavery never re-established. The difficulty with this legalistic formula was that it did not cling to facts. Slavery was not abolished even after the 13th Amendment. There were 4 million freedmen and most of them on the same plantation, doing the same work that they did before emancipation, except as their work had been interrupted and changed by the upheaval of war. Moreover, they were getting about the same wages and apparently were going to be subject to slave codes modified only in name. There were among them thousands of fugitives in the camps of the soldiers or on the streets of the cities, homeless, sick and impoverished. They had been freed practically with no land nor money, and, save in exceptional cases, without legal status and without protection. Negroes deserved not only the pity of the world but the gratitude of both South and North. Under extraordinary provocation they had acted like decent human beings. They had protected their masters' families, when their masters were away fighting for black slavery. They did this naturally because they were not sure that the North was fighting for freedom, and because they did not know which side would win. But, at any rate, they did it. And even when they understood that the North, willing or unwilling, was bound towards freedom, and that they could fight for their own freedom, they were neither vindictive nor cruel towards their former masters, although they were quite naturally widely accused of laziness and impudence, which are the only weapons of offense which a rising social class can easily use. These black men wanted freedom, they wanted education, they wanted protection, they had been of great help to the Union armies and that help had been given under great stress. Black soldiers had been outlawed, and in many cases ruthlessly murdered by the enemy who refused to regard them as soldiers or as human. They took chances every time they put on a uniform. Yet after the war they were still not free. They were still practically slaves, and how was their freedom to be made a fact? It could be done in only one way. They must have the protection of law, and back of law must stand physical force. They must have land. They must have education. How was all this to be done? Lincoln tried hard in the border states, long before the end of the war, to get voluntary emancipation and pay for the slaves, so that a new system of labor under favorable circumstances could be arranged. The border states would have none of it. The war ended in anarchy as war always ends. The cost had been so great that there could be no thought of pay for the slaves, even on the part of the South, after the first flush of Reconstruction. There was no possibility of paying for capital destroyed in other ways, or of quickly restoring the neglected land and tools. Thus, by the sheer logic of facts, there arose in the United States a clear and definite program for the freedom and uplift of the Negro, and for the extension of the realization of democracy. Some of the men who had this vision were identified with the new industry, but saw no incongruity or opposition between their ideas or between the rise and expansion of tariff-protected corporations and their equally sincere beliefs in democratic methods. Others were not identified with industry at all. They were, some of them, rich men, supported by incomes derived from industry. Most of them were poor men earning a salary. Some of them were laborers. These men started from the abolitionists' point of view. Slavery was wrong because it reduced human beings to the level of animals. The abolition of slavery meant not simply abolition of legal ownership of the slave. It meant the uplift of slaves and their eventual incorporation into the body civil, politic, and social, of the United States. There was, of course, much difference as to the exact extent of this incorporation, but less and less desire to limit it in any way by law. The Negro must have civil rights as a citizen. He must eventually have political rights like every other citizen of the United States, and while social rights could not be a matter of legislation, they, on the other hand, must not be denied through legislation, but remain a matter of free individual choice. This outlook and theory of the abolitionists received tremendous impetus from the war. Those who had been classed as fanatics, who had been left out of the society of the respected, and mobbed, North, East and West, suddenly became the moral justification by which the North marched on to victory. All of the great literature of the Civil War was based mainly upon human freedom, and insofar as it stressed union, it had to make it liberty and union. The war songs, the war stories, the war afflatus, were based on the freedom of the slaves, just as in the World War we mobilized the mass of mankind in a war to end war and to promote the freedom and union of nations. Moreover, the new abolition democracy that came after the war had a tremendous and unexpected source and method of propaganda, and that lay in the crusade of the New England schoolmarm. The annals of this ninth crusade are yet to be written, the tale of a mission that seemed to our age far more quixotic than the quest of St. Louis seemed to his. Behind the mist of ruin and rapine waved the calico dresses of women who dared, and after the hoarse mouthings of the field guns rang the rhythm of the alphabet. Rich and poor they were, serious and curious. Bereaved now of a father, now of a brother, now of more than these, they came seeking a life work in planting the New England schoolhouse among the white and black of the South. They did their work well. In that first year they taught 100,000 souls, and more. 1. Here for the first time there was established between the white and black of this country a contact on terms of essential social equality and mutual respect. There had been contact between Negroes and white people in the Old South, and in some cases contact of beautiful friendship, and even warm love and affection. But this was spasmodic and exceptional and had to be partially concealed. And always it was spoiled by the sense of inferiority on the part of the Negro, and the will to rule on the part of the whites. But in 1,000 schools of the South after the war were brought together the most eager of the emancipated blacks and that part of the North which believed in democracy. And this social contact of human beings became a matter of course. The results were of all sorts. Sometimes the teachers became disgusted, sometimes the students became sullen and impudent, but, on the whole, the result was one of the most astonishing successes in new and sudden human contacts. We must also remember that the population of the 60s was divided into church congregations, and the great majority of these Methodist, Baptist, Congregational, Presbyterian and Quaker congregations in the North were represented directly or indirectly in the South, after the war, by one of their members who reported the work that she, and it was usually she, was doing with colored people. This work, to an unusual degree, was so successful and so helpful that her words carried widespread conviction. At the beginning of the war, probably not one white American in 100 believed that Negroes could become an integral part of American democracy. They were slaves and cowards, ignorant by nature and not by lack of teaching. Even if they were going to be freed, they must be got rid of or rid the land of themselves. During the war came the first real revulsion of feeling when it was found that Negroes could and would fight, were apt subjects for military discipline, and indispensable in the conduct of the war. Beyond that came the change in feeling when the rise of schools over all the South showed that the Negro would and could learn. There might be continued doubt as to the extent of the learning and the height to which the race could rise. But nobody in that day of widespread immigration from Europe could doubt that the Negro was capable of at least as much education as the ordinary northern laborer. Present America has no conception of the cogency of this argument. In 1865, the right of all free Americans to be voters was unquestioned, and had not been questioned since the time of Andrew Jackson, except in the case of women, where it interfered with sex ownership. The burden of the proof lay on the man who said there could be in the United States 4 or 5 million Americans without the right to vote. What would they be? What status would they hold? Would they not inevitably be slaves, in spite of the fact that they were called free? There were, to be sure, northern states which would not allow Negroes to vote, but many of the northern states did, and most of those that did not had comparatively few Negroes. The whole argument against Negro suffrage, even in those states, had been based on the status of the slave in the South. When the slave became free, a new problem was staged for such northern states. Two men stand in the forefront of this new attempt to expand and implement democracy: Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. Sumner had been fighting steadily not simply against slavery, but for the manhood rights of the free Negro, ever since he entered Congress. By amending the Act of March 3, 1863, he stopped discrimination on streetcars between Washington and Alexandria, and by the Act of March 3, 1865, extended this to all the railways of the district. June 25, 1864, by amending an appropriation bill, he stopped discrimination in the United States courts, a result which he called the most important of all in establishing the manhood and citizenship of the colored people. For this result, I have labored 2 years. He fought for equal pay to Negro soldiers and finally secured a favorable decision of the Attorney General. In 1863–1864, he fought unsuccessfully against white suffrage in the new territory of Montana. He tried to include colored citizens among the voters of the city of Washington, but lost again. At this moment of revolution, when our country needs the blessing of Almighty God and the strong arms of all her children, this is not the time for us solemnly to enact injustice. In duty to our country and in duty to God, I plead against any such thing. We must be against slavery in its original shape, and in all its brood of prejudice and error, too. 4 years later, Senator Doolittle said that Sumner had always been in favor of pushing Negro suffrage. He was the originator of that notion. He is the master of that new school of Reconstruction. In December 1864, Sumner sketched an anti-slavery amendment. This was adopted by the American Anti-Slavery Society and early in the session was moved by Ashley of Ohio and Wilson of Iowa in the House and Henderson of Missouri in the Senate. Sumner yielded to Trumbull, who adopted the formula of the Ordinance of 1787, which finally became the 13th Amendment in 1865. Sumner secured a special committee on slavery and freedmen in the Senate in January 1864, and became the chairman. He introduced a bill to repeal all fugitive slave laws and the committee reported it. It was opposed by both Democratic and Republican senators. It was amended so as to save the law of 1793, and the committee dropped it. 2 months later, a House bill reached the Senate, and Sumner reported it. Salisbury of Delaware wanted 1 day without the nigger. The bill was finally passed, 27–12, and Lincoln signed it June 28, 1864. Sumner indeed assumed a mighty task, and one realized it as he stood February 5, 1866, before the Senate of the United States, before all the representatives that could crowd into the hall, before an audience including the whole nation and in some degree the whole world. He spoke 4 hours on 2 successive days. Public interest was intense. The galleries of the Senate were crowded, and there were a number of colored people, including Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett. The voice of the speaker was solemn and earnest. His style and presence held the audience to every word. Point 3. Rarely, if ever, did he make a deeper impression in the Senate or awaken wider interest in the country. Thomas Wentworth Higginson found nothing in contemporary statesmanship, here or abroad, to equal the speech, and when Sumner sat down, the audience broke into applause. Charles Sumner was at the time 55 years of age, handsome, but heavy of carriage, a scholar and gentleman, no leader of men but a leader of thought, and one of the finest examples of New England culture and American courage. His speech laid down a Magna Charta of democracy in America. I begin by expressing a heartfelt aspiration that the day may soon come when the states lately in rebellion may be received again into the copartnership of political power and the full fellowship of the Union. But I see too well that it is vain to expect this day, which is so much longed for, until we have obtained that security for the future, which is found only in the equal rights of all, whether in the courtroom or at the ballot box. This is the great guarantee, without which all other guarantees will fail. This is the sole solution of our present troubles and anxieties. This is the only sufficient assurance of peace and reconciliation. Our fathers solemnly announced the equal rights of all men, and that government had no just foundation except in the consent of the governed, and to the support of the Declaration, heralding these self-evident truths, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And now the moment has come when these vows must be fulfilled to the letter. In securing the equal rights of the freedman, and his participation in the government, which he is taxed to support, we shall perform those early promises of the fathers, and at the same time the supplementary promises only recently made to the freedmen as the condition of alliance and aid against the rebellion. A failure to perform these promises is moral and political bankruptcy. Twice already, since rebel slavery rose, necessity has spoken to us, insisting, first, that the slaves should be declared free, and secondly, that muskets should be put into their hands for the common defense. Yielding to necessity, these two things were done. Reason, humanity, justice were powerless in this behalf, but necessity was irresistible, and the result testifies how wisely the Republic acted. Without emancipation, followed by the arming of the slaves, rebel slavery would not have been overcome. With these the victory was easy. At last the same necessity which insisted first upon emancipation and then upon the arming of the slaves, insists with the same unanswerable force upon the admission of the freedmen to complete equality before the law, so that there shall be no ban of color in courtroom or at the ballot box, and government shall be fixed on its only rightful foundation, the consent of the governed. Reason, humanity, and justice, all of which are clear for this admission of the freedmen, may fail to move you, but you must yield to necessity, which now requires that these promises shall be performed. The freedmen must be protected. To this you are specially pledged by the proclamation of President Lincoln, which, after declaring him free, promises to maintain this freedom, not for any limited period, but for all time. But this cannot be done so long as you deny him the shield of impartial laws. Let him be heard in court and let him vote. Let these rights be guarded sacredly. Beyond even the shield of impartial laws, he will then have that protection which comes from the consciousness of manhood. Clad in the full panoply of citizenship, he will feel at last that he is a man. At present he is only a recent chattel, awaiting your justice to be transmuted into manhood. If you would have him respected in his rights, you must begin by respecting him in your laws. If you would maintain him in his freedom, you must begin by maintaining him in the equal rights of citizenship. Foremost is the equality of all men. Of course, in a declaration of rights, no such supreme folly was intended as that all men are created equal in form or capacity, bodily or mental, but simply that they are created equal in rights. This is the first of the self-evident truths that are announced, leading and governing all the rest. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are among inalienable rights, but they are all held in subordination to that primal truth. Here is the starting point of the whole, and the end is like the starting point. In announcing that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, the Declaration repeats again the same proclamation of equal rights. Thus is equality the alpha and the omega, in which all other rights are embraced. Men may not have a natural right to certain things, but most clearly they have a natural right to impartial laws, by which they shall be secured in equal rights. Equality in rights is the first of rights. Taking the sum total of the population in the 11 states, we find 5,447,222 whites to 3,666,110 colored persons. And you are now to decide, whether in the discharge of your duties under the Constitution, and bound to guarantee a republican form of government, you will disfranchise this mighty mass, shutting them out from those equal rights promised by our fathers, and from all voice in the government of their country. They surpass in numbers by at least 1,000,000 the whole population of the colonies at the time our fathers raised the cry, taxation without representation is tyranny, and now you are to decide whether you will strip them of representation while you subject them to a grinding taxation by tariff and excise, acting directly and indirectly, which dwarfs into insignificance everything attempted by the British Parliament. Let me be understood. What I especially ask is impartial suffrage, which is, of course, embraced in universal suffrage. What is universal is necessarily impartial. For the present, I simply insist that all shall be equal before the law, so that, in the enjoyment of this right, there shall be no restriction which is not equally applicable to all. Any further question, in the nature of qualification, belongs to another stage of debate. And yet I have no hesitation in saying that universal suffrage is a universal right, subject only to such regulations as the safety of society may require. These may concern 1. Age, 2. Character, 3. Registration, 4. Residence. Nobody doubts that minors may be excluded, and so, also, persons of infamous life. Registration and residence are both prudential requirements for the safeguard of the ballot box against the nomads and bohemians of politics, and to compel the exercise of this franchise where a person is known among his neighbors and friends. Education also may, under certain circumstances, be a requirement of prudence, especially valuable in a republic where so much depends on the intelligence of the people. These temporary restrictions do not in any way interfere with the rights of suffrage, for they leave it absolutely accessible to all. The ballot is a schoolmaster. Reading and writing are of inestimable value, but the ballot teaches what these cannot teach. It teaches manhood. Especially is it important to a race whose manhood has been denied. The work of redemption cannot be complete if the ballot is left in doubt. The freedman already knows his friends by the unerring instinct of the heart. Give him the ballot, and he will be educated into the principles of the government. Deny him the ballot, and he will continue an alien in knowledge as in rights. His claim is exceptional, as your injustice is exceptional. For generations you have shut him out from all education, making it a crime to teach him to read for himself the book of life. Let not the tyranny of the past be an apology for any further exclusion. Having pleaded for the freedman, I now plead for the republic. For to each alike the ballot is a necessity. It is idle to expect any true peace while the freedman is robbed of this transcendent light and left a prey to that vengeance which is ready to wreak upon him the disappointment of defeat. The country, sympathetic with him, will be in a position of perpetual unrest. With him it will suffer, and with him alone can it cease to suffer. Only through him can you redress the balance of our political system and assure the safety of patriot citizens. Only through him can you save the national debt from the inevitable repudiation which awaits it when recent rebels in conjunction with Northern allies once more bear sway. His is our best guarantee. Use him. He was once your fellow soldier, he has always been your fellow man. I speak today hoping to do something for my country, and especially for that unhappy portion which has been arrayed in arms against us. The people there are my fellow citizens, and gladly would I hail them, if they would permit it, as no longer a section, no longer the South, but an integral part of the Republic, under a constitution which knows no North and no South and cannot tolerate any sectional pretensions. Gladly do I offer my best efforts in all sincerity for their welfare. But I see clearly that there is nothing in the compass of mortal power so important to them in every respect, morally, politically, and economically, that there is nothing with such certain promise to them of beneficent results. There is nothing so sure to make their land smile with industry and fertility as the decree of equal rights which I now invoke. Let the decree go forth to cover them with blessings, sure to descend upon their children in successive generations. They have given us war, we give them peace. They have raged against us in the name of slavery, we send them back the benediction of justice for all. They menace hate, we offer in return all the sacred charities of country together with oblivion of the past. This is our measure for measure. This is our retaliation. This is our only revenge. In the fearful tragedy now drawing to a close there is a destiny, stern and irresistible as that of the Greek drama, which seems to master all that is done, hurrying on the death of slavery and its whole brood of sin. There is also a Christian providence which watches this battle for right, caring especially for the poor and downtrodden who have no helper. The freedman still writhing under cruel oppression now lifts his voice to God the Avenger. It is for us to save ourselves from righteous judgment. Never with impunity can you outrage human nature. Our country which is guilty still, is paying still the grievous penalty. Therefore by every motive of self-preservation we are summoned to be just, and thus is the cause associated indissolubly with the national life. Strike at the black code, as you have already struck at the slave code. There is nothing to choose between them. Strike at once. Strike hard. You have already proclaimed emancipation. Proclaim enfranchisement also. And do not stultify yourselves by setting at naught the practical principle of the fathers, that all just government stands only on the consent of the governed, and its inseparable corollary, that taxation without representation is tyranny. What was once true is true forever, although we may for a time lose sight of it, and this is the case with those imperishable truths to which you have been, alas, so indifferent. Thus far the work is only half done. According to the best testimony now, the population of the earth, embracing Caucasians, Mongolians, Malays, Africans, and Americans, is about 1,300 millions, of whom only 375 millions are white men, or little less than 1/4, so that, in claiming exclusive rights for white men, you degrade nearly 3/4 of the human family, made in the image of God, and declared to be of one blood, while you sanction a caste offensive to religion, an oligarchy inconsistent with republican government, and a monopoly which has the whole world as its footstool. Against this assumption I protest with mind, soul, and heart. It is false in religion, false in statesmanship, and false in economy. It is an extravagance, which, if enforced, is foolish tyranny. Show me a creature with erect countenance looking to heaven, made in the image of God, and I show you a man who, of whatever country or race, whether darkened by equatorial sun or blanched by northern cold, is with you a child of the Heavenly Father, and equal with you entitled to all the rights of human nature. The second seer of democracy was Thaddeus Stevens. He was a man different entirely in method, education and thought from Charles Sumner. We know Stevens best when he was old and sick, and when with grim and awful courage he made the American Congress take the last step which it has ever taken towards democracy. Yet in one respect Stevens in his thought was even more realistic than Charles Sumner, although Sumner later followed him. From the first, Stevens knew that beneath all theoretical freedom and political right must lie the economic foundation. He said at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, September 7, 1865. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, and it never can be done if this opportunity is lost. How can Republican institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse, exist in a mingled community of nabobs and serfs? Of the owners of 20,000-acre manors with lordly palaces and the occupants of narrow huts inhabited by low white trash? If the South is ever to be made a safe republic, let her lands be cultivated by the toil of the owners or the free labor of intelligent citizens. This must be done even though it drives her nobility into exile. If they go, all the better. It will be hard to persuade the owner of 10,000 acres of land, who drives a coach and four, that he is not degraded by sitting at the same table or in the same pew with the embrowned and hard-handed farmer who has himself cultivated his own thriving homestead of 150 acres. The country would be well rid of the proud, bloated and defiant rebels. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure have been spent in vain. 4. He figured that there were in the rebel states 465 million acres of land. Of this 394 million acres were owned by 70,000 persons, each of whom possessed more than 200 acres. He argued that these 394 million acres ought to be confiscated by the government. To each adult freedman should be given 40 acres, which approximately would dispose of about 40 million acres. The remaining 354 million acres, he would divide into suitable farms and sell to the highest bidder. Including city property, it should bring an average price of $10 an acre, making a total of $3,540,000,000 in 6% bonds, the income of which should go towards the payment of pensions to the deserving veterans and the widows and orphans of soldiers and sailors who had been killed in the war. $200 million should be appropriated to reimburse loyal men in both North and South whose property had been destroyed or damaged during the war. With the remaining $3,040 million he would pay the national debt. Stevens argued that since all this property which has to be confiscated was owned by 70,000 persons, the vast majority of the people in the South would not be affected by this policy. These 70,000 were the arch traitors, and since they had caused an unjust war they should be made to suffer the consequences. 5. Sumner, thinking along these lines, had hesitated. He said in June, 1862, when confiscation first was broached, "I confess frankly that I look with more hope and confidence to liberation than to confiscation. To give freedom is nobler than to take property. There is in confiscation, unless when directed against the criminal authors of the rebellion, a harshness inconsistent with that mercy which it is always a sacred duty to cultivate. But liberation is not harsh, and it is certain, if properly conducted, to carry with it the smiles of a benignant providence." 6. Later, however, he began to see the economic demands of emancipation, and he wrote to John Bright, March 13, 1865. Can emancipation be carried out without using the lands of the slave masters? We must see that the freedmen are established on the soil, and that they may become proprietors. From the beginning I have regarded confiscation only as ancillary to emancipation. The great plantations, which have been so many nurseries of the rebellion, must be broken up, and the freedmen must have the pieces. It looks as if we were on the eve of another agitation. I insist that the rebel states shall not come back except on the footing of the Declaration of Independence, with all persons equal before the law, and government founded on the consent of the governed. In other words, there shall be no discrimination on account of color. If all whites vote, then must all blacks, but there shall be no limitation of suffrage for one more than for the other. It is sometimes said, "What? Let the freedman, yesterday a slave, vote." I am inclined to think that there is more harm in refusing than in conceding the franchise. It is said that they are as intelligent as the Irish just arrived, but the question has become immensely practical in this respect. Without their votes we cannot establish stable governments in the rebel states. Their votes are as necessary as their muskets, of this I am satisfied. Without them, the old enemy will reappear, and under the forms of law take possession of the governments, choose magistrates and officers, and in alliance with the northern democracy, put us all in peril again, postpone the day of tranquility, and menace the national credit by assailing the national debt. To my mind, the nation is now bound by self-interest, self-defense, to be thoroughly just. The Declaration of Independence has pledges which have never been redeemed. We must redeem them, at least as regards the rebel states which have fallen under our jurisdiction. Mr. Lincoln is slow in accepting truths. I have reminded him that if he would say the word we might settle this question promptly and rightly. He hesitates. Meanwhile, I feel it my duty to oppose his scheme of government in Louisiana, which for the present is defeated in Congress. 7. Stevens' declaration found few echoes. Senator Wade of Ohio was the only one who blazed a further path toward industrial democracy. He declared in public meetings that after the abolition of slavery, a radical change in the relations of capital and of property and land is next upon the order of the day. And Wade added frankly that this democratic movement of freedom and power for men was easily confused in men's minds with the older slogans of freedom for trade and industry. There is no doubt, he also remarked, that if by an insurrection, the colored people could contrive to slay one half their oppressors, the other half would hold them in the highest respect and no doubt treat them with justice. All of this simply increased industry's fear of Western radicalism and was regarded as advocacy of industrial revolution. These were the demands of the extreme leaders of abolition democracy. Leaders like Phillips and Douglas agreed with the demand for the ballot. Wendell Phillips said at the annual meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1865, "Our philosophy of government since the 4th day of July, 1776, is that no class is safe, no freedom is real, no emancipation is effectual, which does not place in the hands of the man himself the power to protect his own rights. That is the genius of American institutions. The Negro must be given the franchise because we have no other timber to build states with, and unless we build with him, we must postpone Reconstruction for so many years, that the very patronage of territorial government would swamp Republican institutions. Keep them territories, let the democracy come in 8 years or 4, with the money power of this bank system in one hand and territorial government in the other, and Republican government will be almost a failure." At a Tremont Temple meeting in Boston, it was resolved that since the denial of rights to black men was the cause of the disruption of the Union, their enfranchisement and free equality before the law must be the cornerstone of the Reconstruction. Douglas said, "I am for the immediate, unconditional and universal enfranchisement of the black man in every state in the Union. Without this his liberty is a mockery. Without this, you might as well almost retain the old name of slavery for his condition. For, in fact, if he is not the slave of the industrial master, he is the slave of society, and holds his liberty as a privilege, not as a right. He is at the mercy of the mob, and has no means of protecting himself." Not all abolitionists agreed, however. Garrison in The Liberator refused to demand immediate enfranchisement. He said, in 1864, in reply to an English critic, "When was it ever known that liberation from bondage was accompanied by a recognition of political equality? Chattels personal may be instantly translated from the auction block into freemen. But when were they ever taken at the same time to the ballot box, and invested with all political rights and immunities? According to the laws of development and progress, it is not practicable. To denounce or complain of President Lincoln for not disregarding public sentiment, and not flying in the face of these laws, is hardly just. Besides, I doubt whether he has the constitutional right to decide this matter. Ever since this government was organized, the right of suffrage has been determined by each state in the Union for itself, so that there is no uniformity in regard to it. In some free states, colored citizens are allowed to vote, in others, they are not. It is always a state, never a national matter. Nor, if the freed blacks were admitted to the polls by presidential fiat, do I see any permanent advantage likely to be secured by it. For, submitted to as a necessity at the outset, as soon as the state was organized and left to manage its own affairs, the white population, with their superior intelligence, wealth, and power, would unquestionably alter the franchise in accordance with their prejudices and exclude those thus summarily brought to the polls. Coercion would gain nothing. In other words, as in your own country, universal suffrage will be hard to win and to hold without general preparation of feeling and sentiment. But it will come, both at the South and with you. Yet only by a struggle on the part of the disfranchised, and a growing conviction of its justice, in the good time coming. With the abolition of slavery in the South, prejudice or colorphobia, the natural product of the system, will gradually disappear, as in the case of your West Indian colonies, and black men will win their way to wealth, distinction, eminence, and official station. I ask only a charitable judgment of President Lincoln respecting this matter, whether in Louisiana or any other state. 8. Here was sound political argument but unsound economics based on the American assumption of wealth through thrift, applied to slaves, where Thaddeus Stevens alone knew it could not be applied. Nevertheless, the demand for Negro suffrage grew, chiefly because of the necessity of implementing emancipation and making Negro freedom real. The New York Times said in April, 1865. Nobody, we believe, wishes to keep any Southern state under disabilities simply as punishment. Mr. Sumner, himself, probably does not want to transform the Southern states into territories for any such object. The real concern herein is whether the Southern states, if restored at once to their full state rights, would not abuse them by an oppression of the black race. This race has rendered an assistance to the government in times of danger that entitles them to its benign care. The government cannot, without the worst dishonor, permit the bondage of the black man to be continued in any form. It is bound by every moral principle, as well as every prudential consideration, not to remit him to the tender mercies of an enemy. But it is to be hoped that the Southern people will understand that the interests of both races require a just relation between them and that they will secure this by a prompt change of their state constitution and laws. The New York Tribune laid down 7 points in May, 1865. 1. Everyone must realize that the blacks will not emigrate but stay in America. 2. The blacks may not be spared, for their labor makes land valuable, and the land may not be spared. 3. Fair pay for fair work is a sine qua non. 4. Education for freedmen. 5. With education comes self-elevation, and the desire to deny him the vote will disappear. 6. However, white men who are ignorant and vicious, vote suffrage for blacks regardless of this ignorance. 7. Fidelity to the political creed of the nation to secure the happiness of all. Later, Horace Greeley said, "We would consent to submit to the suffrage only those who could read and write or those who pay taxes or are engaged in some trade. Any standard which could limit the voting privilege to the competent and deserving would be agreeable to us." He adds, "The abolitionists are most anxious that political rights, and especially the right of self-protection by suffrage, shall be accorded to the freedmen of the South. And waiving all questions of power, they would gladly prefer that such extension of suffrage be accorded by, rather than imposed on, Southern whites. They cannot realize that hanging some of the late insurgents as rebels and traitors will dispose the survivors toward according the elective franchise even to the most capable of emancipated blacks. In fact, the obstacles to such extension of suffrage are many and formidable. They are not to be surmounted, though many act as though they could, by a mere order from the War Department, nor even by an act of Congress. 9. The most popular argument for Negro suffrage was that of Carl Schurz. It would seem that the interference of the national authority in the home concerns of the Southern states would be rendered less necessary, and the whole problem of political and social reconstruction be made simplified, if, while the masses lately arrayed against the government are permitted to vote, the large majority of those who were always loyal, and are naturally anxious to see the free labor problem successfully solved, were not excluded from all influence upon legislation. In all questions concerning the Union, the national debt, and the future social organization of the South, the feelings of the colored man are naturally in sympathy with the views and aims of the national government, and while the Southern whites fought against the Union, the Negro did all he could to aid it. While the Southern white sees in the national government his conqueror, the Negro sees in it his protector. While the white owes to the national debt his defeat, the Negro owes to it his deliverance. While the white considers himself robbed and ruined by the emancipation of the slaves, the Negro finds in it the assurance of future prosperity and happiness. In all the important issues the Negro would be led by natural impulse to forward the ends of the government, and by making his influence, as part of the voting body, tell upon the legislation of the states, render the interference of the national authority less necessary. As the most difficult of the pending questions are intimately connected with the status of the Negro in Southern society, it is obvious that a correct solution can be more easily obtained if he has a voice in the matter. In the right to vote, he would find the best permanent protection against oppressive class legislation, as well as against individual persecution. The relations between the white and black races, even if improved by the gradual wearing off of the present animosities, are likely to remain long under the troubling influence of prejudice. It is a notorious fact that the rights of a man of some political power are far less exposed to violations than those of one who is, in matters of public interest, completely subject to the will of others. A voter is a man of influence. Small as that influence may be in the single individual, it becomes larger when that individual belongs to a numerous class of voters who are ready to make common cause with him for the protection of his rights. Such an individual is an object of interest to the political parties that desire to have the benefits of his ballot. It is true, the bringing face to face at the ballot box of the white and the black races may here and there lead to an outbreak of feeling, and the first trials ought certainly to be made while the national power is still there to prevent or repress disturbances. But the practice once successfully inaugurated under the protection of that power, it would probably be more apt than anything else to obliterate old antagonisms, especially if the colored people, which is probable, as soon as their own rights are sufficiently secured, divide their votes between the different political parties. The effect of the extension of the franchise to the colored people upon the development of free labor and upon the security of human rights in the South being the principal object in view, the objections raised on the ground of the ignorance of the freedmen become unimportant. Practical liberty is a good school, and, besides, if any qualification can be found, applicable to both races, which does not interfere with the attainment of the main object, such qualification would in that respect be unobjectionable. but it is idle to say that it will be time to speak of Negro suffrage when the whole colored race will be educated, for the ballot may be necessary to him to secure his education. It is also idle to say that ignorance is the principal ground upon which Southern men object to Negro suffrage, for if it were, that numerous class of colored people in Louisiana who are as highly educated, as intelligent and as wealthy as any corresponding class of whites, would have been enfranchised long ago. It has been asserted that the Negro would be but a voting machine in the hand of his employer. On this point opinions seem to differ. I have heard it said in the South that the freedmen are more likely to be influenced by their schoolmasters and preachers. But even if we suppose the employer to control to a certain extent the Negro laborers, vote, two things are to be taken into consideration. The class of employers or landed proprietors will in a few years be very different from what it was heretofore. In consequence of the general breaking up, a great many of the old slaveholders will be obliged to give up their lands and new men will step into their places. And 2. The employer will hardly control the vote of the Negro laborer so far as to make him vote against his own liberty. The beneficial effect of an extension of suffrage does not always depend upon the intelligence with which the newly admitted voters exercise their right, but sometimes upon the circumstances in which they are placed. And the circumstances in which the freedmen of the South are placed are such that when they only vote for their own liberty and rights, they vote for the rights of free labor, for the success of an immediate important reform, for the prosperity of the country, and for the general interests of mankind. If, therefore, in order to control the colored voter, the employer or whoever he may be, is first obliged to concede to the freedman the great point of his own rights as a man and a free laborer, the great social reform is completed, the most difficult problem is solved, and all other questions it will be comparatively easy to settle. In discussing the matter of Negro suffrage, I deemed it my duty to confine myself strictly to the practical aspects of the subject. I have, therefore, not touched its moral merits nor discussed the question whether the national government is competent to enlarge the elective franchise in the states lately in rebellion by its own act. I deem it proper, however, to offer a few remarks on the assertion frequently put forth that the franchise is likely to be extended to the colored man by the voluntary action of the Southern whites themselves. My observation leads me to a contrary opinion. Aside from a very few enlightened men, I found but one class of people in favor of the enfranchisement of the blacks. It was the class of Unionists who found themselves politically ostracized and looked upon the enfranchisement of the loyal Negroes as the salvation of the whole loyal element. But their numbers and influence are sadly insufficient to secure such a result. The masses are strongly opposed to colored suffrage. Anybody that dares to advocate it is stigmatized as a dangerous fanatic. Nor do I deem it probable that in the ordinary course of things, prejudices will wear off to such an extent as to make it a popular measure. Outside of Louisiana, only one gentleman who occupied a prominent political position in the South expressed to me an opinion favorable to it. He declared himself ready to vote for an amendment to the Constitution of his state bestowing the right of suffrage upon all male citizens without distinction of color, who could furnish evidence of their ability to read and write, without, however, disfranchising those who are now voters and are not able to fulfill that condition. This gentleman is now a member of one of the state conventions, but I presume he will not risk his political standing in the South by moving such an amendment in that body. The only manner in which, in my opinion, the Southern people can be induced to grant to the freedmen some measure of self-protecting power in the form of suffrage is to make it a condition precedent to readmission. Practical attempts on the part of the Southern people to deprive the Negro of his rights as a freeman may result in bloody collisions, and will certainly plunge Southern society into restless fluctuations and anarchical confusion. Such evils can be prevented only by continuing the control of the national government in the states lately in rebellion, until free labor is fully developed and firmly established, and the advantages and blessings of the new order of things have disclosed themselves. This desirable result will be hastened by a firm declaration on the part of the government that national control in the South will not cease until such results are secured. Only in this way can that security be established in the South which will render numerous immigration possible, and such immigration would materially aid a favorable development of things. The solution of the problem would be very much facilitated by enabling all the loyal and free labor elements in the South to exercise a healthy influence upon legislation. It will hardly be possible to secure the freedman against oppressive class legislation and private persecution unless he be endowed with a certain measure of political power. As to the future peace and harmony of the Union, it is of the highest importance that the people lately in rebellion be not permitted to build up another, peculiar institution, whose spirit is in conflict with the fundamental principles of our political system. For as long as they cherish interests peculiar to them in preference to those they have in common with the rest of the American people, their loyalty to the Union will always be uncertain. I desire not to be understood as saying that there are no well-meaning men among those who were comprised in the rebellion. There are many, but none of these in number nor in influence are strong enough to control the manifest tendency of the popular spirit. Monded by the national sense of justice and the exigencies of our situation. 10. The inevitable result of the Civil War eventually had to be the enfranchisement of the laboring class, black and white, in the South. It could not, as the South clamored to make it, result in the mere legalistic freeing of the slaves. On the other hand, it would not go as far as economic emancipation for which Stevens and the freedmen clamored, because the industrial North instinctively recoiled from this and the northern white working man himself had not achieved such economic emancipation. The politically enfranchised slave was accused, as every laboring class has been, of ignorance and bad manners, of poverty and crime. And when he tried to go to school and tried to imitate the manners of his brothers, and demanded real economic emancipation through ownership of land and right to use capital, there arose the bitter shriek of property, and the charge of corruption and theft was added to that of ignorance and poverty, just as we have seen in our day in the case of Russia. Democracy, that inevitable end of all government, faces eternal paradox. In all ages, the vast majority of men have been ignorant and poor, and any attempt to arm such classes with political power brings the question: can ignorance and poverty rule? If they try to rule, their success in the nature of things must be halting and spasmodic, if not absolutely nil. And it must incur the criticism and raillery of the wise and the well-to-do. On the other hand, if the poor, unlettered toilers are given no political power, and are kept by exploitation and poverty, they will remain submerged unless rescued by revolution. And a philosophy will prevail, teaching that the submergence of the mass is inevitable and is on the whole best, not only for them, but for the ruling classes. In all this argument there is seldom a consideration of the possibility that the great mass of people may become intelligent, with incomes that ensure a decent standard of living. In such case, no one could deny the right and inevitableness of democracy. And in the meantime, in bridging the road from ignorance and poverty to intelligence and an income sufficient for civilization, the real power must be in someone's hands. Shall this power be a dictatorship for the benefit of the rich, the cultured and the fortunate? This is the basic problem of democracy, and it was discussed before the people of the United States in unusual form directly after the Civil War. It was a test of the nation's real belief in democratic institutions. And the fact that the ideal of abolition democracy carried the nation as far as it did in the matter of Negro suffrage must always be a source of intense gratification for those who believe in humanity and justice. In a republic, the people precede their government. Throughout the war, the people demanded more stringent and more energetic measures than the administration was prepared to adopt. They called for emancipation before it was proclaimed, for a freedmen's bureau before it was organized, for a civil rights bill before it was passed, and for impartial suffrage before it was finally, by act of Congress, secured. In the history of emancipation, the voluntary activities of a portion of the people in benevolent, philanthropic and Christian effort preceded, prepared for, and helped to produce that governmental action which has largely contributed to the present condition and well-grounded hopes of the colored people. N. The reports on conditions in the South gained wide currency and had great influence. Salmon P. Chase, Whitelaw Reid, Carl Schurz, all supported with views and logic the prevailing trend of abolition democracy. In the South itself, long before there was any unanimity in the North on the subject of Negro suffrage or signs of pressure, the question of votes for Negroes came to the front. It was first precipitated by the proposed 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. December 14, 1863, Ashley of Ohio had introduced into the House an amendment prohibiting slavery, and Wilson of Iowa introduced a similar amendment. Both were referred, but not discussed until 5 months after their introduction. 4 other similar amendments were introduced in the House during the season. In the Senate, January 11, 1864, Henderson of Missouri introduced an amendment to abolish slavery, which was referred. A few days later, Charles Sumner submitted a joint resolution against slavery. The committee preferred Henderson's resolution. The border state men were especially opposed, and Garrett Davis of Kentucky made long and fiery speeches and offered 8 amendments. Senator Powell of Kentucky also offered various amendments. A proposed 13th Amendment finally passed the Senate April 8, 1863, by a vote of 36 to 6. It was considered in the House the last day of May. On June 15, it was approved by a vote of 95 to 66, but this was less than the necessary 2/3 majority. Meantime, Lincoln had been re-elected, receiving 2,216,067 out of 4,011,413 votes. Maryland had abolished slavery, and there was a movement for abolition throughout the border states. At the second session of the 38th Congress, the President urged the passage of the 13th Amendment. On January 31, 1865, Ashley called the proposed 13th Amendment for reconsideration. 11 Democrats deserted their leader and enabled the resolution to pass. On January 31, 1865, came powerless to preserve order. The members upon the Republican side sprang upon their seats cheering, shouting, and waving hands, hats, and canes, while the spectators upon the floor and in the galleries joined heartily in the demonstrations. Upon the restoration of order, Mr. Ingersoll of Illinois rose and said, "Mr. Speaker, in honor of this immortal and sublime event, I move that this House do now adjourn." 12. This amendment was signed by the President and submitted to the states. On December 18, 1865, it was declared adopted by the Secretary of State. The amendment carried an unusual provision in Section 2 which asserted, "Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Charles Sumner and others declared that this gave Congress power to enfranchise Negroes if such a step was necessary to their freedom. The South took cognizance of this argument. Of the states which seceded, Virginia and Louisiana ratified the 13th Amendment in February, 1865, and Arkansas in April. All of these states were at the time in the control of minorities supported by the Union armies, and strong pressure was exerted on them by the administration in Washington. In November, 1865, South Carolina ratified with this proviso: that any attempt by Congress towards legislating upon the political status of former slaves, or their civil relations, would be contrary to the Constitution of the United States as it now is, or as it would be altered by the proposed amendment, is in conflict with the policy of the President, declared in his amnesty proclamation, and with the restoration of that harmony upon which depend the vital interests of the American Union. 13. Alabama ratified the amendment the same month with this proviso: that this amendment to the Constitution of the United States is adopted by the legislature of Alabama with the understanding that it does not confer upon Congress the power to legislate upon the political status of freedmen in this state. 14. North Carolina and Georgia ratified in December just before the amendment was proclaimed. Mississippi refused ratification until after the amendment was in force. Florida ratified it with the Alabama reservations. Texas did not ratify until 1870. It is difficult to see in these proceedings any indication that the South was willing to abolish slavery, and certainly there was not the slightest indication of granting any. Negro political rights. Ton Negroes prepared a memorial on this. The convention refused to hear it. It cannot but be the earnest desire of all members, said the Charleston Daily Courier, that the matter be ignored in toto during the session. The white democracy, especially that of the upcountry, felt that a restricted suffrage which took no account of racial discriminations would disfranchise a large portion of the white vote and give the large landowners an unfair influence through their control of Negro votes. It may safely be said, wrote the Columbia correspondent of the Charleston Daily Courier, that the views and opinions of Sumner, Thad Stevens, Wilson, and some other Northern radicals have been considered too unworthy to be seriously commented upon by the members of the convention. It is well known that the sentiments of those gentlemen are extremely unpopular in the North. 15. Universally, the South was reported as adamant on the subject of Negroes voting. That is not a question they even allow themselves to debate. They consider it too monstrous a proposition even to debate. That is one of the things they imagine they will never submit to. They will suffer confiscation and everything before they will endure the degradation. 16. Governor Walker of Florida said in his inaugural speech, "Each one of us knows that we could not give either an honest or conscientious assent to Negro suffrage. There is not one of us that would not feel that he was doing wrong, and bartering his self-respect, his conscience and his duty to his country and to the Union itself, for the benefits he might hope to obtain by getting back into the Union. Much as I worship the Union, and much as I would rejoice to see my state once more recognized as a member thereof, yet it is better, 1,000 times better, that she should remain out of the Union, even as one of her subjugated provinces, than go back, eviscerated of her manhood, despoiled of her honor, recreant of her duty, without her self-respect, and of course without the respect of the balance of mankind. A miserable thing, with seeds of moral and political death in herself, soon to be communicated to all her associates." 17. Judge Underwood of Virginia reports a candid gentleman of Alexandria talking to him in friendly conversation. Sooner than see the colored people raised to a legal and political equality, the Southern people would prefer their total annihilation. I had regarded him as well informed and almost as candid a man as we have among the rebels. 18. Grattan, a native of Virginia, said February 10, 1866. "I believe that if the blacks are left to themselves, if all foreign influence were taken away, the whites would control their votes. It is not in that the difficulty lies, but it is in the repugnance which the white race would feel to that sort of political equality. It is the same sort of repugnance which a man feels toward a snake. He does not feel any animosity to the snake, but there is a natural shrinking from it." 19. He thought that any attempt to give the Negroes a vote would lead to their extermination. In all this reported opposition to Negro suffrage, the grounds given were racial and social animosity, and never the determination of land and capital to restrict the political power of labor. Yet this last reason was the fundamental one. While the South was in suspense, and the abolition democracy was slowly debating and crystallizing opinion, industry in the North was forging forward with furious intensity. And this movement was foremost and predominant in the mind and vision of living persons in that day. During the war, business prospered. There were few failures, and the inflated currency increased prices and favored business profits. While, on the other hand, it decreased real wages and the income of farmers. Wealth became concentrated among the manufacturers, merchants, the financiers and the speculators. There was, consequently, a large accumulation of capital for investment in new business enterprises. Industrial development was hastened. Inventions and technical improvements increased. Plants became larger and more efficient. Steel manufacture became the basis of modern industry and developed rapidly because of the demands of war. The metal industry, thus expanded, turned to the production of piece goods. The war itself called for more efficiency and larger plants and consolidation of plants. The freeing of the nation from the strangling hands of oligarchy in the South freed not only black men but white men, not only human spirit, but business enterprise all over the land. This happened in surprising ways. Quite naturally and logically, under the stress of war, national and local taxes rose and rose and rose yet again, forcing the whole community and nation to pay for things formerly paid for by individuals. First, necessary money was provided by taxing imports. Then, to encourage local manufacturers of goods that must be had for war. Thus, by imperceptible transition, the nation was taxed to support manufacturers. The South had forced down the tariff until in 1857 there was practically free trade. Northern manufacturers during the war pressed for higher tariff rates. Taxes on imported goods were the easiest method of raising money. The Tariff Acts of 1862 to 1864 raised the average rates of taxation to 37.2% and 47%. And since then the tariff rates have been raised higher and higher so as to foster industrial monopoly. The industrialists were not without scientific support. Henry Carey, the American economist, published his Principles of Social Science in 1858 to 1859. He attacked free trade and joined the German list in a demand for a self-contained national economy. Carey sought to show the beneficial effects that the proximity of protected industry would have upon agriculture. Thus, in the name of the new national spirit, came America for Americans, as a great and self-sufficing farming and manufacturing country. We emerged, therefore, from the war with a tremendous industry, over-organized, but efficient in many directions through the exigencies and demands of war. Two things beckoned further. First, the discovery and realization of the extraordinary natural resources of America, its iron, coal and oil, its forests, and of course raw materials like wool, sugar and cotton. Secondly, a unified and wonderful system of transportation. The nation borrowed $3 billion for war and paid heavy interest because of the price of gold. The money borrowed by the government had to be spent and spent quickly without deliberation, without careful decision. Contractors and managers, therefore, who furnished goods to the government could make, legally and illegally, fabulous sums. The prosperity which thus came to them had to be passed on in part to the workers, who received higher wages, and who, despite the increased cost of living, had money to spend freely. Boom times were on. There was plenty of money for investment and plenty of chances for investment. Speculation ran riot. The whole moral fabric of the country was changed, not simply by the blood and cruelty, hate and destruction, of war, but by the prospects of a golden future. We are told that when the Secretary of the Treasury visited New York early in 1864, he found businessmen interested not in the blood of battle but in the stock market. Workers and foreigners caught the fever and naturally enough held the South to blame for the past. Had not the South held up the distribution of the Western lands since 1845 against the protest of Northern farmers and new immigrants? Against Southern poor whites led by Andrew Johnson, and with sympathy on the part of the managers and hirers of labor of the North. Early in the war, the Homestead Law was passed and threw open the Western lands to settlers on easy terms. The new farmers and the new immigrant laborers were scarcely aware when this land was given mostly to railroads to help finance them, and then sold to farmers at prices which made profitable farming increasingly difficult. They saw agricultural prices rising. They expected them, of course, to continue to rise. Railways in the United States increased from 3 miles in 1828 to 23,476 miles in I-860, 30,283 miles in 1870, and over 50,000 miles in 1880. The railroads had been financed by selling bonds abroad before the war and after the war by large increases in domestic capital invested. Gifts of public lands were showered upon the railway builders, amounting to half the farm area opened by the Homestead Act. Great railway systems began to be consolidated, and through them population drifted to the cities. Especially did industry begin to fear the unrest in the West after the war. The West was uneasy. It became more uneasy on account of the land distribution to the railroads, the high and discriminatory railroad rates, the whole money situation, and the taxation. Finance and industry, therefore, after the war, while it looked forward confidently to tremendous industrial development, was wary. It proposed to protect itself. There was going to be no new free trade, no agricultural bloc, no drives for cheap money, no state intervention in industry. The new national development, protected from foreign competition, must be protected from state intervention. Otherwise state control of railroads and industries, state taxation and regulation, would reduce the United States to a series of small exclusive industrial territories instead of one vast market. All this thought and development went on with little attention to the social or political results of the war. But soon attention had to be given to these matters. Although industry was now in control of the national government, the Republican Party which represented it was a minority party, and Northern and Southern Democrats, especially Southern Democrats with increased power by counting the full Negro population, together with Western malcontents, could easily oust the Republicans. It was because of this thought that Northern industry made its great alliance with abolition democracy. The consummation of this alliance came slowly and reluctantly and after vain effort toward understanding with the South, which was unsuccessful until 1876. When Lincoln first laid down his general proclamation concerning Reconstruction, Industry paid little attention to it. Let the South come back. Let it come back quickly, and let us go to work and make money and repair the losses of the war by increased business. And then let the nation go far beyond this through domination of the American market, and perhaps even of the markets of the world. However, right here the dreams of the industrialists were quickly shadowed by unwelcome reflections. In the harsh voices of certain leading citizens of the South, who were about to return to Congress, there was something of that same arrogance that had cowed the North in days gone by. What these voices said concerning Negroes and, indeed, concerning slavery, was of little importance to industry. But if they proposed to come back with increased political power, would this mean a drive for free trade? Would it mean a drive against the national banks? Would it mean an attempt to readjust and tax the immense profit made in the rise of the national debt? Beyond this, could it be that the New South was set upon some move to make the whole country assume all or part of the Confederate debt and pay for emancipated slaves? Perhaps not, but this was something to watch. State economic rights must be curbed. Southern opposition to finance and the tariff must be kept in bounds. Very soon, then, the party which represented sound money, that is, the payment of interest on depreciated currency at the same rate as though it had been gold, and who wanted federal control of industry, began to see the necessity of consolidating their political power. This point of view of industry began to be expressed frankly. Brewer of Newport wrote Sumner, "In a selfish point of view, free suffrage to the blacks is desirable. Without their support, Southerners will certainly again unite, and there is too much reason to fear successfully, with the Democrats of the North, and the long train of evils sure to follow their rule is fearful to contemplate. A great reduction of the tariff doing away with its protective feature. Perhaps free trade to culminate with repudiation. And how sweet and complete will be the revenge of the former if they can ruin the North by free trade and repudiation." The most selfish argument was made by Elizur Wright of Boston in 1865. He said that it would take years of military subjugation to educate the white South out of its rebel propensities so that a majority of it could be relied on for loyal state government. In the meantime, two things would happen. One, the public debt would accumulate, for a military occupation never pays as it goes. Second, the blacks are largely trained to arms, for they are the cheapest and best troops we can have under the circumstances. Hence, when we arrive at the period when loyal state governments, that will go alone, can be set up, the blacks must be enfranchised or they will be ready and willing to fight for a government of their own. And here is more war, and more public debt, and more taxation. If the southern states are brought back in too soon, the North would either have to pay the rebel debt or borrow the rebel theory and secede from the very union that had been restored by conquering the rebels. There is only one way to avoid this and make our victory immediately fruitful. In 2 states, a decided majority of the population is black, and, by necessity, loyal. In 5 others, the black element is more than 1/3, and it is strong enough to make an effective balance of power in every state where the rebellious element is of any serious magnitude. Again, the particular chivalry which got up and engineered the rebellion has such an honor of sharing political power with its former chattels that when the enfranchisement of the blacks is determined on as the sine qua non of Reconstruction, and its own military power is overthrown, it will emigrate to a more congenial political atmosphere. We have then nothing to do but convert whites enough to make a majority when added to the enfranchised blacks, to have state governments that can be trusted to stand alone. I think I could easily convince any man, who does not allow his prejudices to stand in the way of his interests, that it will probably make a difference of at least $1 billion in the development of the national debt, whether we reconstruct on the basis of loyal white and black votes, or on white votes exclusively, and that he can better afford to give the government at least 1/4 of his estate than have it try the latter experiment. I am not disputing about tastes. A Negro's ballot may be more vulgar than his bullet. Being already in for it, the question with me is, how the one or the other can be made to protect my property from taxation. And I am sure I would rather give away half the little I have, than to have the victories of 1865 thrown away, as I am sure they will be, if, endeavoring to keep the South in subjugation by black armies, the government allows 4 million of black population to continue disfranchised. Thus industry between 1860–1870 was in control of the government but was insecure. The Republican Party which represented it was a minority party, and if Northern and Southern Democrats had been able to unite with the disaffected West, the Republicans would have been swept out of power. But the Republican Party, united with abolition democracy and using their tremendous moral power and popularity, their appeal to freedom, democracy and the uplift of mankind, might buttress the threatened fortress of the new industry. And finally, in extremity, votes for Negroes would save the day. Thus a movement, which began primarily and sincerely to abolish slavery and ensure the Negro's rights, became coupled with a struggle of capitalism to retain control of the government as against Northern labor and Southern and Western agriculture. The union of these 2 points of view is seen in an Ohio pamphlet then current. What is to be done with 6 millions of rebels? What shall be done with 4 million blacks? 1. Loyal white men only shall vote. 2. Loyal white men and rebels, except certain classes, shall vote. 3. Loyal men, white and black, shall vote. 4. Loyal men, white and black, and as many of the rebels as can be controlled by loyal voters shall vote. 5. Educational standards. 6. Segregation of whites and blacks. The blacks to be in one territory with full rights to vote. 7. Rebel states to be held by military power until the rebels have purged themselves. In the first plan, 1,200,000 voters in the rebel states will have as much voting power as 2 million voters in the North. Under the second plan before the rebellion, the South, with 6 million whites, boasted as much political power as 8,400,000 of the North. By this second plan, 6 million would possess the power of 10 million of the North. By the third plan, 1 voter in the South would have more voting power than 2 voters in the North. Under the fourth plan, the uneducated blacks are almost the only friends of the government, while the educated whites are all wrong. This illustrates the folly of an educational standard. Under the sixth plan, the whites forced the mixing of the races of the country, and those men who have been raised on Negro milk, and some of them who have children by Negro mothers, should not talk about separation. Slowly the rank and file of the nation began to respond to the combined argument of industrialists and abolitionists, especially as their seeming unity of purpose increased. A correspondent of the New York Tribune writes in 1865 from the South. The freed people are truly and unreservedly our friends, and they are almost the only ones. They are more intelligent as a class, and more available as a trustworthy material for citizenship, than I expected to find them. The poor whites whom I saw are decidedly inferior to the average of the slave population. If there is to be for the future a stable basis for loyal states in the South, it must be made up largely of the freed people. It will not do at present to trust the ballot in the hands of the white men who have been rebels, and still are such under the guise of Union men. I believe this to be true whether the blacks be allowed to vote or not. There should be a long intermediate probationary state prescribed before they are again allowed to approach the ballot box. 20. Eastern abolitionists were making alliance. However, the union of industrialists and the abolitionists became closer, and since it was unanswered by any move towards democracy in the South or any sympathy for democracy by Johnson, the West followed the abolitionists, until later they were seduced by the psychology of land ownership. In the displacement of Southern feudal agriculture by Northern industry, where did the proletariat, the worker, stand? The proletariat is usually envisaged as united, but their real interests were represented in America by 4 sets of people: the freed Negro, the Southern poor white, and the Northern skilled and common laborer. These groups never came to see their common interests, and the financiers and capitalists easily kept the upper hand. On the other hand, the West and South bore peculiar relations to the new industry. The South clung to the ideal of aristocracy and had no thought of the real democratic movement. Even the poor whites thought of emancipation as giving them a better chance to become rich planters, landowners and employers of Negro labor, and never until the 20th century envisaged themselves as a labor class. The Western farmers in the same way vacillated between the ideal of speculative landholders and peasant farmers. They harked back to the opportunism of the frontier and wanted freedom to exploit as well as to vote. In New York, Negroes had replaced workers who were on strike, and the two parties fought on the docks of the Morgan Line. In Ohio there were various outbreaks. In Cincinnati and in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo and Albany, race riots occurred during the war. In 1862, Negro longshoremen were assaulted, and colored working men employed in a Brooklyn tobacco factory were mobbed in August. In July, 1862, there were disturbances in New York City, and finally, in 1863, July 13th, came the terrible draft riot. As Abraham Lincoln said, March 21, 1864, none are so deeply interested to resist the present rebellion as the working people. Let them beware of prejudice, working division and hostility among themselves. The most notable feature of a disturbance in your city last summer was the hanging of some working people by other working people. It should never be so. The strongest bond of human sympathy, outside of the family relation, should be one uniting all working people, of all nations, and tongues, and kindreds. When Lincoln died a year later, Irish organizations refused to march with Negroes, and the Common Council of New York City refused to allow Negroes in the Lincoln funeral procession, but the New York Tribune announced that through the intervention of the police commissioner, a place in the procession had been assigned to the colored societies and other personages, and the police will see that they occupy it without hindrance from any quarter. Meantime, the Common Council declined to revoke their order. When the war closed, 1 million men were returning to the labor market. Gold was at its height, prices were high, and unemployment spread. Strikes took place, soldiers were used to put them down, and laws were introduced to prevent strikes. The labor movement comprehended, therefore, chiefly northern skilled laborers. Among them organization was growing. Recovering from the oppressions of war, there were 79 craft unions at the end of 1863, and they had grown to 270 in 1864. 10 national unions were formed between 1863 and 1866, and by 1870 there were 32 national unions. But almost none of these unions mentioned the Negro, or considered him or welcomed him. A National Assembly of North America was held at Louisville, Kentucky, in 1864, and passed resolutions concerning working men and labor conditions, but it said nothing of the greatest revolution in labor that had happened in America for 100 years, the emancipation of slaves. Meantime, a new flood of cheap immigrant labor was brought into the country to work on the railroads and in the new industries. Northern mill owners who had feared free farms because they might decrease the number of laborers and raise their wages, were appeased by the promotion of alien immigration. It was interesting to hear the Union Party, as the Republicans called themselves in 1864, say, in their platform, foreign immigration, which in the past had added so much to the wealth and development of resources and the increase of power to this nation, the aspirations of the oppressed of all nations, should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy. That year the Bureau of Immigration was created, and it was authorized to import workers bound for a term of service. The letter of the law was afterwards changed, but the practice continued for a long time. In I-860, immigrants were coming in at the rate of 130,000 a year. The outbreak of the war brought the number down, but the new homestead laws began to attract them, so that after the war immigration quickly rose from 200,000 to 350,000 a year, and in 1873, had reached 460,000 annually. It was all too true, as Senator Wilson of Massachusetts said in the 38th Congress, but it was a truth that white laborers did not yet realize. We have advocated the rights of the black man, because the black man was the most oppressed type of toiling man of this country. I tell you, sir, that the man who is the enemy of the black laboring man is the enemy of the white laboring man the world over. The same influences that go to keep down and crush the rights of the poor black man bear down and oppress the poor white laboring man. The first International Workingmen's Association, formed by Karl Marx in London in 1864, wrote Lincoln after his second election and said, "From the commencement of the Titanic American strife, the workingmen of Europe felt distinctly that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. The contest for the territories which opened the epoch, was it not to decide whether the virgin soil of immense tracts should be wedded to the labor of the immigrant or be prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver? When an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders dared to inscribe for the first time in the annals of the world, slavery, on the banner of armed revolt, when on the very spots where hardly a century ago the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued, and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century, when on those very spots counter-revolution, with systematic thoroughness, gloried in rescinding the ideas entertained at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, and maintained slavery to be a beneficial institution, indeed, the only solution of the great problem of the relation of capital to labor, and cynically proclaimed property in man, the cornerstone of the new edifice. Then the working classes of Europe understood at once, even before the fanatic partisanship of the upper classes, for the Confederate gentry had given its dismal warnings, that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy war of property against labor, and that for the men of labor, with their hopes for the future, even their past conquests were at stake in that tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic. Everywhere they bore therefore patiently the hardships imposed upon them by the cotton crisis, opposed enthusiastically the pro-slavery intervention importunities of their betters, and from most parts of Europe contributed their quota of blood to the good of the cause. While the workingmen, the true political power of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro, mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labor, or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of civil war. The workingmen of Europe felt sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest sign of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggles for the rescue of the enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world. 21. The first fruit of the growing understanding between industrial expansion and abolition democracy was the Freedmen's Bureau. While industry in the North was dividing the labor movement and establishing a far more effective dictatorship of capital over labor than it had ever had before, it was compelled in the South to institute another dictatorship, designedly and expressly for the protection of emancipated Negro labor. In the Freedmen's Bureau, the United States started upon a dictatorship by which the landowner and the capitalist were to be openly and deliberately curbed, and which directed its efforts in the interest of a black and white labor class. If and when universal suffrage came to reinforce this point of view, an entirely different development of American industry and American civilization must ensue. The Freedmen's Bureau was the most extraordinary and far-reaching institution of social uplift that America has ever attempted. It had to do, not simply with emancipated slaves and poor whites, but also with the property of Southern planters. It was a government guardianship for the relief and guidance of white and black labor from a feudal agrarianism to modern farming and industry. For this work there was and had to be a full-fledged government of men. It made laws, executed them and interpreted them. It laid and collected taxes, defined and punished crimes, maintained and used military force, and dictated such measures as it thought necessary and proper for the accomplishment of its varied ends. Naturally, all these powers were not exercised continuously nor to their fullest extent. And yet, as General Howard has said, scarcely any subject that has to be legislated upon in civil society failed, at one time or another, to demand the action of this singular bureau. 22. Thus the Freedmen's Bureau, which rose automatically as a result of the slaves' general strike during the war, and came directly out of the consolidation of the various army departments of Negro affairs, now loomed as the greatest plan of reasoned emancipation yet proposed. For this reason, the bill for its establishment met covert and open opposition. It was opposed by all advocates of slavery, and all persons North and South who did not propose that emancipation should really free the slaves. It was advocated by every element that wanted to achieve this vast social revolution by reasoned leadership, money and sacrifice. It was finally emasculated and abolished by those in the North who grudged its inevitable cost, and by that Southern sentiment which passed the Black Codes. A bill to establish a bureau in the War Department for the care of refugees and freedmen was passed March 3, 1865. It had been proposed as early as 1863, when a number of petitions for a Bureau of Emancipation were presented to Congress. In January, 1863, less than a month after the Emancipation Proclamation, T.D. Eliot introduced into the House the first bill. But the committee did not report it, and the Freedmen's Aid Societies renewed their petitions. At the opening of the new session in December, 1863, Eliot introduced another bill. This bill was objected to in the House because of its cost, its charitable features, and the possible corruption of its employees. Eliot defended the bill vigorously. The Negroes had been freed by proclamation, law, and force, and their freedom must be maintained. They were freed through selfish motives, to weaken the enemy. It would be the depth of meanness to let them now grope their way without guidance or protection. The President, by proclamation, had pledged the maintenance of Negro freedom, and Congress had recognized its obligation to secure employment and support of Negroes on abandoned lands. Negroes were now oppressed by Southerners in Northern harpies. Further legislation was imperatively demanded. In the ensuing debates, the bill was defended as encouraging the enlistment of colored soldiers, and as calculated to bring order out of the present chaos. It would form a new class of consumers for Northern products. On the other hand, opponents insisted that the Bureau would open a vast field for corruption, and that it was a revolutionary effort on the part of a government of limited powers. Brooks of New York denounced it because it would put black labor under Northern taskmasters in competition with white labor and capitalists in the North. It was passed March 1, 1864, by the close vote of 69 to 67. In the Senate it was referred to the Committee on Slavery and Freedom, of which Charles Sumner was chairman. Here it was transformed from a temporary makeshift and war expedient and began to take the form of a great measure of social uplift and reform. The Bureau was attached to the Treasury Department. Sumner pressed the bill, arguing that private benevolence could not cope with the problem and that a bureau was necessary. That the Treasury was already in charge of abandoned property and had special agents in the field. The bill passed the Senate, June 28, by a vote of 21 to 9. The House refused to concur and the whole subject went over to the next session. Renewed arguments and petitions came in favor of the bill. In July, 7. Freedmen's Aid Associations of the West met in Indianapolis. They drew up a memorial complaining of the current methods of dealing with the freedmen and asking for a supervising agent because of the failure of Congress to establish a bureau. December 20, 1864, the matter was taken up again in the House in a conference committee appointed with Sumner and Eliot. This committee reported February 2, 1865, and recommended an independent Department of Freedmen and Abandoned Lands. In the debates, there was great diversity of opinion. Some feared that the freedman would be too strictly controlled and that this would curtail his initiative and self-reliance. Others urged the necessity of the bill to rescue these wards from ignorance and pauperism, and guide them into confidence and self-control. The bill passed that House by another close vote of 64 to 62. However, there appeared at the same time another bill for the relief of both white refugees and freedmen and the temporary use of abandoned property. It was a short and temporary measure. Both these bills went to the Senate. Sumner stoutly defended the comprehensive measure agreed upon in conference. But the opposition of both Democrats and Republicans was too strong and the conference report was rejected. A second conference was held and a new bill presented, creating a Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen and Abandoned Lands in the War Department. All these proposals meant that there was a question as to whether this bureau was to be a temporary war measure or a permanent institution for abolishing slavery and inducting Negroes gradually into economic and political freedom. If it were attached to the War Department, it would end with the war. In the Treasury, it would serve to settle problems of taxation, crops and finance, but presumably end when war finance yielded to peace. In the Interior Department or as a separate department, the Freedmen's Bureau would be permanent, with regular revenues and a wide and comprehensive program of work. The debate on the final bill was limited, and without a vote the report of the conference committee was accepted March 3, Rode Abraham. Lincoln immediately signed the bill. This bill provided for a bureau to last during the present War of Rebellion, and for 1 year thereafter. It had at its head a commissioner appointed by the President with the consent of the Senate, and assistant commissioners might be appointed for each of the 10 states in rebellion. Army officers could be used as assistant commissioners. The Secretary of War was to issue necessary provisions, clothing, and fuel, and under the direction of the President, the commissioner could set aside for freedmen and refugees tracts of land of not more than 40 acres to be leased to tenants. The lessees were to be protected in the use of the land for 3 years at a low rent. At the end of the term, the tenant could purchase the land at an appraised value. Men's Bureau conducted for the benefit of labor. Where will the freedman get the capital to buy his horse or his oxen and other agricultural implements, to put his crop of cotton or corn in the ground? All these require capital far beyond the ability of the freedman to command, and renders the scheme impractical so far as it professed to be of benefit to the freedman. The inevitable result will be that the freedman will lease no land. He will not be able to lease and cultivate land. He will not be able to purchase equipment of horse and agricultural implements that will be necessary for its cultivation. Then he must fall into general line and become simply a laborer to be hired to some man with whom they are secretly in partnership, with whom they share the profits and the produce of the freedman's labor from these abandoned lands. 23. The inevitable corollary that under the especial circumstances of emancipated slave labor, the state must furnish capital, was inconceivable to men like Conness. He, like Lane of Indiana, made the old American assumption of economic independence open to all. I am opposed to the whole theory of the Freedmen's Bureau. I would make them free under the law. I would protect them in the courts of justice. If necessary, I would give them the right of suffrage, and let loyal slaves vote their rebel masters down and reconstruct the seceded states. But I wish to have no system of guardianship and pupillage and overseership over these Negroes. There was in the debate, inside and outside of Congress, distinct evidence that industry, rather than pay the cost of social uplift on the scale which an efficient Freedmen's Bureau evidently demanded, would accept immediate Negro suffrage as a preferable panacea. Just as the refuge of those who opposed the right to vote was work for the freedmen and regular habits of labor, so on the other hand, those who opposed systematic organization of such work, found refuge in the ballot. Pomeroy had seen thousands of colored and white refugees coming into my state, and I say here distinctly that the colored people are able to take care of themselves and find their places and adapt themselves to their new conditions easier and quicker than the poor white refugees who were driven out of the border states. I desire that those who advocate this bill will stop here and spend their time and talent in demanding for the Negro race all the rights and privileges of freedom. Do this, and no Freedmen's Bureau at all is necessary. Sir, I am for all races of men. I do not believe that it is necessary to secure the property of one race that another shall be destroyed. Let us refuse admittance to every rebel state unless the privilege of the elective franchise is granted to the colored man. I believe the future permanency of this government depends upon this, and I believe those who have fought this war have no safety or security without it. Here was a logical resting place, no funds or permanency for a Freedmen's Bureau, and Negro suffrage to defend northern industry. And no element fought harder and more determinedly to make this possible than the white South. With the possibility of a government guardianship to conduct the Negro in freedom by industry, land, and education at the expense of the nation, the South deliberately and bitterly fought and maligned the Bureau at every turn, and in the end it received the Reconstruction bills as its just reward. For the stupendous work which the Freedmen's Bureau must attempt, it had every disadvantage except one. It was so limited in time that it had small chance for efficient and comprehensive planning. It had at first no appropriated funds, but was supposed to depend on the chance accumulations of wartime, unclaimed bounties of Negro soldiers, confiscated land and property formerly belonging to the Confederate government, and rations. Further than this, it had to use a rough military machine for administrating delicate social reform. The qualities which make a good soldier do not necessarily make a good social reformer. And while in many instances the Bureau was fortunate in its personnel, in others it was just as unfortunate, and had to put in administrative positions military martinets, men disillusioned and cynical after a terrible war, or careless and greedy and in no way suited for far-sighted social building. The most fortunate thing that Lincoln gave the Bureau was its head, Oliver Howard. Howard was neither a great administrator nor a great man, but he was a good man. He was sympathetic and humane, and tried with endless application and desperate sacrifice to do a hard, thankless duty. His high reputation as a Christian gentleman gave him the esteem of the humane and benevolent portion of the public, upon whose confidence and cooperation his success was largely to depend. 24. The task that Howard had was of the gravest, because there were three things that the conquered South fought with bitter determination. 1. Any federal interference with labor. 2. Arms in the hands of Negroes. 3. Votes for Negroes. Chine for its mission, the planters in the main were determined to try to coerce both black labor and white, without outside interference of any sort. They proposed to enact and enforce the black codes. They were going to replace legal slavery by customary serfdom and caste. And they were going to do all this because they could not conceive of civilization in the South with free Negro workers, or Negro soldiers or voters. Howard, therefore, had a battle on his hands from the start. His bureau was limited by temporarily extended and incomplete laws until its main work was practically done in 1869, although some of its functions extended until June 30, 1872. Under these circumstances, the astonishing thing is that the Bureau was able to accomplish any definite and worthwhile results. Yet it did, and the testimony in support of this comes from its friends and enemies. Howard says, "The law establishing the Bureau committed to it the control of all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen under such regulations as might be prescribed by the head of the Bureau and approved by the President. This almost unlimited authority gave me great scope and liberty of action, but at the same time it imposed upon me very perplexing and responsible duties. Legislative, judicial and executive powers were combined in my commission, reaching all the interests of 4 millions of people, scattered over a vast territory, living in the midst of another people claiming to be superior, and known to be not altogether friendly. The conditions facing the Bureau were chaotic. In every state many thousands were found without employment, without homes, without means of subsistence, crowding into towns and about military posts, where they hoped to find protection and supplies. The sudden collapse of the rebellion, making emancipation an actual, universal fact, was like an earthquake. It shook and shattered the whole previously existing social system. It broke up the old industries and threatened a reign of anarchy. Even well-disposed and humane landowners were at a loss what to do, or how to begin the work of reorganizing society and of rebuilding their ruined fortunes. Very few had any knowledge of free labor, or any hope that their former slaves would serve them faithfully for wages. On the other hand, the freed people were in a state of great excitement and uncertainty. They could hardly believe that the liberty proclaimed was real and permanent. Many were afraid to remain on the same soil that they had tilled as slaves, lest by some trick they might find themselves again in bondage. Others supposed that the government would either take the entire supervision of their labor and support, or divide among them the lands of the conquered owners, and furnish them with all that might be necessary to begin life as an independent farmer. 25. 12 labors of Hercules faced the Freedmen's Bureau. To make as rapidly as possible a general survey of conditions and needs in every state and locality, to relieve immediate hunger and distress, to appoint state commissioners and upwards of 900 bureau officials, to put the laborers to work at regular wage, to transport laborers, teachers and officials, to furnish land for the peasant, to open schools, to pay bounties to black soldiers and their families, to establish hospitals and guard health, to administer justice between man and former master, to answer continuous and persistent criticism, north and south, black and white, to find funds to pay for all this. In 4 years the Bureau issued over 21 million rations to the hungry and unemployed, 15.5 million to blacks and 5.5 million to whites. The number rose to 5 million in 1866, and then fell from 3.5 to 2.5 million in 1867 to 1868. The total cost of food and clothing, 1865 to 1871, was set down at $3,168,325. In the eyes of a nation dedicated to profitable industry, as well as in the eyes of Bureau officials, the first major problem was to set the Negroes to work under a wage contract. To secure fairness and to inspire confidence on both sides, the system of written contracts was adopted. No compulsion was used, but all were advised to enter into written agreements and submit them to an officer of the Bureau for approval. The nature and obligations of these contracts were carefully explained to the freedmen, and a copy filed in the office of the agent approving it. This was for their use in case any difficulty arose between them and their employers. The labor imposed upon my officers and agents by this system was very great, as evinced by the fact that in a single state not less than 50,000 such contracts were drawn in duplicate and filled up with the names of all the parties. The purely economic results of this effort were unusually satisfactory. There was cheating by employers, and malingering by laborers, and widespread disorder. Yet, in spite of all disorders that have prevailed and the misfortunes that have fallen upon many parts of the South, a good degree of prosperity and success has already been attained. To the oft-repeated slander that the Negroes will not work, and are incapable of taking care of themselves, it is a sufficient answer that their voluntary labor has produced nearly all the food that supported the whole people, besides a large amount of rice, sugar and tobacco for export, and 2 millions of bales of cotton each year, on which was paid into the United States Treasury during the years 1866 and 1867 a tax degree F more than $40 million. $40 million. It is not claimed that this result is wholly due to the care and oversight of this Bureau, but it is safe to say, as it has been said repeatedly by intelligent Southern white men, that without the Bureau or some similar agency, the material interests of the country would have greatly suffered, and the government would have lost a far greater amount than has been expended in its maintenance. $750,000 was spent in transporting laborers to homes and to work, and teachers and agents to their fields of duty. The insistent demand of the Negro, aided by army officers and Northern churches and philanthropic organizations, began the systematic teaching of Negroes and poor whites, this beginning the Freedmen's Bureau raised to a widespread system of Negro public schools. The Bureau furnished day and night schools, industrial schools, Sunday schools and colleges. Between June I, 1865, and September 1, 1871, $5,262,511.26 was spent on schools from Bureau funds, and in 1870 there were in day and night schools 3,300 teachers and 149,581 pupils. Nearly all the present Negro universities and colleges like Howard, Fisk, and Atlanta were founded or substantially aided in their earliest days by the Freedmen's Bureau. There were systematic plans to care for the sick. In the summer of 1865 there were detailed in the several states 14 surgeons and 3 assistant surgeons, who took care of white and black people in distress, and engaged local surgeons to help them. By September 1867, there were 46 hospitals with 5,292 beds. The hospitals were distributed in 14 different states, and the annual appropriation for medical purposes was nearly $500,000 in 1866 and 1867. The total expenditure for the medical department has been estimated to have been $2 million. With this money, 452,419 cases were treated, and perhaps an equal number unrecorded. In all, nearly 1 million persons were given medical aid. The death rate among the freedmen was reduced from 30% to 13% in 1865, and to 2.03% in 1869. Something was done in providing physicians in large towns, inspecting sanitation, and treating lame, blind, deaf and dumb and aged persons and orphans. Temporary care was given the insane. The judicial work of the Bureau consisted in protecting the Negro from violence and outrage, from serfdom, and in defending his right to hold property and enforce his contracts. It was to see that Negroes had fair trials and that their testimony was received, and their family relations respected. The Commissioner laid down general rules for the administration of justice by Bureau officials. Freedmen's courts and boards of arbitration were organized when needed, and while an attempt was made to secure uniformity in these courts, they presented much variety in composition and procedure. Sometimes the assistant commissioner constituted the court, sometimes it consisted of an agent appointed by him, and a representative of the freedmen and one of the whites. They acted only in cases where one or both parties were Negroes, and they imposed fines and enforced their judgments. The financial support of the Bureau was haphazard. No appropriations were made under the original Freedmen's Bureau bill, but funds were supplied from many departments of Negro affairs and from the handling of abandoned property and from taxes and fees. Nearly 800,000 acres of farming land and about 5,000 pieces of town property were transferred to the Bureau by military and treasury officers, or taken up by assistant commissioners. Of this enough was leased to produce a revenue of nearly $400,000. Some farms were set aside as homes for the destitute and helpless, and a portion was cultivated by freedmen prior to its restoration. The necessary task of settling the Negroes on their own homesteads was begun by the Bureau but soon rendered impossible by lack of land and funds and deliberately hostile executive action. Through the agency of the Bureau, the government paid out $8,000 in bounties to over 5,000 Negro soldiers and their heirs, and thus helped furnish some capital to the new laborers. Under the Second Freedmen's Bureau Bill, passed in 1866, these sources were being exhausted so that the Army Appropriation Bill included $594,450 for the Bureau. Succeeding appropriations brought the total to $12,961,395, adding the cost of various Army supplies used. Howard estimated, the total expenses of our government for refugees and freedmen to August 31, 1869, have been $13,579,816.82. 26 If we add to this the increase in the Army payroll caused by the Bureau, and other items, Pierce estimates that the total expenditure for the Bureau was between $17 million and $18 million. This does not prove that the Freedmen's Bureau was a complete success, for it was not. From the nature of the organization and its limitations it could not be. The white South made it the object of its bitterest attacks. It accused the agents of every crime and mistake and planned for its removal. This was natural, for, in its essence, the Bureau was a dictatorship of the Army over property for the benefit of labor. It was aimed at the worst methods of exploitation. It sought to give the Negro some standing at law. It compelled the keeping of contracts, and while the testimony as to the net results varies it seems true, as Pierce says. 27. Notwithstanding abuses and extravagances, the Bureau did a great and indispensable work of mercy and relief, at a time when no other organization or body was in a position to do that work. To the Negro was imparted a conception, inadequate and distorted though it may have been, of his civil rights as a freeman, in a land long dominated by slavery, when freedom had just been decreed, when neither black nor white well understood the value of free labor, and before the law of supply and demand could readjust labor relations, the Bureau set up a tentative scale of wages. When under the direction of broad, temperate, capable agents, the Labor Division unquestionably accomplished much of the larger purpose for which it was ordained and which its friends maintain that it fulfilled. All things considered in this branch of the work, more marked success was achieved than a calm study of the perplexing situation would lead the thoughtful man of today to think that such an abnormal and short-lived institution could have attained. A white citizen of Louisiana adds, The best influence in settling the state of things in Louisiana would be to maintain there for some years a rigid administration of the Freedmen's Bureau to protect the blacks and their rights, as well as to see that they complied with reasonable and proper contracts they might make. I consider that such an establishment would stand as a barrier to the encroachments of one class upon the rights of the other. 28. Other critics are worth hearing. A Virginian, J.M. Bots, said, "I have heard of a great many difficulties and outrages which have proceeded, in some instances, if the truth has been represented to me, from the ignorance and fanaticism of persons connected with the Freedmen's Bureau. On the other hand, there are many of the persons connected with the Freedmen's Bureau who have conducted themselves with great propriety. And where that has been so, there has been no difficulty between the whites and blacks." 29. Judge Hill writes, "Like all other efforts of humanity, the results of the Freedmen's Bureau depended very much upon those appointed to carry it out and give it the aid intended. Where the agent was a man of good sense and free from prejudice to either party or race, good results were attained. But, in many instances, the agents were deficient in these necessary qualifications, and the results were, not only a failure to accomplish the purpose of the Bureau, but a decided evil." 30. Wallace bitterly arraigns the Bureau officials in Florida. The Freedmen's Bureau, an institution devised by Congress under the influence of the very best people of the northern states, and intended as a means of protection of the freedmen, and preparing them for the new responsibilities and privileges conferred, in the hands of bad men proved, instead of a blessing, to be the worst curse of the race, as under it he was misled, debased and betrayed. 31. The various investigations of the Bureau brought out damaging facts as to the handling of funds and careless administration, and yet, the peculiar difficulties of the Bureau's financial problems must not be lost sight of. The amount involved was large. It was impossible to avoid errors in identifying the hordes of nameless, irresponsible claimants to public money entrusted to the Bureau. The thousands of agents scattered over a vast area were beyond the close personal supervision of higher officials, and much of the irregularity and fraud was clearly traceable to unscrupulous local agents. There is no reason to believe that the commissioner was guilty of embezzlement, fraud, or personal dishonesty, but he certainly was not a strict constructionist. Doubtless his liberal interpretation of statutes was designed to benefit the freedmen and refugees to whose protection and welfare his efforts were directed. Often such interpretation was due to the delay of Congress in making appropriations demanded by the exigencies of the hour. 32. Grant brought forward some hearsay criticism during the first year. President Johnson sent 2 generals south who uncovered cases of fraud and maladministration, but commended Howard and believed the Bureau had done much to preserve order and to organize free labor. A final court of inquiry was commenced by Act of Congress in 1874, and sat for 40 days. The committee gave in its majority report its judgment of this extraordinary experiment. The general effect of the policy pursued by this people towards the freedmen and the general results of the administration of the Freedmen's Bureau by General Howard are matters of history. Without civil convulsion, without any manifestation of violence or hate towards those who had subjected him and his ancestors to the accumulated wrongs of generations of servitude, the enfranchised Negro at once and quietly entered upon new relations of freeman and citizen. During the 5 years since the Bureau has been established, General Howard has directed the expenditure of $12,965,395.40, has exercised oversight and care for the freedmen and refugees in 17 states and the District of Columbia, a territory of 350,000 square miles, and cooperated with benevolent societies, aiding in the education of hundreds of thousands of pupils, and in the relief of vast numbers of destitute and homeless persons of all ages and both sexes. The world can point to nothing like it in all the history of emancipation. No 13 millions of dollars were ever more wisely spent. Yet, from the beginning this scheme has encountered the bitterest opposition and the most unrelenting hate. Scoffed at like a thing of shame, often struck and wounded, sometimes in the house of its friends, apologized for rather than defended. Yet, with God on its side, the Freedmen's Bureau has triumphed. Civilization has received a new impulse, and the friends of humanity may well rejoice. The Bureau work is being rapidly brought to a close, and its accomplishments will enter into history, while the unfounded accusations brought against it will be forgotten. 3. This is perhaps an overstatement. The Freedmen's Bureau did an extraordinary piece of work, but it was but a small and imperfect part of what it might have done if it had been made a permanent institution, given ample funds for operating schools and purchasing land, and if it had been gradually manned by trained civilian administrators. All this was clear when Andrew Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill in 1866. For the first time in history, the people of the United States listened not only to the voices of the Negro's friends, but to the Negro himself. He was becoming more and more articulate, in the South as well as in the North. Also, the actions of the Negroes were telling on public opinion, and were given for the first time intelligent and sympathetic publicity. Black soldiers paraded, black petitions, some illiterate, some like that from the District of Columbia, in excellent and logical form, were published. Black men began to enter public movements, and there was a subsidence of ridicule and caricature. The meetings and petitions of Southern Negroes were significant and cannot be discounted. Many were doubtless instigated by white friends, but not all. and even these had significant internal evidence of genuine thought and action. In May 1864, the Negroes at Port Royal, South Carolina, participated in a meeting which elected delegates to the National Convention at Baltimore in June. Robert Smalls and 3 other Negroes were among the 16 delegates, but were denied seats. On the 7th of August last a convention of colored men was held in this city, Nashville. It was resolved that the colored people of the state of Tennessee respectfully and solemnly protest against the congressional delegation from this state being admitted to seats in your honorable bodies until the legislature of this state enact such laws as shall secure to us our rights as freemen. We cannot believe that the general government will allow us to be left without such protection after knowing, as you do, what services we have rendered to the cause of the preservation of the Union and the maintenance of the laws. We have respectfully petitioned our legislature upon the subject, and have failed to get them to do anything for us, saying that it was premature to legislate for the protection of our rights. 34 September 3, 1865. A Negro convention was held in Raleigh, North Carolina, and adopted resolutions for proper wages, education, protection for their families, and repeal of unjust discrimination. October 7, 1865, the colored citizens of Mississippi protested against the reactionary policy of the state and expressed the fear that they were to be re-enslaved. They set forth that, owing to the prejudice existing there, they have not been able to assemble in convention, but that they have done as well as they could, through a few of their number to set forth their grievances. They represent 437,404 citizens of the United States, being a majority of nearly 100,000 in that state. These people, in a very brief petition, asked Congress to grant them the right of suffrage, that we may, they say, the more effectually prove our fidelity to the United States. As we have fought in favor of liberty, justice, and humanity, we wish to vote in favor of it and give our influence to the permanent establishment of pure republican institutions in these United States. And also that we may be in a position in a legal and peaceable way to protect ourselves in the enjoyment of those sacred rights which were pledged to us by the Emancipation Proclamation. 35. A Colored People's Convention met in Zion Church, Charleston, SC, in November 1865, to protest against the work of the convention and legislature. This began concerted political action by the Negroes of the state. Robert C. DeLarge, A.J. Rancière, J. Wright, Beverly Nash, Francis L. Cardozo, M.R. Delaney, and Richard H. Kane were there. They declared that this was an extraordinary meeting, unknown in the history of South Carolina, when it is considered who composed it and for what purposes it was allowed to assemble. Complaint was lodged against the state authorities in depriving Negroes of the rights of the meanest profligate in the country. Congress was asked to throw the strong arm of the law over the entire population of the state, and grant equal suffrage, and abolish the Black Code. 36. The petition of this meeting, signed by people of South Carolina, was presented to the Senate in December. They respectfully asked Congress, in consideration of their unquestioned loyalty, exhibited by them alike as bond or free, as soldier or laborer, in the Union lines under the protection of the government, or within the rebel lines under the domination of the rebellion, that in the exercise of our high authority over the re-establishment of civil government in South Carolina their equal right before the law may be respected, that in the formation and adoption of the fundamental law of the state, they may have an equal voice with all loyal citizens, and that Congress will not sanction any state constitution which does not secure the exercise of the right of the elective franchise to all loyal citizens otherwise qualified in the common course of American law, without distinction of color. 3t. The colored people of Alabama, in convention at Mobile, in 1866, called upon Congress to provide some means of making their freedom secure. They say that in the city where they were assembled in convention several of their churches had been already burned to the ground by the torch of the incendiary, and threats are frequently made to continue the destruction of their property. The means of education for their children are secured to them only by the strong arm of the United States government against the marked opposition of their white fellow citizens, while throughout the whole state the right to participate in the franchises of freemen is denied as insulting to white men. And a respectful appeal addressed by some of their people to the late state convention was scornfully laid upon the table, some of the members even refusing to hear its reading. They also state that many of their people daily suffer almost every form of outrage and violence at the hands of whites. That in many parts of the state their people cannot safely leave the vicinity of their homes. They are knocked down and beaten by their white fellow citizens without having offered any injury or insult as a cause. They are arrested and imprisoned upon false accusations. Their money is extorted for their release, or they are condemned to imprisonment at hard labor. That many of their people are now in a condition of practical slavery, being compelled to serve their former owners without pay and to call them master. They express a hope that Congress may be led to give them an opportunity to verify these statements by suitable testimony, and also further hope that Congress will grant them the protection they need. 38. In 1866, January 10, a Negro convention at Augusta, Georgia, appealed to the Georgia legislature. The freedmen declared that during the period D the war the majority of them had remained solendy at their homes, although they had known their power to rise, and to fire your houses, burn your homes and railroads, and discommode you in 1,000 ways. During the war, they had been forced into war service by the South. They had been compelled to throw up breastwork forts and fortifications and do the work of prisoners under the guns of the enemy, where, said they, many of us in common with yourselves were killed. But now, they declared that they could no longer remain indifferent when the state was passing laws which would bind them in future years. Against these laws, they would protest firmly and openly. Another address in the same year called attention to the treatment which the Negroes were receiving in all walks of life throughout the state. On the railroads they paid equal fare with others, but they did not get half the accommodation. They were cursed and kicked by the conductors. Their wives and sisters were blackguarded and insulted by the scrapings of the earth, and if they spoke of their treatment they were frowned upon with contempt and replied to in bitter epithets. 39. Major Martin R. Delaney, the most distinguished Northern Negro in South Carolina, declared in a letter to President Johnson, "What becomes necessary to secure and perpetuate the Union is simply the enfranchisement and recognition of political equality of the power that save the nation from destruction, a recognition of the political equality of the blacks with the whites in all their relations as American, 40 citizens." A correspondent of the Charleston Daily Courier writing from Sumter, South Carolina, reported November 4, 1866, an organized movement among Negroes to better their condition. They held a large assembly to deal with the problems of the hour, this being a meeting on a larger scale than that of many other such which had been held for that purpose in that section. During the 4 hours of this meeting the correspondent reported that there was not uttered a word about Negro suffrage and other political questions. The keynote of the meeting was to secure a fair and remunerative reward for labor. The contract system had proved to be unequal and unjust and they were advised to resort to the share system. The Black West protested to the admission of Colorado with white suffrage. On January 24, 1866, Senator Brown of Missouri said, "I present a petition of certain citizens of Denver, in the territory of Colorado, showing that the state constitution, framed by a citizens' convention, and adopted by an almost insignificant majority of the legal voters of Colorado, preparatory to admission as a state, excludes all colored citizens of the territory of Colorado from the right of suffrage by the incorporation in that instrument of the words, all white male citizens. The petitioners, therefore, beseech your honorable body not to admit the territory as a state until the word, all white, be erased from her constitution." 41. The most significant meeting took place in the North where a national convention met in Syracuse, New York, in October, 1864. Besides Frederick Douglass, it was attended by George L. Ruffin, who afterwards became the first Negro to sit on the bench of Massachusetts, George T. Downing of Rhode Island, Robert Hamilton of New York, William Howard Day of New Jersey, Jonathan C. Gibbs, who later became Secretary of State and Superintendent of Education in Florida, Peter H. Clark of Ohio, Henry Highland Garnet, the Negro preacher, Dr. Peter W. Ray of Brooklyn, and many other leaders of the free Negroes. The resolution said, "The weakness of our friends is strength to our foes." When the Anti-Slavery Standard, representing the American Anti-Slavery Society, denies that the society asks for the enfranchisement of colored men, and the Liberator apologizes for excluding the colored men of Louisiana from the ballot box, they injure us more vitally than all the ribald jests of the whole pro-slavery press. In the ranks of the Democratic Party, all the worst elements of American society fraternize, and we need not expect a single voice from that quarter for justice, mercy, or even decency. To it we are nothing, the slaveholders everything. How stands the case with the great Republican Party in question? We have already alluded to it as being largely under the influence of the prevailing contempt for the character and rights of the colored race. This is seen by the slowness of our government to employ the strong arm of the black man in the work of putting down the rebellion, and in its unwillingness, after thus employing him, to invest him with the same incitements to deeds of daring, as white soldiers, neither giving him the same pay, rations, and protection, nor any hope of rising in the service by meritorious conduct. It is also seen in the fact, that in neither of the plans emanating from this party for reconstructing the institutions of the Southern states, are colored men, not even those who had fought for the country, recognized as having any political existence or rights whatever. Do you, then, ask us to state, in plain terms, just what we want of you, and just what we think we ought to receive at your hands? We answer, first of all, the complete abolition of the slavery of our race in the United States. We shall not stop to argue. We feel the terrible sting of this stupendous wrong, and that we cannot be free while our brothers are slaves. We want the elective franchise in all the states now in the Union, and the same in all such states as may come into the Union hereafter. We believe that the highest welfare of this great country will be found in erasing from its statute books all enactments discriminating in favor or against any class of its people, and by establishing one law for the white and colored people alike. Whatever prejudice and taste may be innocently allowed to do or to dictate in social and domestic relations, it is plain, that in the matter of government, the object of which is the protection and security of human rights, prejudice should be allowed no voice whatever. Your fathers laid down the principle, long ago, that universal suffrage is the best foundation of government. We believe as your fathers believed, and as they practiced. For, in 11 states out of the original 13, colored men exercised the right to vote at the time of the adoption of the federal Constitution. Disciples. If freedom is good for any, it is good for all. If you need the elective franchise, we need it even more. You are strong, we are weak. You are many, we are few. You are protected, we are exposed. Clothe us with this safeguard of our liberty, and give us an interest in the country to which, in common with you, we have given our lives and poured out our best blood. You cannot need special protection. Our degradation is not essential to your elevation, nor our peril essential to your safety. You are not likely to be outstripped in the race of improvement by persons of African descent. And hence you have no need of superior advantage, nor to burden them with disabilities of any kind. We may conquer Southern armies by the sword, but it is another thing to conquer Southern hate. Now what is the natural counterpoise against this Southern malign hostility? This it is. Give the elective franchise to every colored man of the South who is of sane mind, and has arrived at the age of 21 years, and you have at once 4 millions of friends who will guard with their vigilance, and if need be, defend with their arms, the ark of federal liberty from the treason and pollution of her enemies. You are sure of enmity of the masters, make sure of the friendship of the slaves. For, depend upon it, your government cannot afford to encounter the enmity of both. 42. And so at first Abraham Lincoln looked back towards some stable place in the relation of blacks and whites in the South on which men could begin to build a new edifice for freedom, and he gave only one word that had in it a ring of harshness. He was willing to accept almost any overture on the part of the South except that he would not return the Negroes to slavery, and if any law compelled the executive to do this, that executive would not be Abraham Lincoln. There can be no doubt that Abraham Lincoln never would have accepted the black codes. He began by looking backward and then turned with this forward-looking word. On the other hand, Andrew Johnson started looking forward, towards free land, and the interests of the suppressed laborers in the South, and then realizing that one half this laboring class was black, he turned his face towards reaction. He accepted the black codes, and thus he faced in the winter of 1865 the representatives of the people of the United States in the 39th Congress assembled. Symbolic mother, we thy myriad sons, pounding our stubborn hearts on freedom's bars, clutching our birthright, fight with faces set, still visioning the stars, T. Carrot, Jesse Fawcett,